Chapter 326-350. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. The duo of Sheng Guanbing Shui and Bai Zimin covered several kilometers across the forest in search of the areas where the treasures formed from the remaining soul power of the mutated second-order spider could have been sent flying after the blood trident, a physical representation of the third-order crimson blood judgment magic skill, mercilessly slammed into the beast's body and caused an explosion of colossal magnitude. The two did not limit themselves to searching only in the central area of the forest, as the range of the explosion had reached tens of kilometers and the shockwave had easily spread out beyond. Therefore, the treasures could easily have fallen in the outer areas of the forest. The only thing that calmed the anxious hearts of Bai Zimin and Sheng Guanbing Shui a bit was the fact that at least they were sure that there were no humans near this area able to steal the treasures. As for the beasts, they were not yet smart enough to learn how valuable such things were, so they would definitely not stop for more than a few seconds at the sight of a small glowing orb. After wandering for about 100 kilometers with the center of the explosion as the main direction, Bai Zimin and Sheng Guanbing Shui were finally able to find two yellow-colored magic-grade treasure orbs, a skill scroll, and a second-order poison-type soul stone. Gathering at the outer perimeter of the central area of the forest after about 20 minutes of searching, Bai Zimin and Sheng Guanbing Shui looked at the items resting on the surface of the trunk of a large tree that had been neatly cut down. So this is it. Bai Zimin felt a little bitter. Well, there might be more things, but it will be hard to find them unless we spent days inside this forest. Sheng Guanbing Shui pointed out. Although this particular forest was slightly smaller than the forest where the military camp was located and where the army of hundreds of thousands of spiders appeared, it was still a very large forest. This was especially the case after mutating. Therefore, it was not a simple task to find such small objects in the midst of such darkness. I don't think that's good either. Even though your strength increased a lot after absorbing a portion of the second-order giant ape's soul power, there are probably a few more second-order beasts that still remain in the central area. The only reason they haven't moved yet is probably because they sensed the death of 3 beings that were similar to them, which somehow warned them of the imminent danger. Bai Zimin reasoned the situation with his head as calm as possible. In a forest as large as this one, Bai Zimin refused to believe that only 3 second-order beings existed. Even he might end up dying if he was careless, let alone Sheng Guanbing Shui, who was considerably weaker than him. Yes. That's why I think we'd better settle for this. She nodded as she gently rubbed her eyes. After a pause, she pointed out, besides, according to what you told me, that second-order spider's level barely crossed the level 50 threshold. Considering that your strength and that spider's strength weren't that far apart compared to the ape and the tiger, I think the spider didn't necessarily have enough soul power to form a treasure of epic magnitude. Bai Zimin thought about it for a moment, and after considering it better, he realized that Sheng Guanbing Shui's words actually made a lot of sense. Although it's a pity that there isn't another epic grade treasure nor is there a new construction plan, our harvest tonight could be considered quite great. He finally relaxed a bit. 5 magic grade treasures, 2 construction plans, 1 epic grade treasure, 2 second-order soul stones, and many valuable second-order materials, among which is the exquisite and valuable meat of such evolved beings. Sheng Guanbing Shui muttered under her breath before she giggled softly and said, I also gained a friend as well. Tonight could be considered fruitful no matter how you look at it. Of course, that's if you leave aside the fact that you almost killed us both. Cough. Cough. At first, Sheng Guanbing Shui's statement was extremely logical and Bai Zimin found himself nodding automatically. However, when he heard the end of her sentence, his face turned green and he couldn't help but cough a couple of times awkwardly. Crimson blood judgment was already a double-edged sword from the beginning. After all, it was a skill with great power that did not know how to differentiate between allies and enemies. It simply destroyed everything in its path without any control. But not content with this, Bai Zimin added gravity manipulation X15. Another double-edged sword. In the end, as a consequence of using 2 double-edged swords, Bai Zimin almost ended up burying himself and Sheng Guanbing Shui forever in this forest crowded with wild beasts. The important thing is that the skill served its purpose. He concluded. He. I guess we can leave it like this. She covered her mouth with one hand and chuckled softly before finally deciding to stop teasing him. Bai Zimin shook his head and in his heart he forced a smile as seeing the woman's attitude to him. He would really need some time to get used to this Sheng Guanbing Shui. After all, in Bai Zimin's mind, she was a cold woman who talked little and generally only killed evolved beings. Therefore, the drastic change now that she had opened up to him and trusted him was something he still needed to properly adapt to. After picking up all the spoils of war obtained and storing them inside their bags, Bai Zimin and Sheng Guanbing Shui turned into 2 shadows that soon disappeared amidst the fierce storm. The two continued to chat in whispers as they charged toward the outside area. I need a hot shower. She complained in a low voice. Believe me, I understand you. He sighed as he felt his body completely soaked. Then I need to sleep. She continued. Believe me, I understand you. He repeated, again sighing. I could eat something first though. Believe me, I understand you. Hey. Are you listening to me? Believe me, I'm kidding. The two chatted calmly with each other, occasionally joking lightly to lighten the still somewhat heavy mood a bit. After all, they had just experienced a great deal of danger in just an hour or two. Especially Sheng Guanbing Shui, who was not only almost blown to pieces by Bai Zimin's crimson blood judgment but also had a duel to the death against the giant second-order ape. However, a few minutes later and just as they reached the outer perimeter of the inner zone, the sound of gunshots and roars made the expression of both of them change at the same time. Neither of them said anything and as if they thought alike their bodies moved forward at a much higher speed than before, disappearing like ghosts in the middle of the night. ******. Boom. Yan Tu swung ferociously with his bone mace whose size had been tripled thanks to his gigantic skill, forcing a huge 5-meter bear to retreat several steps. However, he had no time to rest as he immediately felt every hair on his body shiver at the approaching danger. Hastily he turned his body and slammed his mace again to stop a huge tail flying towards him like a flexible whip. Bang. The first-order mutated snake hissed in pain as it hastily backed away. Several scales on its body were broken and the cracked skin allowed blood to slide down endlessly. Although the snake had been injured and slowly the wounds on its body increased with each collision, Yan Tu's hands were also numb and stained with his own blood because although his strength was high and the toughness of his body supernatural, after so many collisions against such powerful animals, even he was finally starting to falter, barely enduring thanks to his advanced level and combat experience. Immediately after that, an approximately 2-meter tall monkey whose tail seemed to have several thorns along its length jumped up and slashed with its claws over 30 centimeters long towards Yan Tu's back. If this strike connected, then it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Yan Tu's body could be cut into 2 pieces. Watch out! Kong Lan exclaimed from a distance as she struggled to hold back a first-order mutated flower that was attacking from afar with tentacle-like vines. No matter how many poisonous spells Kong Lan cast, the dead vines grew back seemingly relentlessly. Yan Tu gritted his teeth and used all his combat experience to lean his body to the side as he took a step forward with no more time to dodge. Swoosh! The monkey's claw cut a large chunk of flesh and Yan Tu was sent flying 5 meters forward, falling heavily and then rolling over a huge pool of blood belonging to the mutated beasts he had killed. He grimaced in pain and his sweat-filled face was mercilessly whipped by the endless raindrops. With no other choice, he scrambled to his feet and with a quick glance saw how his leather armor had been ripped just below the ribs. As his armor barely had 110 defense points, it failed to resist the claws enhanced by the monkey's skill and he finally ended up wounded. However, he was relieved that he managed to react in time or he would be history at this moment. Flash! A sphere of white light flashed in the middle of the night, flying towards Yan Tu at lightning speed. Before Yan Tu could even react, that white light hit him. However, instead of hurting him, the white light entered his body and he soon felt his wounds begin to heal at a far faster speed than before. This ball of white light had been released by Kong Lan, who was fighting several tens of meters away. She had activated lesser healing at the first instance to support Yan Tu as she was well aware that if he fell then those 3 first-order beasts would unleash a one-sided massacre which would lead to the human side losing this battle. Swoosh! 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 Although it was only a brief instant, a second or two at most from the moment of the skill's activation and release, Kong Lan had to look away from her enemy. The mutant plant naturally gave her no rest nor did it care if its enemy was attentive, so it immediately waved 3 vines forward and cut off the raging wind. One vine was aimed at Kong Lan's head, another at her chest, and the other at her abdomen. Kong Lan knew immediately that she would not have time to evade this attack with her current condition. Therefore, she hurriedly activated her strongest movement and escape skill to save her life at the last second. The lightning crackled and the vines struck the air before retracting once again. 10 meters distant, Kong Lan gasped as her hair stuck to her face. Her glasses had long ago been lost in the midst of the battle and her vision was slightly blurred, which if not for her constant evolution would have been countless times worse. On her body, blue lightning flashed one after another, which was a clear indication that she had just activated lightning movement. The problem was that she was not Bai Zimin or Shangguan Bing Shuet. Her mana barely amounted to just over 150 points at this moment, and the activation of lightning movement had directly consumed 40 points. The situation was not looking good at all for the base fighters. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Thanks a lot to all those who used their golden tickets to vote for BW3. Taking advantage of the huge boost in movement speed after gaining 70 agility points thanks to the power of the second-order lightning movement skill, Kong Lan backed up a few more meters as she quickly looked at the other battlefield. This battlefield was also dangerous enough for all the soul evolvers to stay at a distance. Only a few unintelligent wild beasts occasionally charged into that area but they didn't even know what was happening before their bodies were torn apart. The stronger ones were cut down and then killed, while the weaker ones simply burst into a bloody mess when they came into contact with the backlash of the attacks. An exclusive battlefield within the battlefield just like the situation faced by Yan Tu and to some extent Kong Lan herself. This battlefield was the area where Evangeline was fighting against 3 other first-order beasts. Unlike Yan Tu, who was facing beasts that were stronger than fast, Evangeline's enemies were completely opposite as the power of these beasts radiated mainly in ghostly agility. The flashes of sharp claws could be clearly seen whenever lightning flashed high in the sky and the sharp glints of a deadly dagger could be seen whenever the blade of the weapon reflected the lights of the artificial flares. Evangeline had no time to hold back at all as she faced 3 beings within her own power spectrum. Although she was incredibly powerful, her strength lay mainly in her killing ability and surprise attacks, therefore, in direct combat, she could not bring out 100% of her real ability. Of course, this in no way meant that she was weak in direct confrontations, otherwise she would not have been able to endure almost a full minute against a monster on Bai Zimin's level, it was just that it was simply not her style. A panther whose fur was completely violet with sharp claws that glowed with a faint blue light and whose eyes were as violet as fluorescent lights evaded one of Evangeline's dagger slashes by leaping back slightly. Swoosh! Not even in the time of a blink later, the panther slashed forward with the intention of decapitating her. The air itself was cut in 2 and even though the attack had not yet reached her, the pressure alone made Evangeline's face hurt while several blood marks threatened to appear at any moment. As if that wasn't enough, the panther wasn't the only beast that made an attack right after evading one. A 3-meter-tall, 6-meter-long tiger whose fur was completely red and whose eyes were as blue as the blue sky also launched a ferocious counterattack. The beast was enraged as several bloody wounds stained the ground wherever it passed and opened its jaws wide towards Evangeline's leg revealing 2 rows of teeth that instead of white were red with intense flames dancing on the surface. In just an instant, from going from being the attacker, Evangeline found herself in a life or death situation where even defense was not too viable an option. However, her expression remained as cold as ice and her emerald eyes glittered with a dangerous flash of sharp, lethal light. Her body seemed to be made of rubber instead of flesh and bone as her waist twisted at an impossible angle while tilting her head back. Swoosh! The purple panther's powered claw passed inches from her neck, cutting off a few strands of her lustrous blonde hair in the process. However, Evangeline had no time to worry about such things as she could already feel the searing heat coming from the teeth getting dangerously close to her leg. In this world, losing a leg would limit a person to the point where surviving another day would be a feat worth mentioning and one that not just anyone could accomplish. Not to mention losing a leg in the middle of a deadly battle where the enemies were overwhelmingly outnumbered, and as if that wasn't enough, their overall strength was infinitely close to yours. However, Evangeline was not a normal first-order soul evolver. If it were anyone else they might have had trouble completely dodging the pincer-like attacks of the purple panther and the fire-toothed tiger, however, Evangeline had already found herself in this kind of deadly situation many times in the past and many times during her fight against monsters. Taking advantage of the momentum and the weight of her leaning body, Evangeline turned her left foot slightly and as it kicked upwards she used the momentum to jump a couple of meters as her body whirled like a spinning topspin amidst the flashing flashes of lightning. Bang! The tiger's big mouth missed its target by a thousandth of a second and because the beast was charging with all its might it didn't have time to stop. The ground on which Evangeline was standing less than a second ago exploded and cracks of varying magnitude spread more than 10 meters in length and breadth from the point of impact. But that was not all. Evangeline was not the type of person who liked to be attacked without at least trying to strike back. Her eyes narrowed dangerously and while still in midair she made perfect use of one of her passive skills called Increased Perception of First Order Level 3. With her head pointed towards the ground and her feet towards the black clouds, the world before Evangeline seemed to have slowed down considerably and for a moment she managed to appreciate the face of the fire-toothed tiger slowly emerging from the cloud of dust and debris. Of course, the world had not slowed down. It was just that Evangeline's senses were boosted at least twice as much as usual after she focused completely on her passive skill, which led to her feeling such an effect. This skill was very dangerous since if one got the wrong idea thinking that everything had slowed down, then that person would end up meeting a disastrous death since the speed was the same. The only thing that changed was the user's perception of what their eyes saw and their body felt. Fortunately, this skill fell into the hands of Evangeline, who already had experience in death combats even before the apocalypse. Thanks to her years as an assassin and the training she had received since she was just a child, she was able to take advantage of every opportunity that came her way. As everything seemed to move slower and the details of her surroundings became clearer, Evangeline's emerald green eyes met the red eyes of the fire-toothed tiger. She moved her hand at lightning speed and after a flash of cold light, everything seemed to return to normal. Evangeline landed on the ground and hurriedly slid to the side to make some distance between her and the purple panther. Roar! A thunderous roar shook the earth as the fire-toothed tiger raised its head and then began to dash wildly out of control as it slammed its body into other beasts. Red blood spurted uncontrollably from one of the sockets where its eyes used to be, staining the entire left side of its face and dripping uncontrollably to the sodden ground. After killing a dozen other beasts that crossed its path, the tiger finally stopped and roared a second time as it used its one eye to glare at Evangeline in blinding anger. Of course, she didn't have time to worry about the anger or the pain the fire-toothed tiger was feeling as immediately after her feet touched the ground she encountered a problem. This problem was the third and final first-order enemy Evangeline was facing but had so far barely moved. Just after she put some distance between her and the purple panther, and just after she used her death-kiss dagger to make a clean, deep cut to one of the beast's eyes, thus taking away the vision on its left side, Evangeline felt the ground beneath her feet tremble, but for a split second, she thought it was normal. After all, the ground had been shaking constantly since there had been massive-sized beasts running rampant everywhere. However, by the time she realized that this slight trembling was a little different than usual, it was a bit too late to regret it. The ground cracked and less than a meter away from where Evangeline was standing appeared what looked to be the head of a giant earthworm that was covered in a strange earth-colored armor. Evangeline couldn't help but curse in her mind and hurriedly tried to retreat in a rush. However, from a distance of less than a meter, things did not go the way she expected them to go. Swoosh! The earthworm-like creature swooshed like lightning amidst the earth and even before Evangeline could retreat more than 2 steps the beast had already opened its jaws revealing 2 sharp rows of white teeth with a strange greenish liquid glowing inside. Sliding its body on the ground but still not completely off the floor, the creature reached the agile assassin's right foot and bit down mercilessly, sinking its sharp teeth fiercely into the flesh of the shiny thigh. Evangeline's face contorted slightly from the pain but her inflexible gaze did not change at all. It was at that moment that it was shown how resolute and cruel Evangeline was not only to her enemies but also to herself. To be bitten so hard and to feel 2 powerful rows of teeth digging into the flesh, a person would normally think of standing there without daring to increase the distance. After all, trying to move away would only cause the teeth to drag from the inside out and the flesh would be torn away. However, it was either that or get caught there. This was something Evangeline was clear she could not afford as the purple panther and the fire-toothed tiger were already charging towards her as they looked at her with intent to devour her in order to evolve and then escape from whatever was inside that forest and the reason they fled in the first place. Therefore, she clenched her delicate teeth tightly and cinched towards the opposite side of where the earthworm was trying to drag her. The result was obvious. A large chunk of flesh from her formerly delicate thigh was ripped clean off along with pieces of her leather armor, demonstrating the power behind the earth-type beast's bite. Red blood began to slide down her milk-white leg forming a great contrast. Evangeline's face turned slightly pale not only because of the pain but also because she realized that the earthworm's bite seemed to have some kind of paralyzing poison as she immediately discovered how her natural agile movements slowly began to gain more and more rigidity. With an extremely pitiful appearance that would evoke a man's desire for protection, she gritted her teeth again and put strength into her legs to dodge the deadly attack of the First Order's purple panther. Swoosh! A ball of white light that looked natural but at the same time was not shown amidst the red light of the flares that were slowly beginning to lose their glow in the sky. Although she could have dodged it, Evangeline allowed the ball of white light to hit her body as she could not detect any malicious intent nor could she sense any attack-type magical power within the light. The blood gushing from Evangeline's thigh immediately stopped and slowly began to strangely twist into thick threads that slowly began to team up with the flesh to form new tissue over the wound. Evangeline noticed in a flash how her regenerative ability seemed to improve drastically. No, instead of saying that what was improving was her regenerative capacity, perhaps it would be more accurate to say that what was happening was that the ball of white light was increasing the speed at which her wound was regenerating. Amidst the flash of purple lightning that illuminated the surroundings even more, Evangeline noticed how Konglan pointed her magic staff at her and the lingering trail of mana unmistakably similar to the one she felt coming from the ball of white light informed her who the person healing her was. Watch out! The young assassin girl yelled when she noticed something from the distance. Her high-pitched call that exuded urgency naturally reached Konglan's ears, but the young healer this time did not have time to move in time even though she herself finally managed to notice the incoming danger. A vine of the First Order mutant flower had silently slipped into the back of her body and when it entered the half-meter range it stiffened to the point of not missing with a steel sword before stabbing towards her brain mercilessly. Konglan's face went terribly pale as she discovered to her horror that even with her lightning movement powering her agility, she would not be enough to get out of this. The distance between the vine and her was too close. In a flash of inspiration and just before her short life met its end on this tormenting and cruel bloody battlefield, Kong Lan swung her magic staff backward at the last moment. Bang! Kong Lan's magic staff had been forged by Bai Ziman using bones of a first-order beast. It was not a magic staff forged from normal materials by any means. Therefore, the fatal vine of the first-order mutant flower failed to pierce through it. Even so, the magic staff was sent flying away from Kong Lan's hands due to the power behind the impact, as her strength was still barely comparable to that of a strong adult male before the apocalypse, but by no means sufficient to take such a hit head-on. The fingers of her right hand also broke and a small whimper escaped her mouth as her right shoulder was struck by the vine. Although thanks to the powerful rank 1 armor forged by Bai Ziman she managed to prevent her shoulder from being pierced, the blow was enough to send her flying 2 or 3 meters. Swoosh! 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 The first-order mutant flower did not have the slightest apparent trace of intelligence, so after its previous attack failed it simply continued to attack relentlessly. Several vines were slashed forward, cutting through the air with ease, aiming to claim the human's life at close range. With outstanding instincts, Kong Lan hastily stood up and backed away just in time to avoid being hit or worse yet killed. Great! I lost my weapon and my right hand is useless. Kong Lan muttered in pain as she continued to use her left hand to continue launching defensive attacks and restraining the vine. Her lesser healing skill was already at the first order's peak, but because it had not yet evolved, Kong Lan could only use 2 orbs of light before her skill went into cooldown. This also meant that after healing Yan Tu and Evangeline, she herself could not heal despite her injuries. Try to hold on as long as you can. A female voice reached her. Kong Lan raised her head and her tired eyes met Evangeline's, who in the midst of fierce combat was encouraging her. I'll help you as soon as I'm finished here. Hearing this, Kong Lan's heart felt extremely bitter. Help her? How could Evangeline do that? Kong Lan was no fool, and since she had managed to help Evangeline out of a tight spot, she naturally realized that the young assassin who she had recently met would definitely not be able to help her. Although Evangeline was strong, Kong Lan did not believe that she had the strength to free herself from those 3 first-order beasts. Therefore, instead of wasting her already scarce energy, she did not reply and continued to run in circles around the vine to prevent the monster from charging towards the soul evolvers and normal humans, thus avoiding a disaster at the cost of her own safety. Evangeline gritted her teeth and dodged the purple panther's double claw attack before counter-attacking with her dagger, performing several slashes in sync for a perfect combo that made the beast howl in pain before retreating with several deep wounds on its back. Just then, a powerful and anxiety-filled voice came from the radio at her waist. Evangeline. Some agility monster is slaughtering the back lines. Although it was only a flash, the image of XIETIAN automatically appeared in the young assassin's mind when she heard that voice. Although she had never had any direct interaction with this particular former leader, one of the jobs of an assassin was to know those in power, so Evangeline was naturally aware of XIETIAN's existence. She nimbly pressed the button and replied in a slightly exhausted voice. I am busy right now. Yan Tu and I are fighting 6 first-order beasts. We don't have the time, nor are we in a position to look somewhere else. She did not name Kong Lan nor the first-order mutant flower she was facing, since that battlefield was in the center of everyone so that it could be seen from practically anywhere. Evangeline believed that sooner or later XIETIAN would see for himself. The fire-toothed tiger lunged forward and bit towards her waist right after she answered in the negative to the request for urgent help, and Evangeline had no choice but to retreat. However, her movements had slowed to a great extent and she could feel her body becoming more and more rigid with each passing second as a consequence of the paralyzing effect of the earthworm's bite. With a second's delay, Evangeline managed to avoid being injured by the bite of the fire-toothed tiger. However, the intercom at her waist was completely shattered, leaving her now cut off from the situation unfolding in the back line. Although she was bothered by the matter of the agility-type beast that had sneaked in, Evangeline did not have the time, nor could she afford to look away, as her own life was not guaranteed. Swoosh! The purple panther came back for more, lunging with both claws raised and slamming down with the intention of crushing everything using the overwhelming weight of its 6-foot-tall body. Disturbed and slightly upset by the emotions, Evangeline decided not to evade this time. With a glint brimming with murderous intent flashing in her eyes, she silently activated the skill attached to her magic-grade treasure dagger. The skill Death's Kiss went into immediate effect, and the rose that adorned her dagger released a mysterious purple mist that completely enveloped the weapon, which gave it an extremely ominous appearance to the naked eye but still did not lose its former elegance and beauty. Deciding to end this battle sooner rather than later, Evangeline activated her special movement skill called First Order Shadow Steps. This was a skill that increased her agility by 40 points and had the characteristic that it had no time limit. However, all good things usually had bad things as well, and this also applied to Evangeline's Shadow Steps skill. While the skill could be maintained seemingly indefinitely, it actually consumed a large amount of stamina, as the stamina consumption in combat immediately multiplied by 2 times just by activating the skill. Moreover, for every 5 minutes that passed, the stamina consumption gradually increased more and more. Evangeline really wanted to finish the fight as quickly as possible. Either with her emerging victorious and surviving, or with her losing not only the fight but also her life in the process. Ever since she became an assassin, she was already mentally prepared for her death. She knew that, at the end of the day, this profession would be the cause of her downfall, and she accepted it. Therefore, she did not feel too much regret about it. Still, it would be a lie to say that her heart did not feel a little bit bittersweet at the thought of the lives of those innocent little children who might soon be devoured if the beast horde managed to break through the defense completely and reach the base of the humankind. Moreover, Evangeline had also had a small glimmer of hope to fulfill her greatest wish in life at the appearance of Bai Ziman when she met him several days ago. Unfortunately, he might as well have died inside the forest while facing some unknown being of great power. A bitter smile formed on her lips for a second before indifference reigned supreme again. Taking advantage of the fact that the purple panther had given up its agility to gain power, Evangeline slipped expertly to the beast's lower body and with some difficulty ignored the pain in her still healing leg to avoid the 2 fierce claws, gaining a shallow but bleeding cut on her right arm. However, every sacrifice will surely have its reward. Splash! The dagger plunged deep into the purple panther's chest and hot blood stained Evangeline's tight clothing. She ignored the blood that hit her face unexpectedly, and a vicious glint shone in her gaze as using the beast's own weight she slashed from below upwards. Critical hit. The purple panther's movement stalled when the paralyzing effect of the Death's Kiss skill affected the beast for a second. But even though it was only for a second, in a battle at supernatural speeds, a single second was enough for anyone to die at the slightest carelessness, let alone freeze for an entire second. Evangeline immediately jumped out from under the falling panther's body and dodged the earthworm's sneak attack with an extremely agile leap as she struggled internally with the pain in her leg. Bang! The purple panther fell heavily on the ground and a large orb of warm light flew out towards Evangeline's body, boosting her stats, replenishing her stamina and mana to the max, and pushing both stats even higher. Even though her right leg was bleeding and hurting horribly after losing a part of its flesh, even though several cuts filled her beautiful slender arms, Evangeline's gaze was as steady and lethal as the dagger in her hand as she glared at the fire-toothed tiger and guarded against the vanishing earthworm. However, she knew that even if she managed to win, she would unfortunately not have time to return to the backlines and support the weaker ones. But even then, her life was not guaranteed despite having killed one first-order beast while facing two others in the process as her most lethal attack had been used. After receiving a negative response from Evangeline, Liu Yan did not bother to report the dark situation to Yan Tu as Liu Yan now knew that the burly man was also facing beings that left him no choice but to fight to the death or fight to the death. After the first-order shadow tiger slaughtered the two soul evolvers, the beast tore off a few mouthfuls of flesh, which gave the gunman time to fire several bursts of fire. Machine gun muzzles roared relentlessly and rifles thundered one after another as more than 30 armed men focused on trying to kill the most dangerous monster. However, the bullets barely left white marks on the beast's white fur without even being able to penetrate its defenses at all. Although the bullets did not succeed in wounding it, the shadow tiger felt a great deal of pain after being hit by metal over and over again. Furious, its golden eyes glanced at the nearest group and it lunged towards them. In the blink of an eye the beast had already traveled over 100 meters, and with a swing of its claws, the head of a militant was sent flying through the air. The initial instance of this chapter being available happened at N0V3L.BJN. The blood that represented the death of one of the militants had not yet finished touching the ground when the shadow tiger stomped hard on the ground and lunged towards the second one, decapitating it a moment later. Only 3 or 4 seconds had passed but the beast had already crossed the backlines and ended the lives of 2 militants and 2 soul evolvers. One had to know that the militants and soul evolvers were still struggling to contain over 2,000 unclassified beasts. Although they had firearms to help give them some advantage from afar and the soul evolvers were struggling to contain the unclassified beasts to prevent them from approaching, the great disadvantage in numbers was still persistent so that with each passing second more soul evolvers were wounded and occasionally some of them were cruelly killed before being devoured. At the beginning, there were over 400 soul evolvers and around 600 or 800 armed men. However, even though the battle had only lasted for approximately 30 minutes, those numbers had dropped to approximately 250 soul evolvers. The only ones who had suffered practically no casualties were the armed men thanks to the sacrifice of these soul evolvers who were striving to keep the seemingly unstoppable army of beasts at bay. Of course, while roughly half of the soul evolvers had died, those who still persisted and were still fighting fiercely had become tremendously more powerful compared to what they were 30 minutes ago just before the battle broke out. If previously the average level was about level 5, now the average level was easily over 14. This was the reward for surviving this fatal head-on collision with dangerous beings. Bai Zimin had been experiencing this kind of fights from the first day of the apocalypse and that was precisely why he was so powerful. While Bai Zimin and the other main fighters of his faction were constantly facing maximum dangers, most of the surviving humans only dealt with zombies whenever they went out in search of supplies or when some stray beast appeared. But such things were completely different from facing death itself. If you failed, then death would embrace you whether you wanted it to or not. However, if by some kind of miracle, coincidence, or anything else you managed to survive such a deadly situation, you would definitely rise like a dragon to the skies. This was precisely what the soul evolvers were experiencing. In the fervor and lust of the battle, the ecstasy of feeling how they became abysmally more powerful every time they absorbed the tiniest bit of soul power from the enemies they defeated or helped defeat made these men and women completely ignore the constant danger they faced and fight tooth and nail. To grow stronger, to evolve beyond, and become much more powerful. In that sense, humans were no different from beasts. But it was precisely that madness that kept the human defense from collapsing even when all seemed to be lost in despair was right before their eyes. Swoosh! The shadow tiger decapitated and tore off the heads of 10 other armed men just as a group of 10 soul evolvers rushed forward in an attempt to stop him. The instinct within them told them that the monster they faced was beyond their current capabilities, but at the same time, they could feel that they would become insanely stronger if they could defeat it. Unfortunately, even though the lowest level among them was 17 and fortunately 2 of them managed to reach level 20, these soul evolvers were still far away from the power of a first-order beast. A first-order agility-type beast, which was one of the most dangerous ones. With a couple of quick steps, like those of an intangible shadow, the shadow tiger appeared in the middle of the group of soul evolvers and with a fierce swing of its claws to the left and right, 4 of them were decapitated. Before the heads rolled on the ground, the beast lunged forward and opened its jaws wide, biting the head of another soul evolver and causing it to explode like a watermelon falling from a 10th floor. Blood, encephalic matter, skull fragments, and flesh stained the ground and the extremely unpleasant smell filled the atmosphere, joining the smell of storm-washed blood. Damn beast! Roared a grey-haired old man, and ignoring his own safety he lunged forward to cling to the monster's neck in an attempt to suffocate it. Gu Tao! Kill it! Even if we die here we must take revenge for the leader. This old man was one of the lowest survivors in the past. Before the arrival of Bai Zimin, his life was worse than hell and he could not even eat enough to fill his stomach, let alone live with dignity. However, when the new regime came into rule after Bai Zimin's takeover, this old man whom everyone called Old Ji could not only eat his fill but also gained honor, prestige, and many comrades whom he cherished greatly after losing his meaning in this life when his wife turned into a zombie during the outbreak of the Mana wave. This Old Ji was loyal to the death to Bai Zimin and to his group as they were the ones who gave him the life he was living right now. Therefore, he was more than willing to give his all for them. The shadow tiger shook fiercely in an effort to break free and even tried to bite Old Man Ji. However, the old man was extremely cunning as he held on in such a way that the beast would not be able to use its claws to scratch him nor would it be able to use its mouth to bite him. Even so, the shaking caused his internal organs to move out of place and the blood in his body began to stir. Involuntarily, Old Ji opened his mouth and spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. However, he proved to be an extremely tenacious person as he not only did not let go of the tiger, but tightened his grip even more. Gu Tao was a burly middle-aged man. He was a husband and at the same time, he was also a father. In the past, he and his family could only maintain a weak existence by eating the relief food provided by the previous base government. His growing son suffered from malnutrition and his wife's physique could no longer be sustained and they too began to lose strength. However, as with old Ji, Gu Tao's life was completely transformed after the arrival of Bai Ziman and his faction. To say that Gu Tao and his family went from living on the 10th level of hell to living on the 9th cloud was not an exaggeration at all. This Gu Tao was precisely the man who a few days ago was lining up to receive the new relief food under the supervision of Shangguan Bing Shuet. A/N, Cap 281. That same day, Gu Tao hurried to the lines where registrations were being received for all those who wished to become soul evolvers and fight on the front lines. Despite his initial fear, he soon realized that zombies were not as scary as they seemed, and when his level reached a certain threshold, even the lower level unclassified savage beasts were no longer a major challenge for him. Now, not only could he enjoy a sumptuous meal every day, but his family had been moved from the west of the base where there were only wooden houses and the poorest of the poor lived to the east. From living in wooden houses to owning a luxurious villa in the privileged area of the base. Today, Gu Tao had managed to reach level 20. From a normal weak human that no one respected to a powerful soul evolver that everyone looked up to wherever he went. Gu Tao's life had also changed drastically for the better in about a week. All thanks to Bai Ziman and his faction. Die. A piercing roar broke out amidst the lightning as he raised a bone saber and slashed ferociously towards the skull of the beast that had momentarily halted its movements. Bang. The heavy bone saber struck the skull of the shadow tiger, leaving the beast slightly stunned. Blood began to flow from the impact site, but Gu Tao's strength and the power of his weapon were not enough to break through the shadow tiger's natural defenses because despite being an agility-type beast with low defense, a first-order beast was a first-order beast. Exhausted after so much fighting, that blow had drained basically all of the stamina in Gu Tao's body. Therefore, his saber that weighed over 100 kilograms finally fell to the ground and he fell to his knees while breathing heavily. Old Ji also began to lose strength in his grip as his internal injuries grew worse and worse. Although the shadow tiger was briefly stopped by Gu Tao's strike, such a meager amount of time was not enough to recover from such injuries at all. Damn. A bitter smile formed on both men's lips as they looked at each other with a hint of sadness. With no strength left, old Ji fell to the ground unable to bear it anymore and flew right next to Gu Tao. Looking at the tiger who was staggering and shaking its head to wake itself up, old Ji declared, "This old man is 55 this year. Tonight I killed over 300 beasts by myself and saved the lives of several brothers. What is there to be afraid of then?" Gu Tao nodded. Although he was sad that he would never see his family again after dying, he firmly believed that people who followed Bai Ziman and the Ice Princess Shangguan Bing Shui would not let his son and wife suffer injustice if mankind managed to overcome this seemingly bottomless abyss. The shadow tiger finally recovered from the dizziness it felt and glared with furious eyes at the two men in front of it. The beast roared, exuding from its mouth the smell of flesh and blood from the lives it had taken earlier and then lunged forward. Just as Gu Tao and old Ji's head were about to be sent flying by the sharp claws of the first-order monster, a flash of lightning different from those in the sky crackled in the distance and before the two men knew it a tall figure appeared before them. Although Gu Tao was taller, inwardly he felt that this silhouette that had appeared before him at the last instant was actually as tall as a tower. This person's back seemed to be as wide as to block the wind itself and its shoulders capable of supporting the weight of the heavens themselves. Even without having seen this person's face, the black armor that he had once managed to see from afar made Gu Tao and old Ji's heart pound like never before. However, although the two humans seemed to recognize the newcomer, the beast did not. In fact, the beast did not care who it was and continued to charge furiously forward as it opened its jaws wide and aimed for the newcomer's neck. Unfortunately for the shadow tiger who specialized in agility and whose power had been enough to become everyone's despair, the person before it was now so fast that those swift movements seemed to have become slow as those of a snail. The person stretched its right hand forward with what appeared to be a slow-motion camera movement, but before the two men knew it, they saw a flash, and then the head of the beast that had become their despair was seen flying through the air in a beautiful curve before falling heavily to the ground. Bang! When the head fell heavily on the ground, a moment later the still-moving body of the shadow tiger also fell forward. However, because the beast was moving too fast, the body that was almost 2 meters tall threatened to crush the body of the person who had just saved the lives of Gu Tao and old Ji. The two men heard a snort filled with coldness and while they were still inwardly shocked and amazed by the scene before their eyes, that person punched forward a seemingly simple swing. Bang! The body of the shadow tiger was as if it had been hit by a huge cargo truck since after receiving the impact of that person's fist, it was sent flying straight up hundreds of meters as if it were a cannonball propelled by gunpowder. Several pieces of flesh came off from the impact site and the blood left a large stain on the ground before finally being washed away by the endless raindrops. But this was not all. The explosion had been loud enough to attract the attention of those at the front and since those on the back lines were already trying to stop the shadow tiger from the start, now almost all those in the vicinity noticed the presence of the newcomer. The shadow tiger's body flew away without any apparent control, but under everyone's dumbfounded gaze, the extremely tough and sturdy body of the beast struck the bodies of dozens of beasts that were on the way. Bang! 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 Even though the shadow tiger was already dead, the power contained in its evolved body was nothing to scoff at. Dozens of unclassified beasts blew up into a bloody mess and amidst the lightning and storm, a dense mist of crimson blood slowly floated down as red drops began to fall to the ground in the form of rain. For a moment it looked as if the battlefield had fallen silent. The roar of the beast seemed to have died down as if suddenly mute. The gunmen unconsciously stopped pulling the trigger or froze as they tried to change the magazine, and the soul evolvers who fought without concern for their lives seemed to regain some of the sanity that identified them as intelligent beings. How much power was needed to send flying the body of a beast whose might alone was enough to terrify everyone and cause the backlines that supported the front lines to nearly collapse? The armed men and soul evolvers still remembered clearly how even medium-caliber bullets failed to penetrate the skin of that monster. However, a single hit from this person not only sent the tiger's decapitated body flying but was also enough to wipe out dozens of unclassified beasts as an extra bonus. Gu Tao and old Ji were looking at the head of the shadow tiger at close range with their eyes wide open, and after a more careful look, the two men realized that the head had not been cut off, it had been ripped off with raw brute strength. The two men looked at each other and both saw the shock in their eyes before looking back at the wide back of the person who saved their lives. You. Gu Tao could barely speak. In a hoarse voice, he finally managed to say, "Who are you?" Although both he and old Ji beside him already had the answer in their hearts, for some reason they did not dare to believe it. From both men's points of view, the power this person had just demonstrated was not something a human being should possess, it was far beyond what they could comprehend. The most powerful human beings that old Ji and Gu Tao had ever seen in their lives were people like Yan Tu and Evangeline. The power of those two was already insane, both of them were so powerful that it was astonishing, however, they were still at a level of acceptability. But to take down a beast of such magnitude in one blow? With such ease as if playing a game of house? Such power was definitely the first time both men had witnessed it, and even though they had both reached level 20, they could not even comprehend what level the existence before them was at. That person did not respond immediately and instead muttered in a low voice, "No more of these stats? I wouldn't be surprised if from now on the first order stops giving me anything good. Although, well, I will not know before I evolve to the next stage anyway." It was only after muttering somewhat intangible words that this person slowly turned around to face the two men, revealing a handsome face that was adorned with a pair of eyes as dark as night and as sharp as a legendary sword. His hair as dark as the ink was soaked from the rain, but it did not detract from his demeanor brimming with greatness in conjunction with a matching armor set. "I am Bai Zeman," he replied. The debut release of this chapter happened at N0V3L_B1N. His gaze was cold and indifferent, releasing unconscious pressure that made the two men feel that instead of looking at a person they were looking at a mythological beast. Soon, however, a faint smile appeared in their savior's eyes and his voice rang out again, "You've done a good job. Both of you can rest and leave the rest to me." Hearing the name of the person who had just saved their lives in their most desperate moment, realizing that the person many thoughts had died was actually alive and wielding seemingly paragonless power, the two extremely exhausted men finally could no longer fight against Stamina's total exhaustion and passed out on the spot. However, even though both Gu Tao and old Ji had fainted, they both fell down knowing in their hearts that now everything would be alright. From now on, everything would be alright. While looking at the two fainted men, Bai Zeman sighed in his heart. Were it not because they felt the explosion caused by Evangeline and Yan Tu's clash against the 6 first-order beasts, were it not because both he and Shang Guan Bingshui had coincidentally achieved their purpose at that very moment, were it not for the fact that Bai Zeman had absorbed terrifying amounts of soul power that had boosted his agility to almost double what it was and boosted his movement speed to catastrophic levels, the lives of these two brave men would have been lost forever. A single second later would have been enough for Bai Zeman to lose 2 soul evolvers who were loyal to him from the bottom of their hearts and revered him. At the same time, mankind would have lost 2 potentially great warriors who were courageous enough to fight a beast colossally more powerful than them even though they were aware that their chances of surviving the confrontation were slim to none. In the span of 5 seconds since he killed the Shadow Tiger until now, many thoughts went through Bai Zeman's head. It was then that chaos erupted again. It was just that this time, the chaos was completely different from before. "It's the leader. The leader is back. Miss Kong really said the truth. The leader didn't die. Ha ha ha, you idiot. How could the leader die so easily?" It didn't matter if it was the armed men closest to Bai Zeman on the back lines of the battlefield or those soul evolvers who just moments ago were fighting with their lives in constant danger to cut off the unclassified beasts, they all shouted their joy and expelled their worries as they looked at the barely 20-year-old with fervent eyes. Not all of them had seen Bai Zeman, after all, many of them were just new recruits. However, none of that mattered at the moment. The only important thing was that someone with enough power to literally completely crush a beast on the level of those beasts that had managed to stop the base's most powerful fighters had now appeared and was clearly with them. The humans seemed to receive a great boost and those who were preparing to flee when things were getting ugly automatically stopped as hope grew within them once again. Although Bai Zeman noticed several of these people, he did not say anything. Right now, what humanity least needed was for him, as their leader, to start killing or punishing his kind. At least now was not a good time to warn possible deserters. After all, fear was also a natural thing and Bai Zeman knew that he could not suppress fear with fear if he wanted to rule a worthy kingdom. Liu Yan carefully observed the surroundings and his heart was filled with surprise when he discovered that the unclassified beasts suddenly stopped moving. These mindless beasts that all they knew to do was slaughter and feared nothing in the world suddenly stopped assaulting humans and instead bared their fangs at the human who had just appeared. However, even though the 2,500 plus unclassified beasts that were still alive looked extremely threatening, none of them took the initiative to charge forward. Liu Yan, although not a military man, was a man who spent most of his life as a police officer, so he knew how to seize an opportunity when it came his way. To all team leaders, listen to my order. He picked up his radio and ordered loudly, the leader has just returned. I repeat, the leader has just returned. All troops slowly retreat to the back lines heading southwest. While many had realized that something was going on, the battlefield stretched for over a kilometer. This made it simply impossible for each and every man on the battlefield to know exactly what was going on even though they could indistinctly hear the shouts of their comrades in the distance. Therefore, Liu Yan quickly organized them and these men immediately took advantage of the fact that the beasts seemed to be in a trance to get into their vehicles and return before joining together to form a large semicircle. Just behind them was the base where those they somehow or other wanted to protect were located. A few seconds after Bai Zeman arrived, Shang Guan Bingshui appeared at his side along with a breeze of fresh air. Even in the midst of the storm, the jasmine scent of her skin could not escape his senses. Liu Yan slowly approached and upon seeing Shang Guan Bingshui nodded respectfully before looking at Bai Zeman with complicated eyes. However, in the end, he said the emotions that filled him the most at that moment, "It's good that you came back." Bai Zeman nodded towards him with a faint smile but said nothing. Soon enough, an injured Evangeline and Kong Lan approached and stood beside him. "Are you two okay?" Bai Zeman asked with a slight frown as he saw the condition of the two women. Kong Lan smiled bitterly and said exhaustedly, "Leader, I'm afraid I can't heal until tomorrow. Were it not for your arrival and the strange behavior of those first-order creatures that suddenly froze, a couple of broken fingers and a fractured shoulder might not be my only problem." Evangeline said nothing but it was obvious that she was also glad that Bai Zeman hadn't died in the middle of that terrifying explosion deep in the heart of the forest. Even though she was clearly exhausted, the steady look in her eyes remained unchanged and Bai Zimin couldn't help but praise her in his heart. Both of you have done a great job surviving. He looked at both of them and praised them sincerely. Not for her fighting, but for her surviving. Bai Zimin's words did not surprise Kong Lan very much since she had been following him from the beginning of the apocalypse when the world changed and became the hell it was today. However, the same could not be said for Evangeline. Bai Zimin's words did not surprise Kong Lan very much since she had been following him since the beginning of the apocalypse when the world changed and became the hell it was today. However, the same could not be said for Evangeline. As an assassin, from the very day she was trained until the day she carried out her last mission before the apocalypse and even after, the only thing her temporary bosses naturally cared about was whether she successfully completed the mission she was given or not. As for whether she survived in the process or lost any limbs, none of them ever cared. Of course, Evangeline knew this was normal, so although it was difficult at first, she slowly got used to it and her personality eventually adapted to that of a professional assassin over the years. Therefore, that her immediate leader cared about her and praised her not for managing to kill a first-order beast while keeping 2 others at bay but for staying alive was something Evangeline was experiencing for the first time. Yan Tu also returned and after greeting Bai Zimin and Shang Guanbing Shui he took a step back to stand next to Liu Yan. This action alone made it clear that although he respected Bai Zimin for being the strongest, his true loyalty was to Liu Yan. This was very natural, and Bai Zimin was clear that he could never have the total loyalty of all his men. After all, humans were not outdated machines. As thinking beings, each intelligent human had their own thoughts and ideals. Bai Zimin noticed that Yan Tu also had several wounds on his body ranging from minor to moderately severe. One of them in particular revealed by its fast regeneration that Kong Lan's lesser healing skill had been serving its purpose perfectly. It was only after looking at the miserable conditions of Evangeline and Yan Tu that Bai Zimin realized that if not for Kong Lan, the human fortress would have long ago fallen. Kong Lan was not the strongest, nor was she the fastest, nor was she the one with the largest mana reserve despite her clear talent for magic. However, it was only thanks to her existence that Bai Zimin managed to arrive in time. Of course, everyone contributed and if just one of the pieces present was missing or damaged nothing would be the same. Bai Zimin was clear about that. What happened? He finally asked as he looked at Liu Yan. The latter smiled bitterly and slowly began to narrate the events. From the explosion in the center of the forest over 100 kilometers deep to the powerful rumble that slightly shook the ground beneath the base and alerted everyone. Finally, he added, we all thought you were dead when we heard that you and Miss Shangguan had gone into the forest. That explosion was too scary after all. In the end, the beasts closest to the outer perimeter of the forest suddenly started to come out as if fleeing from something, and then what you can probably imagine for yourself happened. I see. The inaugural upload of this chapter took place via N0v3L.B, J, N. Bai Zimin didn't need to figure too much for a complete blueprint of everything what had happened to form in his head. However, even though it was partly his fault, he was also a human being and not an omniscient existence. He had no way of knowing that the power of Crimson Blood Judgment in conjunction with his blood manipulation now evolved to second order and his newly acquired gravity manipulation would result in a colossal explosion of such magnitude. Bai Zimin also had no idea figuring that tonight he would end up meeting 3 evolved second order beasts. There were many things that even if one planned ahead they could be completely ruined. Bai Zimin did not have the ability to control fate and all he could do was hold on with everything he had while trying his best not to fall between stumbles. What will you do now? Shang Guanbing Shui naturally knew the difficulties Bai Zimin was going through, and in an attempt to help him, she decided to change the subject. Many times, due to the power that Bai Zimin displayed from time to time, most would forget that he was just a young man who was previously an ordinary college student. Perhaps, in the minds of many, Bai Zimin felt no burden. However, as a person of great power, Shang Guanbing Shui knew that those people were terribly wrong. She herself could feel enormous pressure on her shoulders even while she was asleep. How great must be the pressure of Bai Zimin as the highest leader then? Just thinking about it made her feel a little sorry for him. Bai Zimin was naturally unaware of the thoughts of the woman beside him. After hearing her question, his expression turned indifferent and as he looked at the mutated and evolved beasts that were still glaring at him with fierce but cautious eyes, he finally spoke in a cold voice. Since these brainless brute beasts came out of that damned forest, then there is no need for them to return at all. After saying this, Bai Zimin took a quick glance at his current status window. Bai Zimin. Status points, 20. Level, 50. Race, human. Class, blood berserker. Subclass, lower leader. Title, 1 hit to kill, irregular. Strength, 716, plus 20, /agility, 772, plus 60, /health, 623, plus 20, /stamina, 951, plus 20, /mana, 674, plus 65, /magic, 687, plus 105. Skills. Active. Blood manipulation, second order active skill, level 1 /Crimson Blood Judgment, third order active skill, level 5 /Regeneration, first order active skill, LVL 5 /Shadow Blink, first order active skill, level 1 /Lightning Movement, second order active skill, level 5 /Invisibility, first order active skill, level 1 /Gravity Manipulation, first order active skill, level 5. Passive. Special Forces Soldier, unranked passive skill, level 5 /Stoneheart, third order passive skill, level 5 /Superhuman Health, first order passive skill, level 5 /Bronze Skin, first order passive skill, level 5 /Mechanic, unranked passive skill, level 5 /Throwing, unranked passive skill, level 5 /Blood Will, second order passive skill, level 5 /Blacksmithing, first order passive skill, level 1 /Danger Sense, unranked passive skill, level 5. Although he was aware of such a thing, looking at the number of his stats and comparing the height they were at now compared to a few hours ago, Bai Zimin felt that a lot of time had passed even though it had actually been less than a day. When a person experienced many things all at once, one after the other without a break, the natural perception of time could atrophy to a great extent. This was precisely what Bai Zimin was suffering at the moment, just as Shang Guanbing Shui was probably doing, but to a probably much lesser extent. How powerful was he currently? To be honest, even Bai Zimin himself did not know to what extent his power had expanded at this point. However, my current self should definitely be able to do it, he thought in a murmur, attracting everyone's confused gaze. Bai Zimin ignored the questioning gazes and simply advanced towards the army of over 2,500 unclassified beasts, 5 first-order beasts, and the first-order mutant plant. Seeing him approaching, the beasts roared in unison as if warning him not to come any closer. The powerful roar shook the earth and the raindrops burst before hitting the ground due to the shockwave. The faces of the armed men turned pale and the soul evolvers who had now awakened from their battle lust finally realized what they were up against, finding it incredibly hard to believe that the ones who held off such overwhelmingly superior numbers of beasts had been them. Amidst the fear and surprise, pride naturally grew in the hearts of these people, and many of them could not wait to tell their friends or loved ones of their heroic feats this night that would mark the first great-scale war between the faction they belonged to and other evolved races. As they watched the back of that seemingly unstoppable young man, none of them thought of a possible defeat. In the past, he possessed the ability to decimate this many enemies with ease. Not to mention his current him. Therefore, Bai Zimin ignored the warning roars and continued to advance as the aura exuding from his body increased with each step he took forward. The only reason he had not finished off all these beasts yet was because he had a better idea. As the soul power within him bubbled furiously, Bai Zimin could clearly feel an incredibly sturdy barrier blocking something within his soul, and after some light thinking, he naturally came to the conclusion that this barrier must be the obstacle blocking him from entering the next evolutionary stage. However, even though that seemingly indestructible and power-packed barrier blocked his soul power there, Bai Zimin's soul power had long ago exceeded the limits of a first-order existence. Therefore, when the soul power gushed out of his body, the pressure the beasts before him felt was by no means the pressure that a first-order existence could release. Bang! Bang! When Bai Zimin's pressure completely surpassed the threshold of level 50 and advanced even beyond level 70, regardless of whether they were unclassified beasts or the first-order beasts, they all immediately shut their mouths as they shuddered on the spot. Although the wild beasts had lost all sense and knew no fear, when one's power reached such a terrifying level as to shake that madness that made them unstoppable in the face of fear or pain, the beasts instinctively felt death itself over their heads. The only existence on the enemy battlefield that did not shudder or flinch too much was the first-order mutant plant. The plant shuddered as if it was struggling with something and a moment later finally swung its vines fiercely towards Bai Zimin. His expression remained unchanged and with a slow and calm movement he caught one of the vines aimed at his head. The rest of the vines hit his armor, but except for slight bang sounds, Bai Zimin's body did not even move from its place, let alone being hurt. After catching the vine that seemed to be a bit more dangerous, Bai Zimin turned his body 360 degrees at full speed. Swoosh! The main body of the first-order mutant plant naturally swept over and spun. Before the plant could do anything, Bai Zimin's overwhelmingly higher agility along with his 700+ strength points did a perfect job in sync. Boom! The main body of the mutant plant sank deep into the concrete floor and several pieces of wood and mysterious colored leaves were torn from its body. The strange creature writhed apparently in great pain, but no matter how hard it tried it failed to get back on its feet. Stand obediently there. Bai Zimin sneered with a faint smile before declaring, all your lives have owners. Immediately afterward, his newly acquired storage treasure floated before slowly landing on his outstretched palm and releasing an ominous crimson radiance. Even the small pearl seemed to be aware that its main use in this life would be to become a lethal weapon in the hands of its master. With hundreds of liters of blood from a terrifying second-order beast, the color radiating from the object could only be described as frightening to the eye. Bai Zimin activated second-order blood manipulation instantly, and the thick river of thick blood that swayed among the collapsed houses and trees shuddered as if it sensed his summons. Swoosh! 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 Waves of blood rose high in the sky and under everyone's gaze, the night seemed to turn crimson for a few moments. Miles of blood after miles of blood were covered by the now floating river, and the amount of mana contained within made everyone tremble in fear. Among the more than 2,000 mutated beasts that had fallen today in combat against the endless hail of bullets fired incessantly by the armed men on the back lines and the ferocity demonstrated by the soul evolvers who greed for the soul power of the beasts as if they were the real beasts, a large part of them were colossal monsters the size of a huge house. How much blood did these beasts have inside their bodies? No one knew exactly. However, since the size of their bodies had grown exponentially after evolution having accepted the mana inside each of them, it was only natural that the blood circulating through each blood vessel would increase accordingly in order to nourish the body and somehow support the increased energy consumption. One could only try to imagine how much blood an elephant-like beast that was easily more than 15 meters tall or rhinoceroses that reached up to 10 meters could have. So, how much blood had been accumulated after more than 2,000 such beastly existences were slaughtered? Literally a river flowed through the battlefield as the endless rain seemed to struggle to wash away the heavy iron smell that enveloped the area. Swoosh! 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 The thick heavy blood began to separate from the rainwater, and under Bai Zimin's practically masterful control over the blood element each drop slowly floated up into the skies. The defending troops of humanity gawked with eyes filled with surprise as the red drops slowly began to release a faint but brilliant crimson shimmer, creating a stark contrast with the purple lightning flashing behind them in the background. Raindrops were falling. Blood drops were rising. The difference between the millions of drops of pure water and the millions of drops of corrupted blood created a visual impact that would undoubtedly remain in the memories of all present for a long time to come. Flash! The beasts trembled in fright at the abrupt release of the mana belonging to the small human being before them. However, the most frightened were the beasts of the first order as they stared with terrified eyes at the drops of blood that slowly began to glow brighter and brighter as they slowly rose to higher and higher heights. The drops of blood were so many that when they reached a certain height they seemed to merge into a single body to form a huge wave of blood that covered the skies like a crimson cloak. Nangong Lingzhen watched it all with disbelief written all over her beautiful face. She had seen firsthand how a single attack from Bai Zimin managed to decimate all enemies within a kilometer of him. However, the scale and magnitude of what she was witnessing tonight was on a completely different level, to the point where Nangong Lingzhen herself had difficulty expressing how heavy her heart felt. What? He was holding back. She muttered with shock and utter disbelief in her voice. This was the only reasonable explanation Nangang Lingzhen could find to associate this Baiziman with the Baiziman from a week ago. Because from her logical point of view, it was impossible to think of any other reasonable reason why someone would suddenly become 3 or 4 times more powerful so fast. Of course, Nangang Lingzhen was aware that by absorbing soul power living beings could become more powerful. However, such a thought never crossed her mind as such an idea was simply insane. Absorbing soul power enough to propel you to such a degree? What kind of beings must you face to achieve such a thing? When this thought flashed in her mind, however, Nangang Lingzhen's eyes twitched and her heart trembled as she recalled the great explosion in the center of the forest plagued by mutant beasts. Just then, an indifferent voice replied. I don't think he was holding back then. Nangang Lingzhen looked to her left and saw that at some point, Shang Guanbing Shui had arrived beside her. Shang Guanbing Shui watched the endless crimson glow dancing above the clouds before slowly lowering her head to look at the young man's back 50 meters away. The cloak attached to the shoulder pads protruding from Bai Zimin's armor flapped in irregular patterns not due to the wind but due to the terrifying quantity of mana he was using all at once. In Shang Guanbing Shui's blue eyes, his figure was reflected in the distance and at the same time she could see a faint energy that was tinged with a slight crimson tint around him. The abundance of mana that Bai Zimin was consuming and providing was so great that for a moment the energy surrounding him became faintly visible. It will be better for you if you just assume that this Bai Zimin is a completely new one as far as power is concerned. Shang Guanbing Shui concluded as her eyes glittered with a complicated light. Even though she was the second most powerful just below him, even though there were thousands who longed to stand where she stood, Shang Guanbing Shui only felt weakness as she looked at that back on which the lives of countless rested and back on which the faith and hopes of many others lay. At this moment, Shang Guanbing Shui could not help but wonder in her heart, at what point had the disparity between both of us grown so wide? Shang Guanbing Shui could still clearly remember how back then the difference between her and Bai Zimin was not wide, and even if there was any difference between their overall strength, it was not a noticeable gap. In fact, Shang Guanbing Shui still remembered how back then she saved his life after a battle that exhausted him completely and left him at the mercy of the zombies. So it was around that time. She thought and a small sigh involuntarily escaped from her lips. In fact, the inflection point of Bai Zimin could be said to be his encounter with the First Order Blazing Beetle while he was still just a level 15 unclassified existence. If not for that battle, many things would be different today. It was from that moment on that Bai Zimin's strength only increased more and more, shooting into the skies like a rocket. Although Shang Guanbing Shui had also been growing more powerful and the speed at which her levels were rising was frighteningly fast, the difference in power between her and him only increased with each passing day. How can I be worthy of being his good friend if I can't help him bear his burdens? When such a thought appeared in her mind, Shang Guanbing Shui felt something similar to a burning flame begin to grow deep inside her and her eyes became filled with determination as she saw Bai Zimin about to make his move. For a person like Shang Guanbing Shui who valued friendship as much as her own life, a friend was not something just for show. A friend was someone who could be trusted and counted on. Therefore, she wanted to be a person, a friend on whom Bai Zimin could trust and rely. Little by little and without her realizing it, Shang Guanbing Shui was growing not only as a person but also as a woman. Slowly, she was leaving attitudes that could be considered by many as childish to become a real woman, a woman worthy of reliance. Of course, Bai Zimin knew nothing of Shang Guanbing Shui's thoughts. At this moment he was putting as much concentration as possible into performing a suppression-type attack that would not kill the beasts but would leave them weakened enough so that they would not have the ability to launch any kind of counterattack. At this point, Bai Zimin had reached level 50 and was at the breaking point where one more step would lead him to evolve once again, becoming a second-order existence. How much soul power did he need to level up? Bai Zimin did not know. However, he was aware that the amount was undoubtedly very high. If Bai Zimin wanted to absorb the soul power of unclassified existences to gain enough boost that would somehow allow him to level up, then he would probably need to kill several 100,000 or even over 1,000,000 creatures. Such a path was not feasible unless he was willing to spend years to progress from order to order. For a person like him, who sought to become a powerful existence in the shortest amount of time possible, the most viable path was to defeat and absorb the soul power of beings at levels above his own, the more, the better. Although this meant risking his life in every battle, Bai Zimin had decided to walk this path from the day he learned that Lilith needed his help to accomplish something. Regardless of what Lilith wanted, Bai Zimin would do his best to fulfill it. The inaugural upload of this chapter took place via N0v3L.B, J, N. He was this kind of person. He didn't like to owe anyone anything, he didn't like to feel indebted. But above everything else, Bai Zimin was a grateful person, and he was infinitely grateful towards Lilith. So, I'll risk my life in every step if it means to become stronger faster. He muttered in a low voice, low enough to be completely eclipsed by a fierce thunderclap that rumbled the earth. Bai Zimin looked up at the sky, his face slightly pale due to the consumption of over 600 mana points brightened slightly after receiving head on the crimson flash of what appeared to be a huge wave of blood floating above his head and stretching over 5 kilometers in length. This is the path I walk. He whispered to no one in particular, more as if he were reaffirming something to himself. Blood vortex. His voice echoed amidst the thunder and lightning. The heart of every soul evolver and every armed man trembled and the enemy beasts shuddered in fear in their place. The entire world seemed to fall silent for an instant and as if the Emperor of all blood declared it, the seemingly endless amount of crimson liquid floating in the sky twisted to form a huge vortex of blood that quickly began to whirl at speeds impossible to follow with the naked eye. Swoosh. 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 The blood vortex whirled at such high speeds that the wind began to be drawn into the center like a black hole and the fierce storm failed to overcome the pressure resulting in every raindrop within 5 kilometers beginning to fly into the vortex before it even touched the ground. Sitting on top of a large building, Lilith felt bittersweet emotions as she watched this. To Bai Zimin, what he was doing might not be a big deal, but Lilith knew that this was far from normal. Perhaps, he believed that as long as he had enough mana, he could do anything. However, this could not be more distant from reality, an existence could not simply perform a magical attack just because they possessed enough mana. Bai Zimin's magic spell had reached such a vast magnitude that it even managed to slightly influence how the weather behaved within a certain limit. Before Lilith or anyone else could think any more, Bai Zimin's deep voice thundered into the night again. Chains. And as if a portal to another world opened from the sky, hundreds of thousands of blood chains shot out from the dark center of the blood vortex. Swoosh. 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 The thick, glowing blood chains remained attached to the vortex and twisted like snakes as they descended from the heavens and headed towards the over 2,500 beasts. Although the beasts knew they had to flee, the pressure of an infinitely more powerful soul was not something they could shake off so casually, and at the sight of what seemed to be endless blood chains sent from the heavens to punish them, they could only shudder fearfully. The howling of the wind was similar to the cry of a ghost in the middle of the night as intermittent lightning flashes tinged the world in blue and purple. Thunder sounded as loud as explosions announcing the beginning of the battle. What appeared to be a huge red eye hovered high in the sky, and the crimson glow looked like the devil of the legends. However, if one looked carefully, one would easily notice that the center of the eye was actually black, dark as the clouds that covered the skies at that moment. From the dark center of the strange phenomenon, hundreds of thousands of long tentacles releasing a faint deep red glow extended from high in the sky all the way to the ground to form what appeared to be a mythological monster. This eye was actually the blood vortex that XIETIAN had formed with his second-order blood manipulation skill after making use of the immeasurable liters of blood from around 2,000 enemy wild beasts that escaped from the mutant forest after the clash between the second-order existences and XIETIAN's crimson blood judgment. With a diameter of approximately 300 meters, its brightness and size made it possible that even from the ground each of the North Camp's defensive troops would be able to witness it in all its splendor. No matter if it was an ordinary human without even having taken a single step on the path of evolution, and no matter if it was a soul evolver, each of the people presents marveled between fear and shock as their pupils reflected that distant but terrifying bright crimson light high in the skies. Swoosh. 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 Under XIETIAN's control, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of blood chains whose thickness was enough to compare to the entire body of a corpulent adult man spun in a spiral shape like snakes and began to cling tightly onto the bodies of the mutant beasts. Blood chains twisted and coiled fiercely around the bodies of each enemy beast. Amidst enraged and frightened roars, many of the beasts whose levels were higher and whose bodies were more powerful began to fight furiously in an attempt to break free from the bindings that constrained them. Futile effort. XIETIAN coldly snorted. His voice sounded like that of the demon itself, and with a wave of his hand coupled with an investment of another 50 points of mana, the blood vortex began to spin at much higher speeds as the blood supplement the chains received increased tremendously. The chains became at least 3 times more powerful and slammed hard into the skin of those who struggled in an attempt to break free. But the most terrifying and surprising thing was that the blood did not drop to the ground but began to be absorbed quickly by the blood chains, which slowly but surely increased their power. Giant elephants, sturdy rhinos, ferocious tigers, thickly armored boars, etc., all the unclassified beasts fell to the ground one after another. The earth shook at the mass collapse and the blood chains twisted again. The tips of the chains transformed into long, thick stakes that with a gesture from XIETIAN stuck deep into the ground. 3 of the 5 first-order mutant creatures were suppressed by the blood chains, however, 2 of them managed to give XIETIAN some difficulty. One of these creatures was the fire-toothed tiger against which Evangeline fought. The creature possessed a truly ferocious bite, so it slowly but surely began to destroy the chains surrounding its body. Even as XIETIAN tried to seal its mouth, the blood sizzled as a faint cloud of steam rose into the sky. Since the blood XIETIAN was using was the blood of unclassified beasts, it was only natural that the skill of a first-order beast that happened to be the perfect counter would give some trouble. Fortunately, XIETIAN's blood manipulation skill had evolved to second order, and the blood affected by the skill also became stronger while the effect was active. Otherwise, the fire-toothed tiger might have already broken free. Swoosh. XIETIAN's body swayed and an instant later appeared right in front of the fire-toothed tiger's eyes. His speed was so high at this point that for those soul evolvers who had not even reached the first order, it felt as if he were teleporting. The fire-toothed tiger barely had time to open its eyes any wider when a punch that seemed to weigh several tons landed heavily on the beast's skull. Bang! After the direct hit, the body of the squirming fire-toothed tiger collapsed noisily on the ground, and the blood chains clung to its limbs in such a way that even if it wanted to, it would not be able to stand up again. Moreover, the beast's roars finally subsided and a dazed look shone in its pain-filled eyes. After calming the fire-toothed tiger, XIETIAN looked down at the ground and frowned slightly. The other first-order creature that was giving him headaches and on a larger scale than the fire-toothed tiger was actually the earthworm, another beast that Evangeline was facing a few minutes ago. Although XIETIAN didn't know what kind of creature it was since it was hidden underground, he could feel the creature's soul power moving around underground constantly. How the hell am I going to get that sucker out from the ground? Such a thought caused the frown on his face to deepen a little more. This was the first time XIETIAN had encountered this type of creature or something similar that had the ability to hide underground. Such beings were usually the most difficult to deal with, as they could simply hide and come out to launch attacks when they pleased. That beast that was hiding had not yet fled for the mere fact that it did not have enough intelligence to realize that it could not defeat XIETIAN, so despite its fear it still hovered around the area waiting for the opportunity to devour that huge amount of soul power that attracted it greatly. Even after 2 full minutes, he could not think of anything useful. His blood manipulation skill was useless in this case, and the rest of his active skills were of no use for this kind of situation either. He also acted oblivious and left several openings in his defense on purpose in an attempt to lure the creature, but nothing worked. Just then, a series of soft and delicate footsteps approached closer and closer in his direction, and after turning around he realized that this person was actually Evangeline. What's wrong? He asked, at the same time noticing how most of the superficial cuts on her skin had disappeared after her health stat began to act effectively. Evangeline said nothing and looked at the surroundings. After a minute of silence during which XIETIAN looked at her expectantly waiting for her to have some sort of solution, she finally looked at him and said something that took him by surprise. Why don't you use your sword? My sword? XIETIAN blinked and unconsciously looked over his shoulder to catch a glimpse of the large hilt of his blaze-scale greatsword. How do you want me to hit it if I don't even? Just as he was saying this, his words suddenly stalled and his dark eyes shone brightly. A slightly crazy idea popped into his mind, but the more he thought about it and studied it, the more he felt it might actually work. With a slight smile, he looked at Evangeline and nodded before asking her to step back. Swoosh. A thin blood chain shot out from the blood vortex that was still feeding the rest of the chains. However, this thin blood chain was not used to limit the movements of any enemy, and instead, XIETIAN controlled it to draw his sword. The blood chain wrapped around the hilt and slowly floated forward. Bai Zimin took the sword with ease, surprised at how light it now felt in his hands, and the blood chain shot skyward, disappearing into the blood vortex an instant later. If previously Bai Zimin felt that his blaze scale greatsword weighed about a ton, the current one he felt as if that weight had been halved. Of course, he knew that the weight was still the same, and the reason behind this was that his strength stat had increased explosively after killing 2 second-order existences and receiving another boost from the second-order ape that Shang Guanbing Shui defeated. After Evangeline backed off, Bai Zimin raised his sword high into the sky and then, under everyone's dumbfounded gaze, fiercely slashed downwards without holding back his strength at all. Boom! An explosion that even surpassed the loud thunder boomed, and the defensive troops felt as if their minds went blank for a second. A crater of approximately 200 meters with Bai Zimin as its center and whose depth easily exceeded 10 meters spread out to the sides. As the earth broke into millions of pieces and mud flew everywhere, he managed to hear a slight groan from underground. A smile automatically formed on his face as he saw that this fierce and barbaric method was indeed effective. Without even 2 seconds of delay, he raised his sword again and slashed for a second time. Boom! Hearing that same groan, his hopes grew, so he slashed again. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 20 times. The constant explosions shook the entire half-kilometer around Bai Zimin as a nucleus, and now a crater whose depth exceeded 100 meters was in a place that was previously flat ground. Even after all that, it is not coming out? A hint of annoyance flashed in his eyes, finally stopping his mindless and bestial attack as he realized that even though the beast underground had definitely received several injuries due to the shaking, it still refused to come out and even refused to leave. Since you don't want to come out, then you can only die, he thought as the murderous intent in his eyes became stronger and stronger. His original intention was to let his troops of soul evolvers kill all these beasts. With such a large number, all of them should be able to at least average between 2 and 5 levels. Those who were at lower levels might even benefit more with some extra stat points if they were a bit lucky. Although it was a pity to lose such a first-order beast, Bai Zimin didn't have all night and his patience wasn't too great either, so he decided to end the life of whatever monster was hiding like a cowardly rat. All of you, return to the base and wait behind the walls, Bai Zimin shouted loudly as he turned around. His voice echoed throughout the length and breadth of the battlefield, so even though many did not understand what was happening, they immediately got into the vehicles and began to move back. Riding in a modified jeep in which only Shang Guanbing Shui, Kong Lan, Evangeline, and Nangong Lingzhen were traveling, the expression of the woman who had been conferred the title of Ice Princess by everyone at the base due to her icy personality looked extremely serious at this moment. What's wrong? Nangong Lingzhen couldn't help but ask worriedly. Shang Guanbing Shui hesitated for a moment, but in the end, she shook her head without saying anything. Let's hope that madman won't use that attack here again, she thought with lingering fear as the still fresh memory of the power of the blood trident thrown by Bai Zimin seemed to flash before her eyes again for the second time. That was one of the times in which her life was at greatest risk since the apocalypse began. And it was caused by her friend. After driving approximately 2 kilometers away, all the modified vehicles entered the base gates and the soldiers hid behind the walls. Although the walls were barely 2 or 3 meters high, in case something happened first, the walls would receive the strongest impact and this would increase the chances of survival in the face of danger. Meanwhile, Liu Yan and the rest of the soul evolvers above level 15 climbed several buildings in an attempt to see what was happening. Unfortunately, only a few of them had binoculars, so most could only try to strain their eyes fruitlessly. That blood stuff is visible even from here, Yan Tu muttered in a serious voice as his sharp eyes reflected the blood vortex in the distance. With his level, it was not necessary to use binoculars to see far away. Even though it barely looked like a sphere little bigger than a dot from over 2,000 meters distance, the fact that such a phenomenon still was visible even from such a distance already was a thing of madness. Liu Yan said nothing at all, and after several seconds finally said in a serious voice, Yan Tu, if you still have any thoughts of taking over again, just discard it. Yan Tu remained silent before finally saying a single word, understood. Yan Tu was completely loyal to Liu Yan's family and was willing to do anything for them to thank them for what they had done for him in the past. From his point of view, Liu Yan was a man worthy of following and whose intelligence qualified him to rule. However, being loyal and being foolish were two completely different things. Yan Tu had already realized that the current him had no hope of defeating someone of Bai Zimin's caliber. It was just that tonight he even came to feel that defeating the silver-haired moonshine woman named Shang Guanbing Shui suddenly seemed to have become much more difficult than it already was. As for Bai Zimin, Yan Tu barely dared to look him defiantly in the eyes for an instant before his whole soul trembled as if threatening to collapse just like a building whose foundation was useless in the face of the power of a maximum earthquake. As the two men chatted, a cold voice sounded from behind them. From what I know of him, which is arguably no small thing, Bai Zimin is quite tolerant. But there is one thing he definitely does not tolerate. Do you know what it is? Liu Yan's face changed and Yan Tu's muscles automatically tensed as both men turned at the same time only to see that at some unknown moment to them, Shang Guanbing Shui was standing 20 meters away on the other side of the building. Her blue eyes flashed with a tinge of coldness and she continued indifferently, the betrayal. If any person ever dares to make a false step, kindly remind them that the result of being defeated means not only the death of those directly involved but also the eternal enslavement of all their family members. Liu Yan looked at her and calmly replied, none of us thought of such a thing. Her eyes glittered uncharacteristically and she remarked coldly, nor did I say that any of you ever did. After saying these words, Shang Guanbing Shui used her fingertips to leap and swoop gracefully toward another building, floating through the air like a butterfly and disappearing from the two men's line of sight soon after. Seeing this, Liu Yan sighed and shook his head. Any strange thoughts he had ever had finally disappeared completely. Although he was someone with ambition and naturally wanted to reign supreme, the thought of his precious daughter becoming a slave made his mind almost completely collapse, wishing he had never even thought of such a thing. What terrifying young women. He chuckled before turning back to using the military binoculars to look off into the distance. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Of course, Bai Zimin was not going to launch Crimson Blood Judgment for the second time in the same night as Shang Guanbing Shui had thought. To be honest, he was still a little afraid of that skill. Since the beginning of the apocalypse, Bai Zimin's life had always been in constant danger, however, tonight was one of the few times when his life encountered extreme danger. Worst of all, the main cause of it all had been himself. Bai Zeman did not have even the slightest doubt that if he did not manage to timely escape from Crimson Blood Judgment's range, by this time his body would have been completely burned to charcoal or directly turned into ashes. Even if he did not know how powerful that attack was, he was not so arrogant as to stupidly believe that his physical body would be able to withstand something that even the physical body of powerful second-order beasts could not. However, the attack he was soon to launch should not be underestimated, since while this was the first time he had used it, he had already done something similar a few hours ago. He. Little brother Zeman, you sure come up with some crazy stuff. Lilith appeared high in the sky, her elegant feet resting gently on one of the blood chains while her long black dress swayed slightly, showing off her ivory legs. Can you read my mind or what? Bai Zeman looked at her and marveled at the tantalizing sight in which her dress was lifted high enough to make suggestive but at the same time without revealing anything that could be considered obscene. She really is a little succubus full of pranks. He thought to himself before shaking his head and focusing on the matter at hand. Bai Zeman flexed his knees and clutched his big sword with both hands. The muscles in his legs tightened as much as possible and the shattered ground beneath his feet began to crack slightly. Bang! With a leap powered by over 730 strength points, Bai Zeman's body flew into the skies like a cannonball at a speed considerably close to the speed of sound before the world began to evolve. The strong winds cut his face and the storm blocked his vision. Were it not for the fact that his stamina was especially high and close to 1000 points, Bai Zeman was sure that his physical body would not be able to handle the enormous pressure he was feeling at that moment. When he was about 100 meters above the ground, the Earth's gravity slowly began to pull him back down to the ground. However, before he had even descended 2 meters, a blood chain shot out from the blood vortex and settled right below his feet. Bang! Bai Zeman used the blood chain to jump back up, and in the blink of an eye, his body was over 200 meters above the ground. Bang! 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 With 3 additional full-power jumps, Bai Zeman finally reached 500 meters high, and it was only then that he decided that it was enough. Even though it was only half a kilometer away from the ground, the winds were hitting a lot harder in this area, and Bai Zeman could feel how the electric energy from the lightning seemed to want to hit his body constantly. From a certain point of view, it was as if nature were rejecting his existence. Held by a pair of blood chains, Bai Zeman inwardly sneered. Regardless of whether nature rejected him or the world feared him, none of this mattered to him. The only thing that went into his eyes were his goals, and for them, he was willing to do anything. This was something Bai Zeman had already demonstrated since day 1 of the apocalypse. Let me see how you are going to continue hiding now. He muttered under his breath and raised his great sword high up, beyond his head and pointing towards the clouds as if challenging the heavens. His dark eyes opened abruptly, and without reservation, he swung the great sword downward. However, this was no normal slash, as just as the tip of the weapon was pointing towards the ground, Bai Zeman released his grip on the hilt. A split second before the crimson-colored great sword completely escaped from his hands, Bai Zeman used the small amount of mana he had left to activate gravity manipulation X15. Bang! The blade of the great sword, constructed by hundreds of scales from a first-order snake, slammed down and like a meteorite breaking through the atmosphere lit up for a second as a huge flame enveloped it and caused a faint flash to be seen from afar that disappeared as soon as it appeared. In just an instant, Bai Zeman's blaze-scale great sword had closed the distance of 500 meters. When the giant sword came into contact with the ground, the world seemed to freeze for an instant, and Bai Zeman seemed to hear his own inner voice shouting, "Please hang on." Immediately after, the whole world seemed to tremble. Boom! As if several hundred grenades joined together to cause a major explosion, the earth shuddered horribly, and a shockwave large enough to send Bai Zeman flying spread everywhere in the form of a sword. There were no flashes of light, no flames, even the sound of the storm seemed to stop for an instant. There was no sound except the rumbling of the earth. The shockwave spread so far and with so much power that all the buildings that were already destroyed were crushed, and the huge trees 3 kilometers away on the outer perimeter of the forest were shattered into millions of tiny fragments of wood. 2 kilometers away, the soldiers and soul evolvers screamed at the same time when they saw the huge shockwave forming what looked like a wind sword slashing towards them. Shang Guanbingshue's face changed slightly, and she hurriedly erected 2 thick walls of ice that stretched several hundred meters just outside the base. Such a thing would definitely not have been possible in the past, but her ice maker skill was no longer the same as before. Bang! The first wall of ice was smashed into pieces, but the power of the shockwave was greatly reduced after traveling a distance of 2 kilometers, so the defensive power of the wall weakened its destructive power even more. The second ice wall resisted for an instant before it too was destroyed by the shockwave. B1N Realm was the platform where this chapter was initially revealed on N0V3L.B1N. The shockwave continued to advance another 200 meters and hit the base wall hard. Thousands of tiny cracks spread the length and breadth of the wall. Fortunately, the power of the shockwave was already almost completely exhausted, so the stone defense managed to hold on without collapsing completely. Those closest to the wall felt their hearts seem to stop for an instant and their faces pale as a dead man's looked forward in a daze. Each of them felt as if a new life had been bestowed upon them tonight. If that shockwave hit them, all of them might well explode in blood mist. The only survivors of that thing would only be the soul evolvers, whose bodies were far more strong than those of a normal human. Shang Guanbingshui gritted her teeth and even with her politeness couldn't help but curse under her breath, "Damn it! This person is really crazy." In the distance, Bai Zeman quickly controlled several blood chains to catch him as his body plummeted towards the ground. When he finally managed to steady himself, a bead of sweat trickled down his face as he looked down. Even though he had absorbed the soul power of a creature called First Order Earth Armor Worm, a close call and he almost ends up killing the rest of the beasts as well. This skill. I really should use it with caution from now on. After everything seemed to calm down and the earth seemed to stop tearing up after receiving such a heavy impact with a magnitude comparable to that of hundreds or even thousands of grenades, Bai Zeman used his blood manipulation skill to control the chains holding him in the air to slowly head towards the ground. The blood vortex still swirled high in the sky and the black clouds occasionally sparkled with a faint blue hue from the lightning that momentarily illuminated the world. The hundreds of thousands of blood chains protruding from the center of the blood vortex were fully tensed to the maximum, imprisoning creatures that had mutated after acquiring mana and gaining the ability to evolve. Some of these creatures were large enough to compare to small moving fortresses, however, no matter how hard they tried, none of these beasts managed to break free from the thick magical chains. Bai Zimin's feet gently touched the ground and the sound of his combat boots rang softly amidst the sepulchral silence. The raindrops were attracted by the blood vortex, the thunder had subsided, and the lightning was no longer so frequent. Standing in the outer area of what appeared to be a crater caused by a meteorite, Bai Zimin looked up into the sky and watched as slowly but surely the thick black clouds began to disperse one after another. The storm is going away. He thought aloud. His voice sounded extremely lonely, and standing surrounded by thousands of vicious appearing creatures looking at him in fear and anger, Bai Zimin's back somehow felt extremely small. Without waiting for anyone to approach him, Bai Zimin slowly moved forward. His feet moved slowly and carried him deeper and deeper into the crater that his own attack had caused. A few moments later, his head disappeared from the surface and his body was no longer visible. Bai Zimin did not hurry, he simply advanced steadily. The only sound in his 2 ears was the sound of his own footsteps and the occasional crumbling of small rocks. Approximately 10 minutes later, he finally reached the deepest area. There, the flesh fragments of an unrecognizable beast as well as tiny shards of what appeared to be some sort of brown metal entered his line of sight. They were obviously the remains of the first-order earthworm. The beast, despite being hidden several meters underground, failed to survive the impact of a weapon whose weight hovered around 1 ton, powered by the combined strength of over 70 men in excellent condition before the apocalypse and propelled by a direct increase of 15 times the Earth's gravity. Bai Zimin raised his head and looked up at the sky. A sigh escaped from his mouth just in time as a gentle cool breeze entered the crater from the surface. Bai Zimin, are you okay? He blinked for a few seconds before realizing who that voice belonged to. Because of the echo, he didn't recognize it right away, but it didn't take him long to identify it. Bing Shui? I'm fine. He replied, still looking up. He took out a small flashlight and pointed upwards before flashing signals as due to the depth of the crater and the darkness of the night, even after evolving to this point he could not see ahead. This was because the depth of the crater actually exceeded 1,000 meters. Bai Zimin's attack had destroyed the entire ground and created a giant hole that went down deep towards the center of the world and whose diameter easily exceeded 2,500 meters. I will go down. Shang Guanbing Shui's voice rang out again and its echo resounded amidst the descending walls of the crater. All right. Bai Zimin replied before focusing his attention on the crimson greatsword. The tip of the greatsword was deeply stuck in the ground along with about 1/3 of the total body. Lucky and it didn't break. He sighed in relief as he reached out for the hilt. With a sharp upward tug, the ground crunched and split slightly to allow the sharp object to slip out. However, when the 2-meter sword was finally completely out of the ground, Bai Zimin realized that maybe he should not have celebrated so prematurely. At least not before seeing the sword body in its entirety. The tip of the great sword had split virtually all the way through and cracks ran the entire length of the weapon's blade. Although the cracks were extremely hairline and small, it was clear that the rank 1 weapon did not have the ability to withstand an attack of such magnitude a second time, or it would definitely crash in the process. Bai Zimin smiled bitterly in his heart as he realized that he might have to upgrade his weapon a bit if he wanted to fight with all his might in the future. After all, while the first-order gravity manipulation skill was a double-edged skill considerably dangerous even to his own life, it was clear to Bai Zimin that a lot of his strength right now depended on that skill. The increase and decrease of gravity as well as the explosive power that his attacks could gain was extremely important in fights to the death. Bai Zimin was certain that the attack he had just made a few minutes ago had enough power to decimate a second-order existence without any problems. As far as destructive power was concerned, the skill gravity manipulation was far more important than blood manipulation. Of course, this was only for destruction. In terms of quality and variety or importance when it came to fighting, Bai Zimin firmly believed that the skill blood manipulation was at least 100 times more important than gravity manipulation. You should be thankful that you used hundreds of scales stacked on top of each other to forge the blade of that sword of yours. A cold, slightly irritated voice snapped him out of his thoughts. Looking to his side, Bai Zimin could make out Shang Guanbing Shui's beautiful features. She was looking at him with both hands on her waist and was clearly unhappy about something. What's wrong? He asked in confusion. You still ask what's wrong? Shang Guanbing Shui was dumbfounded before stepping forward and getting close enough to be able to touch him if she extended her arm out in front of him. Your attack earlier almost killed all the soldiers in the base. Oh, that. Bai Zimin finally lit up. However, his reaction was clearly not what Shang Guanbing Shui expected. That's your answer? She looked at him with wide eyes, revealing her inner surprise. Since the two of them opened up considerably and talked to each other about their lives and families before the apocalypse, it could be said that Shang Guanbing Shui no longer restrained her expressions in front of him. Instead of always keeping a shell of ice around her, she now showed what her heart felt through her facial expressions. Bai Zimin scratched his head with his free hand, and after some time, he finally explained in a low voice, You see, I am not such a good person. Many things I do may seem kind, but in reality everything I do always has a purpose. It may temporarily seem like I'm wasting my time, but I know better than anyone that sooner or later all that wasted time will be paid back in the future. However, those humans who do not dare to genuinely fight against evolved beings, I am afraid that they are dispensable to me. To tell the truth, lately Bai Zimin had been questioning whether Lilith's advice was really good. Did he need a faction? Did he really need one? They were all terribly weak, and even a single first-order beast was enough to cause considerable chaos among humanity. Especially lately, Bai Zimin's power had begun to grow at surprisingly fast speeds, and at even faster speeds he was beginning to distance himself from everyone else. First-order beings posed no challenge to him, and very probably only those existences infinitely close to the third order could pose any real danger to the present him. In a way, Bai Zimin began to think that perhaps he could do everything by himself without too many complications. Shang Guanbing Shui looked at him silently, and as she slowly processed what he had just said, she finally realized a few things. The first thing she somehow realized was that while she knew Bai Zimin quite well, in a way it was also true that what she knew about him was what he wanted to show. There was still much she had yet to discover about his personality and the background on which his actions were based. Another important thing was that, from these words, Shang Guanbing Shui remembered that while Bai Zimin could be kind, he could also be extremely cold and cruel where the lives of others were concerned. Because it had been a while since the last time he had taken human lives simply to demonstrate his might over everyone, Shang Guanbing Shui had forgotten that during the time the group was confined in the university, Bai Zimin had killed about 100 students regardless of their genders just to warn the rest of them. Bai Zimin continued, at the moment, men who use firearms are still somewhat useful. However, sooner rather than later the firearms built by mankind in the past will slowly become ineffective. At that time, those people will become basically useless to me. Do you understand what I mean? He looked straight into her eyes and waited. Shang Guanbing Shui had a complex light in her eyes. She obviously understood that Bai Zimin didn't really care too much whether those soldiers lived or died because he was very clear that before long they would all become burdens. Soon, however, the complexity of her emotions calmed down. Those people had nothing to do with her and the life or death of each of them should be their own responsibility. Her top priority was to survive and right behind it was the search for her mother. In this respect, Bai Zimin and Shang Guanbing Shui were exactly the same. But even then there was something she did not understand. Therefore, after several seconds in which they both simply looked at each other in silence, she asked somewhat hesitantly, Bai Zimin, what is your real target? Bai Zimin looked at her with a serious expression and then a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth as he jokingly said, you really want to know? Little did he expect her to respond with such a serious expression, I want to know. Bai Zimin narrowed his eyes slightly and his mind raced with lightning speed. Without delay, he blurted out with a faint smile, my target is total and absolute control. Didn't I tell you that before? However, Shang Guanbing Shui shook her head and pushed, absolute control of what? This time, he remained silent, and seeing this she continued. Are you talking only about China? About the whole world? Or maybe of something bigger? Bai Zimin lowered his head in silence and seemed to fall into deep thought. Outside the giant crater, the blood vortex was still whirling tirelessly and the blood chain still clung tightly to the mutated beasts. Slowly, the sound of approaching vehicles reached the bottom of the crater and Bai Zimin raised his head as he realized that the soldiers and soul evolvers were returning to the area after the danger disappeared. Shang Guanbing Shui remained silent during all this time, waiting for him to tell her his goal. His real goal, and not what she now firmly believed was only a minor goal that he was actually not considering seriously at all. Finally, Bai Zimin looked her in the eyes again and responded. If I told you that my goal is to control the entire galaxy, what would you think? At such a question, Shang Guanbing Shui was momentarily taken aback and for a split second came to think that perhaps her new friend was having some kind of mental problem that was not letting him reason things out clearly. However, that thought soon disappeared after remembering that the world in which they were currently living, despite being physically the same, could also be considered a completely new world. If it were in the past, something like dominating the entire Milky Way was something that could only happen in science fiction movies where mankind's technology had evolved enormously after thousands of years of studies and projects as well as countless more years of exploration. After all, 21st century mankind didn't even know the entire solar system, let alone the entire galaxy. But with things as they were, Shang Guanbing Shui realized that such a thought was actually not as far-fetched as before. With humans evolving and acquiring supernatural powers, with the support of mana, and with the possibility of acquiring new plans to build objects whose technology was centuries and even millennia ahead of current human technology, colonization of other planets was no longer an impossibility. It was just that she had never thought that far ahead and the only thing she was aiming for was to survive until the next day. However, Bai Zimin looked at her and did not wait for her to respond before continuing, and if I told you that my real goal is to conquer the universe? Could you accept such a thing? Shang Guanbing Shui's eyes widened and she said in a state of shock, you're joking aren't you? She admitted that Bai Zimin was powerful. He was a terrifying monster, brave, and whose speed of growth even made her have no choice but to bow in respect. However, she really hoped that he hadn't been driven mad by the power he had been gaining recently. Because she really didn't want to lose a valuable friend. If it were in the past, Shang Guanbing Shui would without hesitation leave Bai Zimin's faction at the slightest sign of him showing himself going crazy or losing his sanity. But now that he and she had grown close enough to give each other permission to call each other by their first names and even to the point where she trusted him with her eyes closed, Shang Guanbing Shui knew that she could not leave him so casually, she would very probably do everything in her power to bring him back to reality. Of course she would react in this way. Bai Zimin sighed in his heart. If he were in her place, his response would probably be the same. No, his response would probably be even more exaggerated and worse than Shang Guanbing Shui's. However, Bai Zimin's expression was extremely serious as he looked at her and for every second that passed, Shang Guanbing Shui's heart sank more and more. Since the world changed, millions of people died. Bai Zimin began to speak out of nowhere. His usually calm and indifferent eyes even in the face of death revealed real emotions for the first time in weeks, shocking Shang Guanbing Shui deeply. How many elders died in this month and a half? How many couples were separated? How many children lost their parents? How many innocent babies lost their lives so far? How many families were destroyed in the initial adaptation process and how many more will be destroyed from now on? He asked in a low voice. Rather than being a question directed at Shang Guanbing Shui, it seemed more like a question thrown into the air hoping to find an answer somewhere. Knowing that no one would be able to answer such questions, he looked at Shang Guanbing Shui with a slight tinge of sadness that made her heart clench slightly and continued, it has been more than 47 days since the world turned into hell but I still don't know whether my family is alive or not. Although I can currently cover over 700 kilometers in 1 hour, my stamina is not enough to sustain this speed for more than a dozen minutes and even if I could withstand the continuous burnout for a full hour I would still be another 1,100 kilometers short of Yangfang town in Chongping district. Bai Zimin pointed to the sky with his free hand and the grip on the hilt of his great sword tightened as he said with a touch of self-mockery, I can't even claim to be the most powerful being in that forest, let alone dare I say that I am the most powerful being in all the forests of this district or the district in general. To cross beyond Baikwin sub-district and reach Chongping district we will have to annihilate over 20 million zombies and who knows how many wild beasts or mutated plants will add to the equation. Even if I want to run out right now to look for them, I know that if I try to do so I will eventually end up dying due to exhaustion in the midst of desperate battle. Which is why I can only hold on. Because I am weak. Shang Guanbing Shui bit her lower lip tenderly as she listened to his words. She had exactly the same thoughts as Bai Zimin. What more did she not want than to run to where her mother was as quickly as possible to, if she was still alive, ensure her safety and well-being. However, she was weak. so, she needed the help of a large army to accomplish such a thing. Unless she or Bai Zeman possessed infinite stamina or were monstrous enough to be able to fight off millions of enemies or the ability to somehow evade them, they could only go one step at a time. Because they were weak. From the point of view of the other survivors and soul evolvers, Bai Zeman and Shang Guanbing Shui were the representation of gods in person. Only they knew that in reality, neither of them had the ability to find their loved ones even though their hearts were squirming with anxiety during the nights, let alone being the in-person representation of gods. Even if sometime in the future we manage to defeat the wild beasts and mutant plants or find some way to suppress them so that they stop attacking mankind. Even if we become strong enough to regain the peace of our lives. Who can guarantee us that this will be the first and last time something that shakes our lives and the lives of those we love will happen? Bai Zeman looked at Shang Guanbing Shui with an extremely serious expression and a tinge of hatred flickered in his eyes for a moment. Shang Guanbing Shui's expression also changed slightly when she heard this. Indeed. Did they have any certainty that this would end after they managed to regain the peace of Earth? No, they did not. Even if their loved ones survived, with mankind's life expectancy extended to several centuries and even millennia through constant evolution in elevated stages, many things could come to pass in that time. Now do you understand why my highest goal is absolute domination? Not of China, not of Earth, not of this galaxy either, but of the entire universe. Bai Zeman declared with conviction, I will not allow anyone or anything to ever set foot on my head again, let alone allow any entity to have the power to decide who lives or who dies. That will be me. N0V3LTR0VE served as the original host for this chapter's release on NoV3LB1N. Since this unknown entity called Soul Record gave him the ability to become seemingly unstoppably stronger as long as he absorbed the soul power of other living beings, then Bai Zeman was going to do anything to get to the absolute peak. Even if it led him down a desolate and blood-splattered path. So what if they call me a tyrant? So what if they call me a dictator? Bai Zeman sneered, as long as my loved ones and I stay well, the rest of the universe can go to hell. This was the first time Bai Zeman expressed his true feelings to another person. He had not even said this to Lilith yet. However, after everything that happened tonight, Bai Zeman understood the reason why a supreme existence like Lilith had been telling him since day one of this new era that he was an even greater genius than her. Therefore, he felt that even though he was weak, at least he had the qualifications to not be ashamed to aim big. He would help Lilith achieve her goal and then, together with her and those close to him, he would rule supreme. The god of the Bible whose real name Bai Zeman did not know, Lucifer, Dragon Monarch, Vampire King, Eternal Phoenix, Wolf Emperor, Zombie Ancestor, Star Devourer, these were all the leaders of higher factions known by Lilith to date. Ultimate beings who stood at the apex of the apex and whom even Lilith did not dare to face. However, Bai Zeman vowed to himself to overcome them all either by hook or by crook. Seeing that Shang Guanbing Shui was no longer looking at him as if she were looking at a madman, Bai Zeman realized that she finally understood that rather than madness, the reason behind this great goal was actually very simple. It was not about power blindness. Nor was it about greed or arrogance. It was something far simpler than this. Shang Guanbing Shui realized that Bai Zeman was scared. Although he looked ever so steady and his steps never faltered even when his life was on the line, he was actually terribly scared, scared like a small child. However, that fear did not come from fearing death. Bai Zeman's fear was a much more noble fear. He feared that his loved ones whose life or death was still unknown would have to go through hardship again sometime in the future. In the midst of the darkness, she looked at him silently, as if she wanted to engrave every detail of his face in her memory forever. After several seconds, her lips curved into what shaped the most beautiful smile she ever had probably in her entire life. Bai Zeman, I must say that every second that passes and every word that comes out of your mouth amazes me more and more. More than your strength and more than your speed of evolution, your feelings are as pure as the whitest snow. Shang Guanbing Shui looked at him from the tips of his toes to the tips of his hair before saying in a voice that seemed to come from deep in her heart, I said earlier that you were a good man, but I must retract that. The word good does not do honor to an excellent man like you. Bai Zeman looked at her. He understood. He understood that this praise from her was different from the previous one. I must say that the woman who ever manages to slip into your heart and win your care and affection will undoubtedly be the luckiest of all. She nodded with a faint smile. Then, she extended her perfect hand forward and offered, even though I am weak, let me help you achieve your goal. For the sake of our families, for the sake of our loved ones. Over all life, we will dominate. He looked at her hand that even in the midst of the darkness seemed to shine with purity and understood that taking her hand at this moment would have a meaning far, far deeper than any other promise he had ever made. Bai Zeman still did not know if in the future Lilith would remain by his side once he helped her achieve her wish. He hoped with all his heart that she would. However, what Shang Guanbing Shui was offering was to be battle peers for as long as one of them needed to finally become the total supreme existence, a paragonless being. A goal of such magnitude could take hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands of years. Therefore, this could be considered another long-term contract. Bai Zeman chuckled as he recalled that meeting where he had told everyone that he had a long-term agreement with a woman. A/N, ch 139. Then, without hesitation, he took Shang Guanbing Shui's hand and gently shook it to state his agreement. She smiled even more brightly and her blue eyes curved into a half-moon shape. High in the sky, two beautiful ruby-colored eyes sparkled like gems amidst the night and seemed to pierce through space to see what was happening a kilometer deep underground. A smile countless times more beautiful than Shang Guanbing Shui's smile appeared on Lilith's face as she observed and listened to the interaction between the two lower existences that were just at the first stage of evolution of the vast universe. Red, white, black. She muttered in a low voice and then faded away. Her voice still echoed in the midst of space, I wonder what kind of beautiful painting will be born with these three colors as the main focus. Will this canvas be large enough or will a larger one be needed? Hehe, I can't wait for. After leaving the depths of the crater alongside Shang Guanbing Shui, Bai Zeman encountered nearly 1,000 humans. Among these humans, most of them were men carrying firearms such as light machine guns, assault rifles, pistols, even some country shotguns that were found in the various villages surrounding the area. The minority were all soul evolvers. At this point, Each of these brave fighters who risked their lives every second to fight beasts, zombies, and plants in fierce hand-to-hand confrontations looked at Bai Zeman with eyes brimming with reverence. In fact, seeing the heat in the eyes of all of them, Bai Zeman estimated that were it not for the military rules that had been slowly imparted on each man, they would all be shouting his name out loud. Pretty normal if you ask me. Shang Guanbing Shui whispered beside him. The power and ability you showed them tonight go far beyond what the human mind can comprehend. At this point, I wouldn't be surprised if each and every one of them is willing to throw their lives away for you and your cause. It could be said that your goal in some way or another has been achieved, I guess. Bai Zeman did not reply. In fact, what he was looking for was people who were willing to fight bravely and who were willing to lay down their lives for the sake of him. Was Bai Zeman selfish? He probably was. But that was the way things were and it would probably continue this way for a long time. Bai Zeman took a step forward and casually scanned the faces of each man in front of him before he began to speak slowly. As many of you probably know, my name is Bai Zeman and I am the leader of this base as well as the leader of a second base to which we will be joining soon. A large portion of you have probably never seen me in your lives before tonight as many of you are still new recruits. However, let me tell you that regardless of the difference in status, in my eyes you are all brave warriors. Warriors who fight with their lives on the line every day and regardless of the reasons each of you may have for doing it, the truth is that whether you want to or not, you are also helping countless humans and thus making a small beacon of guiding light in the midst of so much darkness and death. Therefore, let me tell you all with confidence that each one of all of you present and each one of our fallen comrades were, are, and always will be heroes in my eyes. Upon hearing Bai Zeman's speech, many men's eyes turned red and tears threatened to fall at any moment. Even many hot-blooded men who had already forgotten when they had last shed tears were deeply moved that the highest leader of the entire base, the king of them all, not only valued their efforts but also abandoned the safety that rightfully belonged to someone of his status to fight on the front lines. Tonight, due to the attack of these disgusting vile beasts, many have died. Bai Zeman continued in an extremely serious voice and everyone listened intently, regardless of whether we knew them or not, regardless of whether we were close to them or not, they were all our brothers in arms and will continue to be this way for all eternity regardless of how far we go in the future. Therefore, as a sign of respect to those who fell tonight, I would like everyone to keep total silence for 1 minute from the moment my voice stops. And so, silence reigned over the battlefield. The blood vortex was still whirling, slowly consuming Bai Zeman's mana. The blood chains reinforced by the vortex still clung tightly to all the mutated creatures without allowing them to get up from the ground, and the beasts seemed to be too frightened to even growl. With the clouds now clear and the storm moving further and further away from the area, the only sound present was that of the wind coming from the forest 5 kilometers into the distance. Many men could stand it no longer and tears began to fall down their faces. There were many of them who tonight had lost friends, siblings, sons, nephews, nieces, grandchildren, grandparents, lovers, etc. Regardless if Bai Zeman felt sad or not for the loss of these people and for the deaths of these soldiers, the truth was that he believed from the bottom of his heart that these people deserved at least a minimal token of respect like this. A minute later, the tears gradually stopped and Bai Zeman turned to look at the over 2,500 mutant beasts that were held prisoner by the blood of other beasts and of those who had fallen in combat to defend the position of mankind behind their backs. Tonight, let us use the blood of these vile beasts to take vengeance for the fallen ones. Let us use their blood to grow, to evolve, to become powerful enough to never let such things happen again. His voice echoed far and wide like a thunderclap. Under everyone's gaze, he pointed his sword forward and bellowed, "All soul evolvers, get your weapons in charge. No need to fear. No need to hold back. Just kill as much as you can." For a brief second, no one moved. However, one of the soul evolvers at the front who had lost his father in the mouth of a mutated beast finally shouted out loud to the point where his voice rasped before dashing forward at the highest speed his agility stat allowed him. As if a dam had broken, dozens began to run, those dozens added up to form 100, and that 100 grew to become over 250 soul evolvers among whom 80% were men and 20% were brave women unwilling to decay behind the walls of the base or leave the 100% of their fates in the hands of others. The sharp flashes of swords, the explosions caused by heavy bones, the fierce stab of a spear made of bone, and so on. The moonlight illuminated the weapons in the hands of each soul evolver and highlighted with its silver rays the rage-filled, bloodthirsty attacks of these people. Evangeline, Yan Tu, Nangong Lingzhen, and Lu Yan were not far behind either. The four charged forward and began their own massacres with Yan Tu and Evangeline charging straight at the first order beasts to claim what was rightfully theirs. Even Kong Lan, who had received the 2 healings allowed by Wang Jian's lesser healing skill, the second healer Bai Zeman found after Kong Lan. While Wang Jian's healings were still considerably lower than Kong Lan's healings even though they both used the same skill, it was more than enough for at least her fingers to stop hurting so much. It would probably take another 2 or 3 days for her to fully heal if she healed herself. After all, Kong Lan's health stat was not monstrously high like Bai Zeman's health. That was a good speech. Shang Guanbing Shui commented. She was the only one who hadn't dashed over to join the massacre. After all, she was already at level 46, so the soul power that this kind of enemy would grant her would not make any difference to her strength unless she was willing to spend months and even years killing low-level beings to grow. As for additional stats, first-order beasts could give her quite a few points, but Shang Guanbing Shui would not steal other people's prey, so in the end, she decided to stand beside Bai Zeman. But I wonder if you really felt like you said. She smiled slightly and looked at him. Bai Zeman watched as the blood of the beast spattered the ground in large quantities and listened as the rage-filled roars of the monsters rumbled the earth. He was sure that even from the forest 5 kilometers away the shrieks could be heard and inwardly wondered if some mighty beast would come out of there. Without looking at the woman next to him, Bai Zeman lazily replied, "Even though I was only a student from a middle-class working family in the past, I learned a thing or two simply by watching those people who were in high positions of power whenever they appeared at press conferences." "You learned how to lie?" she asked with ridicule in her voice. Anything dealing with politics of the past was not something she particularly liked. "N.A." Bai Zeman replied indifferently and pointed with glittering eyes, "I learned to put on an act." When a person held high office, they often could not simply say what they wanted and instead, to avoid controversy, had to say what the masses wanted to hear. In that way, Not only could hundreds of big problems be avoided but also the support and appreciation of others, as well as the loyalty of the people, could be obtained. It may be despicable. But to be a leader you not only need strength, you also need to know how to understand the needs of others. He concluded. Shang Guanbing Shui looked at him for a moment before turning her attention to the battlefield where the beasts were being slaughtered like pigs on New Year's Eve. She did not comment on what Bai Zimin had just said as although it was despicable as he had pointed out, she was actually aware that his words were very real and true. Approximately 30 minutes later, the roars of the beasts had been silenced in their entirety. After 30 minutes of working as a team, the little more than 250 soul evolvers managed to end the lives of the 2500 plus beasts without the support of firearms, so they were not only able to vent a great deal of the anger and pain they were feeling but they were also able to absorb large amounts of soul power. Bai Zimin approached Liu Yan and instructed, "Tell your daughter to take charge of moving several squads to carry the bodies of these beasts back to the military area. If she needs more people, she is allowed to use meat in exchange for offering work to other survivors who do not yet have jobs but want one. Also, take care to reinforce the defense of this area enough to handle an attack of 1,000 beasts in case any of them dare to come back for more." After giving a series of orders, Bai Zimin left the front lines and returned to his mansion in the privileged area along with Evangeline and the rest. While there was some minor possibility of some forest beast charging towards the base, with his current speed he could reach the front lines in a matter of seconds, so he wasn't too worried. Aside from Kong Lan and Evangeline, there were many other soul evolvers and soldiers who had been wounded in today's war. A small group of experienced medical personnel and a larger group of people hired to apply first aid began to treat the wounds of those who could be helped using the gauze, disinfectants and many other valuable supplies available at the base. By being willing to use this kind of precious resource on them, Bai Zimin unwittingly gained even more reliance and faith from his subordinates. Many of them were now willing to jump into a river of fiery lava for such a leader. In the end, after taking a hot shower, Bai Zimin fell onto his bed and a minute later fell into a deep sleep like a trunk. Even when Lilith lay down beside him and looked at him with shining eyes, he did not wake up at all due to mental and physical exhaustion. Because he had not slept for a total of almost 48 hours, Bai Zimin was especially tired. While the lack of sleep for almost 2 days had taken its toll on his body and psyche, Bai Zimin's true exhaustion came in essence from all the things that had happened in the span of 5 or 6 hours from the time he had decided to go hunting in the mutant forest near the North Camp base to train with his newest skill called gravity manipulation. In the end, that night of training and light hunting ended up turning into a night in which his life was in danger more than once. Not only did he have to suppress his power to the minimum possible to prevent the second-order beasts from suddenly charging at him to kill them, but he also had to survive his own devastating attack. Bai Zimin was sure before going to sleep that he was probably one of the few beings since the history of the creation of the universe who had managed to kill 2 second-order existences with a single attack even while he was still in the first order and seriously injuring another. But this was he underestimating himself again. If Bai Zimin were to ask Lilith, she would undoubtedly shout at him, "Idiot! You think everyone can do something as crazy as increasing the power of a devastating attack by basically 15 times? In fact, he was the first one to manage to do something so crazy. It was precisely for this reason that, despite being aware of the fact that Bai Zimin had not done all the work by himself, the soul record granted him a unique characteristic title under the name of Irregular. In the end, Bai Zimin ended up sleeping peacefully as noon passed and evening came. When his dark eyes opened slowly, the first thing that came into his vision was the rays of sunlight struggling to penetrate the curtains of the large window. Bai Zimin sat up on his bed still somewhat dazed and unconsciously glanced at the digital clock on the small bedside table. 14:23. He mumbled at the same time as he thought on his mother. She would definitely scold me if she knew I was sleeping until this late. A slightly grumpy voice sounded next to him. I wonder what woman can make you reveal such a loving look like that? Are you not satisfied with me? The corner of Bai Zimin's mouth twitched several times at the sound of that seductive voice and he slowly glanced at the spot beside his side of the bed. Not to his surprise, the gorgeous and seductive Lilith was lying on her back. She was wearing her classic dress and her covered assets were pointing towards the skies like 2 intercontinental missiles about to kill people. As she looked at him with her 2 beautiful ruby eyes, she smiled sweetly and said in a shy voice, "Big brother Bai, you were so wild last night." "Sorry." Bai Zimin looked at her dumbfounded. Lilith blinked and her long eyelashes were like 2 beautiful fans covering her eyes. Then, seemingly pained, she whispered, "Could it be? Could it be that you don't remember?" Bai Zimin felt that it was better not to ask anything and that his best option at this moment was probably to leave from this place. However, as always, curiosity was the cat's undoing. "What exactly should I presumably need to remember?" he asked as he leaned back and eyed her warily. Lilith's eyes filled with tears, shocking Bai Zimin greatly. She sobbed and held a hand to her heart before saying with a pain-filled expression, "Be bad, so bad. Big brother Bai, you are so bad. Even though you jumped on me and tore my dress before." "Nonsense!" Bai Zimin roared. He leaped out of the bed and pointed towards her as he said, "Your dress is intact, and even if I wanted to do something like that I definitely wouldn't have the strength. Who are you trying to fool?" Forget about second order, Bai Zimin was sure that even if he fought against the 8 leaders of higher factions at the same time and ended up exhausted to death he would definitely not forget the moment when his not so precious but at the same time precious virginity was lost. Lilith indirectly looked at her dress and was silent for a few seconds. Finally, after realizing her little slip, she clicked her tongue and the fake tears disappeared without a trace. "Hey, stop clicking your tongue." After the above little event, Bai Zimin washed his face and brushed his teeth before returning to the bedroom. At this moment, he and Lilith were sitting facing each other. They both looked to the other in silence for several seconds before he finally extended his right hand forward. Lilith took his hand between hers. Right, she used both hands to wrap around his instead of using one as she had always used in the past. Although Bai Zimin found it odd, he didn't think too much of the small gesture and simply closed his eyes as he began to scroll through his records. Last night while taking a shower he tried to see his possible paths of future evolution but was surprised when he found nothing. At that moment he got terribly scared thinking that some kind of bug just like in video games was happening to him. In the reality there were no GMs. Well, maybe the soul record was the GM, but the problem here was that there was no email address to file complaints. Fortunately, Lilith calmed him down at that moment just before he had a heart attack. She said that the soul record was probably still searching for possible paths for Bai Zemin's evolution, and the reason it was taking so long was because the records engraved into his soul were too amazing compared to his low-quality soul power. Regardless of how powerful Bai Zemin was, he was still a mere first-order existence that had just reached the threshold of breaking through. Therefore, his soul power was naturally not of a particularly high quality even if it was exceptional among those of his power stage. After a few moments, Bai Zemin let out a huge sigh of relief as he found some things that were previously not there in his soul. Then, he focused his attention on those particular messages and the information flowed through him, being then shown to Lilith by his will. Your possible paths of evolution have been studied and confirmed. With the achievements and the records you have earned until now, a path you can take is now seen. Please select a job. A befitting trial will be given to you. 1. Strategist of Death. 2. Tenacious Hammer. 3. Shadow Dancer. 4. Heavy Guardian. 5. Blood Mystic. This chapter was originally shared via a novel by J.N. After so much effort, after working so hard and defeating countless monsters among which many of them were terribly powerful creatures, the results finally came out and were scrolled before his eyes in the form of a status window just like in the video games of the past. Even though I acquired my first job around 1 month ago at most, somehow I feel like it's been a long time. Bai Zemin sighed and opened his eyes. Well, a lot of things happened since then. Lilith involuntarily let out a sigh as well. Even for someone like her, who had already seen most of the things that the cosmos could present, she felt that her life became much more lively since she arrived on this planet and began her long journey along with Bai Zemin. Things will only get more and more interesting from this point on. She chuckled and said words that somehow Bai Zemin felt were an evil omen just like in the movies. Don't sing bad omens. He growled under his breath, I would prefer that everything be calmer and that the seas stop raising waves in my direction. If that happens then I'm afraid that to achieve your goals your life could fall short. She pointed out with a smile. Bai Zemin found himself unable to reply to her statement so he could only snort like a small child who was beaten at his favorite game. Even so. I must say I'm surprised that even on your second breakthrough mission you still have so many options to choose from. Lilith said in wonder as her eyes flicked back and forth, seemingly rereading the viable options on Bai Zemin's shoulders again. Is that so surprising? He asked without much emotion in his voice. To him, this thing that was happening to him was just normal since he had no one to compare it with. Lilith looked at him and said a little speechless, Little brother Zemin, every time you advance one order and break through to the next stage, the soul record calculates each and every record you have experienced throughout your entire existence. Those records are studied by the soul record, and then you are given a path to continue walking. Do you understand any of what I am saying? Bai Zemin nodded. Basically, the barrier that separates each order and prevents us from continuing to level up is the end of a path. The soul record would be the creator of a new path and for that, it shows us new possibilities to us, soul evolvers. After proving ourselves worthy to continue, that possibility will open a path by which we can go beyond that barrier that blocks us. As expected of someone capable of receiving the option to be a strategist of death. She snapped her fingers and joked. Then, with a serious expression, she continued, so, it's strange that there are so many junctions since basically your future should have been decided when you set foot on your first path, which in this case your first path would be your first class blood berserker. Bai Zemin felt that he understood everything but at the same time, he felt that he needed a bit of time to understand the depths implied by her words. If it were before, he might have thought it was all easy to understand. But the more he knew about the soul record, the more he realized that thinking that way would only bring more harm than good in the future. So, which one do you think I should choose? As always, he asked Lilith's opinion even though in his heart the answer was already clear. Strategist of Death is probably a job that was born from the wide variety of existences you have killed in such a short time and from your intelligence to devise and mix skills to launch attacks of extremely high magnitudes. This job is also possibly the easiest to get out of the 5 options presented to you on this occasion. She carefully analyzed and calmly explained. I see. Okay, pass. He nodded and looked at her hoping to be enlightened. He didn't even take into account this job to begin with as it somehow made him feel like a subordinate of death. If death really existed in the first place. Tenacious Hammer seems to be somehow or other related to blacksmithing. It's probably because in your first forging try since the appearance of the soul record on Earth you forced yourself to work practically without rest for 7 days straight and even after many failures you persevered regardless of your low-quality tools. I think you could definitely get something good out of it if you choose this job. Passed but failed. Okay, let's move to the next one. Bai Zemin rejected even the second option despite having to consider it more than a few times. Regarding the matter of blacksmithing, he was naturally interested since if he ever managed to become a godly blacksmith of some kind, his strength would definitely be terrifying thanks to the quality of equipment he would be able to forge. However, that would be a long-term investment. Right now, choosing the second option would cause Bai Zemin to lose his momentum as far as battle was concerned. Furthermore, the smithy was not at all suited to the path of absolute domination and suppression to which he aspired and which he had already begun to walk step by step. Hearing Bai Zemin's words and feeling the somewhat painful negative in his voice, Lilith understood what he was thinking. Don't worry. Even if in the end you can't choose a great blacksmith class, you can still choose a subclass related to blacksmithing if you are lucky. She gently patted his shoulder and nodded towards him. What? Bai Zemin somewhat overlooked her effort to lift his slightly flagging mood and asked with wide eyes, we can choose subclasses. Yes. Lilith tilted her head. Then, as if realizing something, she lightly slapped her forehead and muttered, right. You're still in the first order. Excuse me. He looked at her dumbfounded. For a few seconds, Lilith and Bai Zemin both looked at each other with wide eyes. It was as if their minds had gone blank for a brief moment, and if there was a third party next to them, they would probably laugh at how comical they looked at that moment. Cough. So. Can you explain a little bit what's going on here, Lilypedia? Bai Zemin cleared his throat and leaned his upper body to approach her and looked at her very seriously straight in the eyes. At first, Lilith was a little intimidated by his sudden move to approach her. But just when she felt that she might blush at any moment, the way Bai Zimin addressed her made her unable to help but laugh internally. Hey, you little brat. Who are you calling Lilypedia? She joked. N0V3LTR0VE served as the original host for this chapter's release on NoV3LB1N. Brat. Bai Zimin returned to his original position and folded his arms as he said with a suggestive smile, I don't remember who it was that got a lesson from this brat the other night in bed. Besides, didn't you just call me big brother a few minutes ago? Come on, little sister Lilith, call me big brother like you love to do and maybe I'll give you your favorite lollipop. This time, Lilith really couldn't stop a very slight blush from appearing on her tender cheeks. This surprised Bai Zimin greatly and the smile on his face grew enormously. Even if he died this instant he could at least die smiling. Because for the first time, he had somehow defeated this naughty little succubus in a verbal game. Aha! Now do you understand my difficulties? Bai Zimin was practically screaming and jumping for joy inside. However, after thinking it over, he realized that something was wrong. Lilith shouldn't blush so easily, right? After all, she was a succubus and for better or worse had lived for about a century. Bai Zimin was infinitely sure that she must have experienced far more suggestive and direct words than what he had just said. Of course, a virgin like Bai Zimin who had practically no experience about women or how ladies' hearts worked could never understand that to get such reactions out of a girl depended on who the other person was, otherwise all it would generate would be disgust, discomfort, and awkwardness. Little brother Zimin, you're getting more and more naughty all the time. Lilith tried her best to calm down and then said with a face filled with arrogance, you want me to call you big brother? Dream on. Since I am older than you, naturally you should call me big sister. But well, if you want to be the bigger one so badly, then you'll have to beat me in combat. Oh, just so you know, I'm not talking about a sword battle. The previous thoughts flew out the window as he heard the woman's challenge in front of him. He didn't back down and said confidently, you think you can beat me? Do you even know how high my stamina is right now? It's close to 1000 points. I know your stats must be monstrously higher than that right now, but try comparing that to your stats when you were level 50. What? You already have a stat close to 1000 points. Lilith couldn't help but raise her voice and her eyes widened in shock as she looked at him as if she was looking at an alien. Humph. Bai Zimin didn't respond and after snorting he flashed his status window at her. Lilith gasped and her heart trembled as she saw the numbers scrolling in her retina. Unconsciously, she muttered, even though I knew you were strong and had been accumulating a lot of stats. I didn't expect you to be at this level already. Now you see. He looked like the Emperor of the Heavens as he looked down at her and said, it's only a matter of time before I surpass you in every physical aspect, and by that time. Humph. Just wait and see what's good for you. However, Lilith was no longer listening to him. Her surprise at seeing Bai Zimin's stats could not be described in mere words. He might not be aware of how the soul record worked, but Lilith had spent a large part of her life studying this strange entity and gathering information. Bai Zimin's current status window and his crazy stats were something that even someone like her could not ignore even though compared to her stats it was effectively not worth mentioning. However, Lilith said nothing. She wanted him to figure things out slowly and gradually by himself instead of her being the one to take away all the surprises. In the end, she licked her lips and looked at Bai Zimin's crotch as she said softly, maybe it's not so bad to call you big brother in the future. Bai Zimin nodded pleased with himself and ignoring the slight embarrassment he felt inside, he decided to return to the main topic, so, little minx. Can you continue with the analysis? While Bai Zimin enjoyed these moments very much and if it were up to him he could very well spend the whole day chatting with Lilith and joking with each other, the truth was that such a thing was not possible at present. It was already past 1440 and there was a lot of work to be done and a lot of things to finish that needed his intervention in some way or another. Right. Lilith nodded and said calmly, we can talk about this important matter in the future. For now, let's focus on choosing the best path for you. That way you can give me a good battle in the sheets when the time comes. The corner of Bai Zimin's mouth twitched a little and he wanted to say something but in the end decided not to pursue the matter further. Sometimes it was hard for him to understand when Lilith was joking or when she was being serious. So, let's continue. First let me finish with your class and then we can talk about the whole subclass matter. She muttered before taking a second look at Bai Zimin's third choice and commenting, Shadow Dancer. This class could lead you down a really interesting path. Although I'm not 100% sure, I could swear that this class is a mix between your physical combat abilities, your invisibility skill, and your shadow blink skill. I think if you go this route you could become a rarely seen lethal killer. Even the higher existences should be wary of you when you reach your fourth order if you continue at this pace and choose to walk this path. Shadow Dancer. Bai Zimin muttered and a slight struggle could be seen in his eyes. In fact, somehow he could feel that if he chose this third option as his second job to advance to second order he would most likely not regret it in the future. Bai Zimin believed that it would lead him to become a truly mighty existence with the power to speak throughout the universe in the future. However, he still felt that something was missing. Because even though Shadow Dancer sounded extremely tempting and seemed to be terrifyingly powerful, Bai Zimin realized that he did not aspire to be one of the strongest and his ultimate goal was not as simple as having universe-wide speech power. Let's move on to the next one. He shook his head and sighed. Somehow I was already expecting this. Lilith chuckled and pointed out, at the end of the day, your ultimate goal isn't to be one of the strongest, it's to be the strongest. What you seek is not to have the power of speech, but for your speech to be the power. Isn't it? Bai Zimin forced a smile into his heart upon hearing this and nodded, so you heard that too. Of course I did. Lilith smiled tenderly and said with slight shyness, I've always been watching you. Bai Zimin felt his heart begin to beat faster and irregularly for a brief second but long before he could comprehend anything or study that small movement, it all disappeared as if something had forcibly blocked it. Without waiting for any response from him or any question, Lilith looked at the fourth option and her eyes briefly twitched. After a moment of consideration, she looked at Bai Zimin and remarked, I think this fourth option is pretty clear but I'll say it anyway. I'm sure this job called Heavy Warrior is somehow related to your skill gravity manipulation and the combat style in which you use it. You will probably get tremendously devastating attacks in the future if you decide to walk across this path. But I don't recommend you choose it. I was also thinking something similar to what you just said. Bai Zimin nodded with a frown. Choosing an option this time ended up being much more difficult than when he reached the limit of an unclassified existence and was aiming to become a first-order existence. Each of the options presented to him this time had many advantages, and there were some of them that Bai Zimin could not overlook, which caused his previous decision to waver for a brief moment. I'm afraid my magic power will fall behind in the future if I choose this option. Indeed. Lilith nodded seriously. Except for magic warriors, every kind of warrior in existence sooner or later must give up magic for some reason or another. So far, you have mainly used your gravity manipulation skill to perform powerful physical attacks, but there have been few occasions when this magical skill was used to suppress enemies. This in itself is an indication that sooner or later you will have to let go of magic if you decide to walk on this path. You may as well pass to the next one as well. The reason why Bai Zimin had not used gravity manipulation to suppress was because up until now, all he had done was slaughter mercilessly. He never thought of leaving an enemy alive. However, such a thing would not stay that way forever, and Bai Zimin was aware that abandoning magical power would most likely turn into a great regret in the future. As if to confirm her suspicions, Lilith pointed out, if you ask me, the heavy warrior option will probably be the option that will give you the most immediate and short-term power. I'm pretty sure that when you acquire this class, a third-order existence will only be able to kneel before you or die obediently. However, in the long run, I fear you might lose a lot of that great early momentum. Pass. Bai Zimin took a deep breath and closed his eyes as he said with slight pain in his heart. Even if the power that the heavy warrior class gave him was high, Bai Zimin knew from his own experience that large short-term gains were not good. In the past, he had seen many people sink for temporary happiness. Hearing Bai Zimin's rejection even in the midst of such a powerful hesitation, Lilith's fluttering heart calmed down and she unconsciously let out a sigh of relief before inaudibly saying, good thing you didn't choose that option. Sorry. Bai Zimin looked at her and asked, I didn't hear you. Can you repeat that? I said I'm glad you weren't driven by greed and power. Lilith smiled and a tinge of sadness glittered in her eyes for a wink that was gone fast enough that even Bai Zimin didn't notice it even though he was looking at her from such a close distance. So far you've passed on the first 4 options, haven't you? Lilith asked to make sure while keeping her eyes on him and studying every change of expression on his face. Bai Zimin hesitated for a long time before nodding. His eyes moved erratically as he scanned the second, third, and fourth options over and over again. These 3 had attracted his attention greatly. Especially Heavy Warrior. Even if he knew it probably wouldn't be the optimal, something inside him told him that it would probably suit better to his vicious battle style where he sought to destroy and crush his enemies in the shortest amount of time possible with overwhelming power. It was extremely difficult for him to stick to his initial idea of choice. He would be lying if he said that he was not tempted to choose another job for his second order. If I could just pick and choose several jobs at the same time. How good would that be? He sighed and let himself fall onto his back. His body shivered gently from the bed springs of the mattress and his gaze focused on the luxurious chandelier in the center of the room hanging from the white ceiling. Pfft. Lilith almost laughed when she heard his muttering and couldn't help but look at him dumbfounded as she said with a big smile, if such a thing were possible, then probably the universe would have already been destroyed by some extraordinary monster before you or I were born. Besides, do you think it's possible to walk at the same time on 2 completely different paths located in opposite places? At first, Bai Zimin felt that what Lilith said made a lot of sense. After all, existences at the level of the 8 leaders of higher factions or even beings at the level of Lilith herself who possessed at least one firmament fragment already possessed the power to annihilate an entire world, so if they could choose several jobs for each order they advanced everything would probably be destroyed in a careless move. But after hearing her last words, he couldn't help but smile bitterly. Of course, walking 2 opposite paths at the same time was impossible. How was anyone supposed to do such a thing? In the end, he sat back down cross-legged and calmly said, all right, let's continue. That's the spirit I like to see in you. Lilith nodded with a satisfied expression. Since you rejected the previous options, then something inside you must be guiding you to the only one still viable. Isn't it? He didn't respond with words and simply nodded. Since your instinct is telling you to do something, then just do it without hesitation, Lilith advised with a smile that an older sister gives her little brother as she guides him through life. Besides, since you are willing to let go of such powerful jobs, it can only mean that somehow or other you firmly believe that the option you have in mind is not only the right one for you but will also be the one that will lead you to victory. Right. Bai Zimin took a deep breath and nodded with a serious expression, yet. Blood mystic, hey. Lilith whispered softly with a slight frown as she looked at the 5th and final option available to Bai Zimin. The word mystic is related to mysticism. The default definition of a mystic person is one who aspires to achieve or who believes to have experienced the union or contact of the soul with divinity. I must say that's a pretty interesting name for a job aimed at an existence that wishes to advance to the second order. I know nothing of other worlds but here on Earth, mystics are beings with great magical powers and whose skills have always been mysterious. Bai Zimin pointed and said gravely, besides, since this 5th option has the word blood in it, I can get some idea of what awaits me. I am at least 70% sure that even if this job is not exceptionally powerful, it will be the one that will lead me to where I want to go. Each choice of job before advancing to the next order meant a new path. All these paths linked to each other to guide an existence to a certain point, and a divergence from the main path would cause that destination to change completely. For example, if Bai Zimin were to choose another job instead of Blood Berserker back then, the advancement options he would receive this time would be very different from the ones he received because the path he would have walked on would have been completely different from the one he had walked on up to this point. A single change, a small slip or oversight, and everything would change in its entirety. Lilith nodded with a smile brimming with pride and said in a complicated voice, you have matured a lot, Bai Zimin. Bai Zimin gently closed his eyes and a faint smile grew on his face as he said softly, I wonder about that. Back then, during the early days of the apocalypse, while Bai Zimin's choices were mostly calculated with a clear head and always based on what he believed was for the best, there were many times when he went crazy and his decisions were affected. The fact that he didn't get carried away in this moment and didn't choose the option that would give him the most power showed how much his character had grown over the course of 47 to 48 days. Lilith was naturally proud as she was well aware that she had played what was probably the most important role in such a growth stage. I hope we can teach each other for a lot of time more. He opened his eyes after remembering the not-so-distant but strangely remote past and smiled. Lilith's eyes glittered unnaturally when she heard this and she nodded with a beautiful smile, of course. There are many things I want to teach you, many things I want you to teach me, many things I would still like to live. You may not know it but let me tell you that you are currently one of the only 2 people I consider a true friend. Bai Zimin chuckled and said in an understanding voice, well, I think you already know this but I'll say it anyway. You are my first friend, one of only 2 friends I have, and my trust in you is on the same level as my trust in my family. That other friend is that woman named Shangguan Bingshui, isn't she? Lilith asked with a smile, to which Bai Zimin replied with a nod. Indeed. She is. He replied calmly. Isn't destiny ironic? The person I least thought I'd get along with and who I thought I'd end up killing at some point, but in the end turned out not to be as bad as she seemed. Lilith chuckled and pointed out, many times it's best not to judge a book by its cover. Who knows? Maybe we'll find ourselves in for some pleasant surprises after we see the contents. The irony here is that you and I are 2 very antisocial characters. Bai Zimin laughed out loud, releasing for the first time in a long time the mental tension that filled him every day. Isn't it sad to have only 2 friends? Sad. Lilith shook her head and smiled gently, I don't think so. Quality over quantity. Bai Zimin blinked a couple of times, and after a moment, he nodded, quality over quantity. Bing Shui told me something similar the night before. Just as the 2 were chatting, someone knocked on the door of the room and the 2 immediately fell silent. Bai Zimin, are you still sleeping? A voice came from the other side and Bai Zimin was quick to identify the other party. Bing Shui? I am awake. Do you need anything? He replied calmly and looked at Lilith to indicate to her not to make any sound. Lilith nodded and obediently sat there without any mischief, which relieved Bai Zimin secretly as he somehow expected her not to behave well. Do you mind if I come in? We still need to discuss the matter of last night's loot. Shangguan Bingshui asked from the outside. Her voice was slightly lazy, which indicated that she had probably also just woken up not long ago. Bai Zimin suddenly realized that they still had to study the previous day's loot. However, considering the current situation, it was not good to let Shangguan Bingshui enter the room. After thinking about it for a moment he replied calmly, I'm not properly dressed right now. How about waiting for me downstairs or in your room? I'll be there in like 20 minutes. Outside the room, Shangguan Bingshui was wearing a one-piece dress that reached just below her knees and despite being considerably loose-fitting it could not really cover the delightful curves of her body. Hearing Bai Zimin's reply, she frowned slightly and unconsciously asked, are you sure you're okay? 20 minutes? Why would he take so long to get dressed properly? Bai Zimin's brain flashed with lightning speed and in an instant, he found an answer. I still need to study the records of last night's battle. As you know, I got a lot of stat points and I need to reconfirm my status window and stuff. Outside the room, Shangguan Bingshui nodded and the slight frown on her face disappeared as she said calmly, I see. In that case, I'll wait for you in the living room. All right. Bai Zimin replied from inside. Shangguan Bingshui looked at the door and somehow she felt there was something wrong but couldn't put her finger on what it was. Her feminine instinct told her that things were not as simple as they seemed but she shook her head after a few seconds and left without saying much more. Hearing the light footsteps clearly of a woman walking further and further away, Bai Zimin turned to look at Lilith and said calmly, then, I will choose Blood Mystic as the job for my second order. Okay. Do it and let's see how crazy the evolution requirements are this time. Lilith laughed softly and Bai Zimin rolled his eyes. The matter of the evolution requirements was what was bothering him the most at the moment and to be honest he didn't want to see them. Unfortunately, it was something he couldn't escape so in the end he ended up letting out a big heavy sigh and finally chose the 5th and final option. Blood Mystic. You have chosen as your second advancement job Blood Mystic. The one who uses the power of its enemies against them and the one capable of controlling extremely strong bloodlines and bonds that even death can't break, that is the Blood Mystic. If you can master the skills of the unique job Blood Mystic, your enemies will be your greatest ally and your allies will be your strength. However, to be able to use the power that does not belong to you, you must first prove that you are worthy of going against the universe and its very laws. Unique time mission has been activated. You must complete the following conditions within 1 year from now on. Kill second order existence single-handedly using blood manipulation, 0/2000. Evolves blood manipulation to third order, incomplete. This chapter was originally shared via a novel by J.N. Kill third order existence single-handedly, 0/100. Third order soul stone, 0/10. Get control over China, incomplete. You will not be able to advance to Blood Mystic if you do not complete the unique time mission within the set time limit, and you will be able to choose another job at that time. Oh well, I was already expecting something like this. Bai Zimin nodded with a refreshing voice and calmly stood up. Lilith looked at him with wide eyes and her heart filled with commotion as she observed the absurdly high requirements that Bai Zimin needed to fulfill this time. Seeing how he acted so calm, she asked in a slightly stiff voice. Do you really think that way? Bai Zimin walked to the window and looked out. The sun and rainbow were shining high in the sky, illuminating his handsome face as he said with a big smile, haha, of course I do. For some reason I feel like this is the calm before the storm, Lilith muttered under her breath and unconsciously turned away from Bai Zimin. While he had never been a big fan of video games, Bai Zimin had played his share of them. However, in no RPG he had ever played before did he see or even hear anything as crazy as GMS putting such stupid requirements in there. But, hey. This is reality, everything is reasonable, right? Right. Oh well, at least I don't have to kill a third order in one hit. Bai Zimin thought with a refreshing smile. Fuck your mother. Bai Zimin gritted his teeth in his mind and the more he thought about it the angrier he got. There was absolutely no good point in all this bullshit. Who the hell dares to screw him up like this? The culprit must at least lose some skin or else he won't be able to die happily. Lilith saw that the refreshing smile on his face didn't stay on for too long as his face rotted and he ran towards the balcony while screaming skyward. Shit. You want to kill me? Your grandfather, challenge you to a death fight you little bastard who hides behind a shitty name. And so, the world exploded. The end. Bai Zimin's bellow was filled with fury, but mostly filled with despair. The requirements that the soul record imposed on him this time to allow him to break through the barrier of the first order and advance to the second order were too demanding. No, to even call them demanding was too great an understatement. Bai Zimin could only look at those requirements with the same eyes he would look at a first-order beast while he was still just an unevolved level 0 human. This was not about desperation due to lack of strength, not at all. Bai Zimin was very confident of himself and was sure that even if he ended up exhausted to death he definitely had the power to end the lives of 2,000 second-order enemies. The same was true for third-order existences. Bai Zimin was at least 70% confident that he could defeat third-order beings within the early stages. For example, the current he was confident that somehow in another he could defeat a level 100 enemy. However, he would definitely not be able to defeat a level 151 with his current strength. Therefore, depending on the level of the other party, Bai Zimin was confident that he could manage to fulfill this requirement where he was required to claim the lives of 100 third-order enemies. As for the 10 third-order soul stones, although it was extremely difficult since of those 100 enemies he needed to kill 1/10 of them had to have formed a soul stone or Bai Zimin would be forced to continue killing until he obtained the required amount. Since he had the power to kill third-order beings, then obtaining soul stones from this stage was also not an impossible thing to despair over. The real reason behind Bai Zimin's despair was the number. 2,000 second-order existences? 100 third-order existences? Where the hell am I supposed to get enemies with that magnitude of power? He muttered as he sat on his bed and then pointed out, I've barely encountered 4 second-order beasts and 3 of them were only encountered by sheer luck. The soul record, that little bitch, wants me to kill 2,000 of them? As if it wasn't satisfied with making my life miserable, that little bitch also wants me to kill 100 third-order ones. For God's sake, even if there are any on the actual earth, who knows if they are in China or not? Even in the deepest parts of forested areas, the most that lived there were second-order existences of different levels. As for third order, Bai Zimin had not perceived a being with overwhelming soul power when he went into the heart of the forest, which meant that for at least several thousand kilometers from this forest to the north, there shouldn't be any of them. Otherwise, that third-order creature would most likely not have stood idly by when the previous night Bai Zimin and Shangguan Bingshui caused great chaos within their area. Perfect. Now not only will I not be able to advance to Blood Mystic, but I will also lose a year of time stuck on an impossible mission, and then I will have to choose another job, which will leave me stuck for even longer while I complete that mission. Bai Zimin shook his head and sighed wearily. His earlier shout had attracted the attention of everyone inside the village, and if it wasn't for him appeasing them they might have already broken down his door to see what was going on. The only good thing was that the villa was considerably away from the rest of the houses in the privileged area of the North Camp, and thanks to Bai Zimin not shouting at the top of his lungs, the survivors were not alerted, otherwise it could have been another small headache, something he wanted to avoid as much as possible. Lilith said nothing at Bai Zimin's complaints. She kept silent with a small frown on her beautiful face, and after about 5 minutes her eyes flashed. I think I know what you can do, she said with her clear voice. Bai Zimin's ears twitched softly and his heart was moved when he heard this. At this point, with his mind clouded, he could not think of anything clearly and thus could only rely on the existence he trusted the most at the moment. Seeing that he was paying attention to her, she continued, one of your requirements is to acquire control over China, isn't it? Yet. It probably has something to do with the description of the blood mystic class. Bai Zimin nodded. Since that's the case, then I think you should focus on acquiring control over the country as quickly as possible for now, Lilith said with an extremely serious expression, confusing Bai Zimin slightly. Acquire total control over China in 1 year. Bai Zimin smiled bitterly and shook his head. Lilith, could it be that you forgot? It's been over 1.5 months since the apocalypse broke out on this planet, and in that time I only managed to acquire control over what? 1,000? 2,000 kilometers? I haven't even acquired control over a district yet. How am I supposed to acquire control over this entire Earth in such a short time? Bai Zimin was aiming to sometime acquire control over China, but that was a goal he was aiming to be able to achieve in approximately 2 to 3 years of time. As for 1 year, such a thing never crossed his mind. From his point of view, it was impossible to dominate humans, beasts, and who knows what else in such a short time. That's where you're wrong, Lilith smiled slightly and pointed out, although your requirements are indeed insane, this isn't the first time the soul record is asking an existence to control an area. Oh. Bai Zimin was immediately interested. Look, the soul record is an unknown entity, but one which within the reasonable is quite fair. Let me give you a clear example of this, Lilith pointed out earnestly. While intelligent beings receive 2 stat points every time they level up, unintelligent creatures receive a large amount of stat points when they cross the threshold from an order to the other, since they are naturally unable to decide which stat to enhance. Bai Zimin nodded silently. Indeed, he knew this and had to admit that within reasonable, the soul record was doing a good job whatever its goal was, if it had one to begin with. Lilith continued, over the millennia, many beings have studied the soul record, and after many years, came to the conclusion that this entity for some reason wanted to make a perfect existence. As to what a perfect existence is, no one knows exactly. However, since that is the case, it is also reasonable to assume that the soul record works differently depending on the magnitude of difference between races and the limits imposed by the birth. Seeing Bai Zimin paying attention, she continued, so, for example, given that beasts and humans walk different paths at least until beasts acquire intelligence and humans acquire comparable physical bodies, I believe that the requirement to control China to evolve into blood mystic refers to controlling humanity within Chinese territory. After all, China exists because humanity exists. Bai Zimin's eyes suddenly lit up when he heard this and he slowly stood up. Why did China exist? No. Better said, why did land, air, or sea boundaries exist? It was precisely because mankind marked those boundaries. Without mankind, China would not exist and the earth would be just a huge piece of land bound together. Seeing that he seemed to understand, Lilith smiled slightly and finished, so, I think what the soul record means by acquiring control over China refers specifically to ruling over the humanity of the Chinese territory. While you will have to go all over the country to accomplish this, things are completely different from acquiring control while eliminating beasts, zombies, goblins, and who knows what. A great weight seemed to disappear from Bai Zimin's heart when he heard this. Even if he had to traverse the entire territory of China to achieve this requirement, at least it no longer sounded as impossible as before. Then, as if a little bulb was lit above his head, Bai Zemin's eyes glittered and he said loudly, then I just need to use the power of my irregular title to travel to another world, and if I am a bit lucky, that world will have enough powerful existences for me to kill to my heart's content. Here, Lilith frowned slightly and said a little worried, that irregular title, I think it will be better for you if you don't tell anyone. At least avoid telling it to too many people. Why? He looked at her and the wariness in his heart immediately went up. He didn't think Lilith would say such a warning just out of boredom. Indeed, Lilith's next words confirmed it. The power to open a gate to another world means that that title in a way grants you the power to cut through space and distance to travel across the universe. The power to control space is a rarity far greater than you can imagine, and only a handful of beings have managed to grasp some of this power to build incredibly valuable portals with great difficulty. If it becomes known that such a rare title as yours appeared, you will probably have a great deal of trouble in the future. While Bai Zemin did not have the ability to control where he traveled or where he would be transported to when he activated the power of his irregular title, since time immemorial and in any novel or movie, the control of space was one of the most powerful laws that existed. Therefore, it was not hard for him to imagine how valuable this seemingly ominous title really was. It's okay. I understand. Bai Zemin nodded earnestly. However, the joy in his heart did not fade in the slightest. How could it? Going from despair in which all he could see was darkness to finding a clear path of light toward what seemed to be the goal of achievement had made Bai Zemin's heart jump like crazy. Even if that path was extremely thin and the light that illuminated it extremely dim that it could disappear at any moment before being swallowed by darkness, Bai Zemin was willing to walk it. It wasn't as if he had any other choice anyway. Of course, unless he was willing to waste a year stuck in the First Order for nothing, which was naturally impossible. For someone who wanted to finish everything as quickly as possible, wasting a year's worth of time was absolutely unforgivable. The debut release occurred at NOV3 Albin. Well, let's do it that way then. I'd better get to work, the clock is ticking backwards. Bai Zemin nodded. Just before he walked toward the door to leave, Lilith's voice sounded behind him again. Little brother Zemin, I will be gone for a while. I need to do some business and I also can't disappear forever or I might cause some unnecessary inconvenience. What? Bai Zemin turned around hurriedly, but the only thing that greeted him was a room completely void of life except for his own. Lilith's voice lingered even though she was no longer there. While I'm at it, I'll try to find ways to help you study the actual capacity of that title of yours. Don't miss me too much. See you again soon. The smell of sweet, fresh roses floated silently into the room. The curtains lifted at a gust of wind and that exquisite aroma that Bai Zemin loved so much assaulted him, leaving him standing for a long time unable to react. He didn't know if it was his imagination or not, but somehow he felt someone leave a small kiss on his right cheek. Maybe it was just himself, his brain playing tricks on him. Bai Zemin didn't know. But the one thing he did know was that he suddenly felt a little bit emptier than he already did by default and a confused look appeared on his face. Bai Zemin did not notice when he left his room or when he went downstairs to the main floor of the villa. He also didn't notice how he got to the living room nor did he seem to notice the moment when his body rested comfortably on the expensive leather couch and when his back rested against the back of the couch. No, maybe it wasn't that he didn't notice. Perhaps, he was simply too detached to worry about small and insignificant details. With his mind distracted and his spirit seemingly faint, he simply sat there without saying a word. His current condition was naturally due to the fact that the person with whom he had spent almost every minute and every second of his life from the beginning of this new era had left his side just like that. She simply said I'm leaving, and then she left. It sounded natural, but somehow Bai Zemin felt that things should not be like that. Apart from feeling lost, he couldn't deny that he was also slightly angry and a small frown on his face was the strong proof of this. However, after thinking it over he realized that he had neither the qualifications nor the right to feel angry toward Lilith. After all, he and she were friends but that friendship might not be as strong as he initially thought. At the end of the day, the reason why Lilith was supporting and helping him was to make him strong enough to be of use for whatever her motives were. The small frown on Bai Zemin's face slowly eased gently, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he was overthinking things. Maybe, he trusted her wholeheartedly, but it didn't mean that she trusted him wholeheartedly. In a matter of minutes, Bai Zemin's emotions calmed down completely and Lilith's departure stopped affecting him almost entirely. He didn't realize that his stone heart skill was passively doing its job again. But how could he know? Passive skills worked like that, covertly, becoming part of you. It was because of this powerful third-order skill that Bai Zemin unconsciously overlooked the fact that Lilith had told him minutes before leaving that he was one of the only two living beings she considered as friends. Otherwise, Bai Zemin would have realized that her appreciation of him was in no way inferior to his appreciation of her. Lilith did not realize this fact either. Or maybe, instead of saying that she did not realize it, it would be more accurate to say that she had forgotten the fact that Bai Zemin possessed a passive skill that affected his emotions and thus his thoughts. Because Bai Zemin had acted completely normal and open with her, Lilith gradually forgot about the existence of the stone heart skill, ignoring that a third-order skill was powerful no matter what it was, especially passive skills that acted covertly without anyone noticing them, and even more so a skill that in itself was focused on suppressing the effect that the opposite sex could have on a man. That little slip ended up causing a large part of the closed distance to increase again. Although Bai Zemin still trusted Lilith with all his heart, some of his thought processes had changed slightly. For example, he recalled the reason and basis why he and Lilith met and why they still continued to interact. At the end of the day, regardless of whether the two considered themselves friends, it was undeniable that in one way or another they were both using each other. With his heart now much calmer and with a completely clear mind, Bai Zemin's thought process cleared up in its entirety, and in an instant, he was able to remember and identify what his true and most important objectives were for which he should be moving and striving to achieve. Again, he did not realize that in reality, he was not using Lilith nor was she using him, it was just that they were both supporting each other to help the other. It was a big change of seeing things, which naturally could cause thoughts to change completely along with emotions. When he raised his head for the first time since sitting on the couch, his black eyes immediately met the gaze of two beautiful and charming sky blue eyes. Shang Guanbing Shui was sitting on the couch opposite Bai Zemin's, being separated only by a small glass table placed in the middle. Her bright eyes stared at him, studying his changing expression and trying to understand the reason why he was suddenly acting so peculiarly. Seeing him raise his head to look at her, Shang Guanbing Shui lifted one of her smooth shining legs and with the elegance of a princess crossed it nimbly over the other. Then, she said in a somewhat perplexed voice, "Are you sure you are all right? Earlier you let out a furious shout that could be heard from here clearly, and just now you looked as if your soul had flown away from your body somewhere, but a few minutes later, you regained your composure." In fact, Shang Guanbing Shui somehow felt that the person in front of her suddenly looked colder than before, which confused her greatly. However, she denied these thoughts immediately as they did not make any sense. After all, a few hours ago everything was perfect and she didn't remember having any disagreements with him. About that, Bai Zemin sighed and after a moment's consideration decided to tell part of the truth but not all of it. After all, Shang Guanbing Shui was an incredibly intelligent woman, and he was aware that if he lied to her and she realized, it would be damaging to both of them in the end. Therefore, after taking a second to think, he narrated that he had already reached level 50 and had chosen his next path of evolution. However, the problem was the requirements. 2002nd order and 103rd order. The beautiful woman whose hair was silver and soft as moonshine gasped as she listened to the evolution requirements of the man in front of her. What insanity is this? Now she could understand the reason why Bai Zemin shouted in anger to the four winds and the reason for his strange behavior just now. Anyone would go crazy if they were suddenly required to complete such a task. As if that wasn't enough, the soul record even imposed a time limit on this trial that while they were here ran backwards. You. What kind of monster are you turning into? Even the soul record seems to be trying to slow you down. Shang Guanbing Shui exclaimed in surprise as she looked at him with wide eyes. Bai Zemin forced a smile and shook his head. He knew thanks to Lilith that the soul record wasn't trying to slow him down at all, it was just that this entity was giving him just the right trial for whatever he was to become someday if he managed to reach the end of the path he himself had opened with his own strength. Anyway, as you know now, we need to take over China in less than 365 days as a deadline. Bai Zemin said earnestly. This also means that you will soon be able to have the man who humiliated your mother in the past and abandoned you on his knees before you. Shang Guanbing Shui's eyes shone brightly upon hearing this and her spirits seemed to lift as she sat up straighter. She analyzed aloud, the central government cabinet is located here in Beijing, this means that the chances of that man being in the same city as us is high. If we manage to take over all the districts and bring down the various leaders of the previous government, sooner or later Xian Yuan Wenchen will have to appear whether he likes it or not. Right. Bai Zemin nodded and said lazily, even if not, it's just a fact written in stone that it will happen in less than a year. That's fine with me. She nodded and after a deep breath calmed down, returning to her usual indifferent and calm expression. So, all that aside, I think it will be best for you if we start with the loot so we can get moving as quickly as possible. Yeah. Let's get started. Bai Zemin nodded and looked at the 5 yellow orbs on the table. As we agreed, 3 of these treasures will be for you since I took the epic grade treasure. Okay. Shang Guanbing Shui nodded without too much rejection this time. If she felt a little unfair before because she was aware that in reality, Bai Zemin could also keep everything, she decided to put aside her pride in this case. The difference in strength between the two was already very great and Shang Guanbing Shui was extremely clear that if she let her pride get in the way here then the gap would only grow wider and wider. At this point, a single magic grade treasure was extremely valuable and the amount of stats she would be able to obtain from 3 of them at the same time would undoubtedly be a great boost to her strength, which would help her in defeating more powerful enemies, and thus absorb higher quality soul power, all this not to mention the skills attached to these treasures. This was an endless circle in which the stronger one was, the stronger one would become. Flash. 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 Shang Guanbing Shui and Bai Zemin gently crushed the treasure orbs and lights flashed inside the room. Since the 2 of them were alone as the rest were still sleeping or had gone out to hunt to level up or perform other tasks, he and she were the only beings who could witness the moment when 5 incredibly valuable treasures appeared before them at the same time. A few seconds later, several objects appeared on the glass table. Fortunately and they are all small or otherwise the table would have ended up on the floor and no longer healthy. Shang Guanbing Shui joked, clearly in a good mood. Ring, necklace, bracelet, these were the treasures that had appeared from the 5 magic grade treasure orbs. N0V3LB1N was the first platform to present this chapter. To be precise, 2 rings, 2 necklaces, and 1 bracelet. Bai Zemin and Shang Guanbing Shui looked at each other and as if by prior agreement both took the 2 rings to study them. The ring Bai Zemin took turned out to be one he already had, it was a rejection ring. This was an incredibly powerful treasure and there have been few occasions in which Bai Zemin was forced to use the power of the skill attached to this treasure. After studying hers, Shang Guanbing Shui exchanged with Bai Zemin and showed him the ring she had taken while he passed her the other one. Water animation ring, magic grade treasure when equipped it automatically increases magic by plus 15 and health by plus 15 points. Possesses the power to create a living being from water. The living being has no emotions or feelings, and its only reason to exist is to serve the user. The power of water animation depends on the magical power of the creator and a water source is needed to work. The skill water animation can be used once every 12 hours and has a duration of 30 minutes or until the water creation is destroyed. This was a ring that Bai Zemin did not have. However, even then the only thing that was really useful to him was actually the stats as the attached skill wasn't of much use to him considering his combat methods. I want these 2 rings. Shang Guanbing Shui stated and looked at Bai Zemin wanting to see some sort of reaction from him. However, to Shang Guanbing Shui's surprise, Bai Zemin did not have much reaction. Okay. He nodded calmly and easily put down the rejection ring on the table to indicate that she should take it. Actually, Shang Guanbing Shui really wanted those 2 rings. After all, she did not possess a rejection ring that granted such a powerful defense attack skill, and the water animation ring had given her many ideas to use alongside her second-order ice maker skill. However, if Bai Zemin really wanted one of them or if she noticed some hesitation in his expression that exposed his need for one of these rings, she most likely would have let him have it. But seeing that he didn't seem too interested in any of these two treasures, she felt no regret as she took them for herself and immediately equipped them. Her perfect fingers gained 2 extra decorations, now totaling 4 of them. That leaves 2 necklaces and 1 bracelet. Bai Zimin reminded as he looked at the 3 items on the table and pointed, as per our agreement, you can choose one more, it will regardless of whether it is the best. In reality, Bai Zimin was extremely clear that he was taking the big side in this deal. However, since he had forged equipment for her in the past, he didn't feel bad about it too. Shang Guanbing Shui nodded and carefully scanned the 3 accessory type treasures one by one. Empowering necklace, magic grade treasure increases health, stamina, agility, and strength by plus 15 points when equipped automatically. It has the ability to increase health, stamina, agility, and strength by plus 100 points for a short period of time depending on the user's magic stat, where 100 points are equivalent to 2 minutes of effect. As a side effect, the user will suffer a stat loss of 20% for 6 hours when the boosting effect is over. It has a cooldown time of 24 hours. Binding bracelet, magic grade treasure, increases strength by plus 15 and stamina by plus 15 points. Possesses the ability to bind an enemy to the ground to prevent them from jumping, flying, or teleporting. It also greatly decreases the movement speed of the affected enemy in case of fighting on the ground. The power of the effect depends on the user's magic power and magic stat. It consumes 1 mana point for every 30 seconds it is active, and after deactivating the effect it goes into cooldown for 12 hours. Anti-magic necklace, magic grade treasure, decreases magic stat by -10 and increases strength and agility stats by plus 20. Grants to the user the ability to block a magic attack that exceeds its current strength or block up to 10 magic spells of equal magnitude of power to that of the user, being the amount of lower magic spells that the necklace can block after releasing a powerful anti-magic barrier around the user equal to 100. The anti-magic barrier has a cooldown time of 24 hours after its destruction or disappearance. After studying the remaining 3 treasures, Bai Zimin and Shang Guanbing Shui remained silent for a few minutes. In their heads, they were both trying to imagine different scenarios, possibilities, and ways in which they could apply the power of the treasures before them. As expected of a magic grade treasure, Bai Zimin sighed and shook his head. Although he had already encountered powerful epic grade treasures, the power of magic grade treasures still did not cease to amaze him. Shang Guanbing Shui nodded and said with seriousness in her melodious voice, a single one of these treasures has the capacity to change the outcome of a battle by itself. The real limit lies in the imagination and wit of the one who equipped them. The value of these treasures could not simply be described in words. Were it not for the fact that Bai Zimin and Shang Guanbing Shui could be considered close to each other, and were it not for the fact that they both needed each other for different reasons, there was a high probability that they were both plotting against the other. Human greed was always insatiable. Much less when it came to coveting real power, a power capable of granting the ability to decide who lives or who dies. So? You've made up your mind? Bai Zimin asked calmly and leaned back, resting comfortably. Shang Guanbing Shui frowned her pretty eyebrow slightly and did not answer right away. Instead, she looked at the 3 treasures again and took several minutes to carefully contemplate which one to choose from them. Bai Zimin did not press her to hurry. After all, this was a really important decision that no one would want to mess up. About 5 minutes later, Shang Guanbing Shui finally seemed to have made her decision as she unhesitatingly stretched her small hand forward and picked up a treasure. Are you sure you want that one? Bai Zimin asked with a raised eyebrow as he saw the option she had chosen. I'll take this one. Shang Guanbing Shui nodded and took off the old rare grade treasure necklace she was using before finally equipping the magic grade empowering necklace. That's a choice I didn't expect, to be honest. Bai Zimin gave her a puzzled look. From his point of view, while the empowering necklace bestowed a great impulse of power momentarily, the consequence of losing 20% of all stats for 6 hours was incredibly severe. If one finished a combat and then lost 20% of one's total power and was taken by surprise by an enemy, then it was highly probable that day would mark one's death. Therefore, while it was tempting as the empowering necklace was undoubtedly the one that granted the most amount of explosive power, Bai Zimin believed that a woman like Shang Guanbing Shui who aspired to slowly exhaust her enemies and aspired more for mass control would choose something else different. It's okay, I have my own ideas and reasons. She casually replied and put away the necklace she had just taken off. The real reason she made such a gambled decision was that she really needed that big power boost. The amount of overall strength that the empowering necklace bestowed was precisely what Shang Guanbing Shui was looking for right now. Seeing that she did not say much about the matter but seemed extremely firm in her decision when she looked at him, Bai Zimin did not say much more about it and silently took the other 2 accessories for himself. The first thing Bai Zimin did was to equip the binding bracelet to his left wrist right away, since on his right was the earth bracelet. The next thing he did was to remove the hurricane necklace, exchanging it for the anti-magic necklace. In a matter of seconds, Bai Zimin lost 20 magic points. However, in exchange, he gained 35 strength points, 15 stamina points, and 20 agility points. In addition, the hurricane necklace had the whirlwind skill that Bai Zimin never used except to cast his crimson blood judgment skill, since it was his only source of wind power until now. On the other hand, the skill of the anti-magic necklace was much more useful to him in combat, so it was better for him to wear it at all times. Of course, Bai Zimin was not going to get rid of the hurricane necklace as he would need it when he was forced to use crimson blood judgment again. Bai Zimin looked at the greenish necklace in his hands and thought he better start gathering defensive equipment for the time when he finds his loved ones. As he raised his head and looked at Shang Guanbing Shui, he noticed that she was looking at the necklace in her hands and realized that perhaps she was having the same thoughts as he was. After all, he had no doubt that she did love her mother tremendously. I'll go see Liu Xiaoao. Bai Zimin stood up and announced. Okay. Shang Guanbing Shui also stood up and commented on her plan. I'll go check how things ended yesterday with Fu Suifeng and Nangong Yi. Hearing this, Bai Zimin's eyes flashed coldly. There's no need to leave survivors in case they caught those who caused trouble. Since these people were scum enough to cause trouble inside the base but did not have the courage to come out to fight, then Bai Zimin would not be considerate to them regardless of gender or age. Shang Guanbing Shui frowned slightly and said calmly, wouldn't it be better to just enslave them and force them to work for us? No need. Bai Zimin shook his head and walked towards the exit as he said firmly, I'd rather invest the food we get to pay for other survivors willing to work than waste valuable resources feeding scum who are no longer worthy of even calling themselves human. Remember, I don't care if it's male or female, adult or child, they don't need to live anymore. Shang Guanbing Shui watched his back disappear beyond the corridor and sighed. Since the Lord had spoken, there was little she could do. In fact, if it were someone else who contradicted him they probably would have received a slap in the face. The only reason Bai Zimin took the trouble and time to explain the reasons for his decision was solely and exclusively because she was she. Soon, Shang Guanbing Shui departed as did Bai Zimin and the village was left in the hands of the maidens. None of these maidens were frightened at all as during the last few days they realized how powerful their new lord was. Even without direct protection, the slightest trouble would alert Bai Zimin and in a second he would be able to put out the flames. Sitting in the living room of Liu Yan's mansion, Bai Zimin was dressed in comfortable clothes while casually enjoying a cup of tea that a beautiful middle-aged maiden had served him moments ago. Opposite him, Liu Xiaoyao was wearing a nice professional woman's uniform and was currently finishing some documents. It was obvious from the dark circles under her bloodshot eyes that the young beauty had not had enough sleep the night before when she had to get to work. Seeing that she was not complaining and was working diligently, Bai Zimin nodded secretly and was relieved to leave such an important position like this to the young girl in front of him. It was obvious that Shang Guanbing Shui had not delegated the position of logistics team leader to Liu Xiaoyao casually, but had noticed the young woman's rapid speed of maturity. Approximately 40 minutes later, Liu Xiaoyao finally put down the last document and stacked everything neatly in a folder. Sorry to have kept you waiting, leader. She said in an exhausted voice. Bai Zimin looked at her and shook his head, don't worry. Instead, tell me what you have there. Yes. Liu Xiaoyao nodded and while looking at the summarized document in her hands she started, in last night's battle against the mutant beasts that came out of the forest, over 160,000 rounds of ammunition were consumed. This caused the supply of bullets that was supposed to last for about half a month to plummet, and according to the reports I received from the logistics team, I'm afraid we will barely be able to last another 3 days. Bai Zimin frowned as he heard this. But Liu Xiaoyao was not finished yet. These 3 days will only be possible if the surrounding zombie and beast attacks will not exceed the number of 500 per day. Otherwise, I'm afraid that number will only decrease even more. Continue. He nodded without commenting. In his mind, he was already looking for countermeasures, but he didn't have to think about it too much since the only obvious solution was clear for anyone to see. Yes. Liu Xiaoyao nodded and observed his face for a moment before looking at the papers in her hands again. Last night, Mr. Fu Suifeng and Mr. Nanggong Yi along with a team of approximately 24 soul evolvers killed a total of 34 survivors who were causing chaos while the troop was fighting on the front lines. In addition, 12 more were imprisoned of which 8 of them are children whose age is barely approaching their 15. Saying that, she looked at Bai Zimin to observe his reaction. After all, she knew that he seemed to have a certain weakness for young people. However, Bai Zimin's cold expression did not change at all and he said indifferently, continue. He had already given Shang Guanbing Shui orders. He believed that she would pass his words soon. It was true that the fact that he is an older brother and the memories of his sister when she was still little made Bai Zimin much more lax and kind to the younger ones, however, if they thought that because of that they could go over his head then they were terribly mistaken. Liu Xiaoyao took a deep breath and said nothing. She simply nodded firmly and continued while hardening her heart. Time passed fast, and about 10 minutes after Liu Xiaoyao started her report, Bai Zimin's expression remained unreadable as the last word left her lips. She looked at him and noticed that he seemed to be deep in his own thoughts so she quietly withdrew to file the documents, but not before instructing the maid at the door to serve Bai Zimin with respect and care. After all, the current Liu Xiaoyao was no longer the same as she was a week ago. She had slowly begun to realize how difficult it was to survive in this world and how worthless everyone's life was. However, the maiden did not need Liu Xiaoyao to tell her anything. This woman was well aware of who the person sitting on the couch was. Even if he was young enough to be her son, the difference in status and power was as great as trying to compare pure white clouds with dirty dark-colored mud. Bai Zimin gently sipped his cup of tea and in his mind, he was processing everything that Liu Xiaoyao had informed him earlier. More than 50 people suffered at the hands of the survivors who were killed or captured the night before. Among these 50, 15 of them died after receiving different kinds of wounds while the rest of them suffered physical injuries or losses in which their properties were damaged in some way or another. On top of that, a total of 246 soul evolvers and 53 armed soldiers were lost in last night's battle, this in conjunction with the great loss of over 150,000 rounds of ammunition made Bai Zimin's heart about to bleed rivers. Over 150,000 rounds of ammunition to kill just over 2,000 beasts. He muttered with a frown. On average, between 70 and 100 rounds were needed to take down a single creature. This was a number that was far from good. Animals, inherently, already possessed far more powerful physiques than humans before the apocalypse. This disparity had only increased to new heights when the world's mana entered and changed the physique of these animals, transforming them into mutant beasts that even a bullet in the head could not necessarily bring them down. While a creature like a mutated squirrel would still die if it received a bullet through the head, how many shots were really necessary to bring down creatures like mutated elephants or mutated rhinoceroses whose skins at this point were comparable to steel plates? Probably several thousand, and this was the case regarding the unclassified beasts. If they were first order, Bai Zimin was very clear that it would probably take tens of thousands of bullets and even hundreds of thousands to bring down just one of these monsters. The previous night's affair, after the losses were laid out on a sheet of paper and displayed more clearly, made Bai Zimin have to consider his next move very carefully. Because it made him realize how incredibly weak mankind was. In the first major confrontation his faction had against the mutant beasts, in order to win they had to expend approximately 2/3 of their arsenal, which in itself was not much to begin with. While the human losses themselves were not high compared to the beasts even before Bai Zimin arrived, the reproduction rate of the beasts was in most cases tens or even hundreds of times higher than that of humans. Moreover, beasts could fight fiercely from birth. But how many years did a human need to go through the different stages, from baby to adolescent or even adult, before possessing the power to fight? We can't go on like this. Bai Zimin thought quietly and stood up. The maiden saw him walking in her direction and became nervous. However, she tried to act calm and asked respectfully, "Leader, do you need me to prepare something for you?" Bai Zeman waved his hand and said in a deep voice, "Just tell Lu Xiaoao that she has done a good job. Let her continue in the same way, my expectations for her are higher now." The middle-aged maiden was surprised but hurriedly bowed and consented. Just as he was about to leave, Bai Zeman stopped and asked with a frown, "By the way, do you know where Lu Yan is?" Lu Yan? The maiden blinked in surprise. Very few people dared to so casually mention Lu Yan's name after all. But remembering who the person in front of her was, she chuckled to herself at her own thoughts. Mr. Lu had headed to the military area a few hours ago. She replied after a few seconds' thought. The inaugural upload of this chapter took place via N0vel B.J.N. I see. Thank you. Bai Zeman nodded and left without looking back. A quite pretty young maiden who just happened to be passing by approached the middle-aged maiden and asked with sparkling eyes, "Big Sister May, how is the young leader of the rumors?" The middle-aged maiden, still surprised, said puzzled, "He is a really polite young man. He even just said thank you to me." Is that so? The young maiden blinked. Suddenly her eyes lit up and she said cheerfully, "Could it be that we have a chance? If we manage to get into his bed, our lives will be much safer and we won't have to worry about going hungry anymore." The middle-aged maiden whom the young woman referred to as Big Sister May rolled her eyes and said in a joking tone, "Bah, you little brat. See if I don't tell your mother later and then tell me how red your butt got. Hehehehe. Asterisk asterisk asterisk." Bai Zeman walked with firm steps towards the military area. In his head, he was still thinking about the previous matters. The only thing that lightened his heavy mood a bit was that not everything was negative. As in every war, while it was impossible to avoid losses, it was also impossible to get absolutely nothing as a gain. This was exactly the case even if the battle fought had been against wild beasts. Lu Xiaoao's words still danced around Bai Zeman's ears. "From the 5,023 mutated beasts we defeated last night, we managed to obtain more than 20 tons of meat, and this is so making a conservative estimate since we had to remove approximately the weight of skin, bones, ligaments, blood, etc. In addition, as you requested, we started the dismantling process as soon as the bodies were moved to the appropriate area. Although it is not yet known for certain, according to my team's calculations we should be able to receive enough material to train several blacksmiths who, while not experts, will undoubtedly be of great help in forging equipment on an ongoing basis." The matter of the approximately 20,000 kilograms of pure meat was something that had made Bai Zeman very happy. One needed to know that his faction currently had a total that exceeded 5,000 people, so the daily consumption of rations was frighteningly high. Even if it was currently still manageable, Bai Zeman did not know how long this would be the case. Although under Wu Yuzhen's careful observation in beginning village several groups of food gatherers and farmers had formed, it was actually not as easy to obtain harvest as it was in the past. This was because the current farmland was no longer the same farmland than it was in the past. With the constant intervention of mana, the world was under a constant process of evolution that did not stop no matter if it was day or night. Therefore, the seeds that had been saved since before the apocalypse, seeds that naturally had not mutated, for the most part, could not withstand the abrupt and constant change of the earth, so that no matter how long they were left there they never revealed any kind of growth, much less intentions to flourish. As for this matter, Bai Zeman was also at a loss as to what to do. In the past, he had studied biology, but his knowledge was of no use to him when everything he used to know had completely changed. Therefore, he and his group could only take one step at a time and study the situation slowly until a solution to the problem was found. While the issue with the farming was being resolved, Bai Zeman needed a source of supplies large enough to support mankind, since regardless of the survival of the race, without food humans would not work, and if this happened all of Bai Zeman's efforts to rule over China would be as futile as trying to break a rock with an egg. 20 tons of meat alone would be enough to feed plus 10,000 people for a good amount of time, even more so if this was turned into soup, which was perfectly plausible considering that the meat with which the survivors would be fed was not normal meat but mutated meat. Although neither Bai Zeman nor anyone else was aware of the consequences that surviving on meat would have on the human body, at least it could not be worse than starving to death. Moreover, he did not believe that this would become a short-term problem during the first few years. By then, Bai Zeman and the others might be able to find any kind of solution. If the worst came to the worst, then Bai Zeman would go to another world. After all, it was absolutely impossible for all races to live based on meat alone. Even then, many would complain. Therefore, Bai Zeman had always been racking his brain to think of countermeasures to help him solve the food problem. Although it was not a problem today, as a leader he had an obligation to think years ahead, since what was involved here was the existence of an entire race. As for the matter of the blacksmiths, Bai Zeman's eyes lit up at the thought of this. With the amount of materials obtained, he would be able to recruit a large number of unemployed survivors and slowly train them into blacksmiths good enough to craft quality equipment to aid the soul evolvers in their battles on the front lines. In fact, this job did not even require Bai Zeman himself to do it, since the North Camp had 2 blacksmiths. It was precisely these 2 blacksmiths who had forged various pieces of equipment for Lu Yan and his faction in the past after he lured them by paying a large sum of supplies as a token of goodwill and good daily pay. Bai Zeman only needed to lock up the 2 blacksmiths in a large workshop along with 20 or 30 surviving aspiring blacksmiths and periodically give them materials for them to practice constantly. Quite possibly, in a matter of days or weeks at most, the faction would be able to greet a large group of blacksmiths, since with the support of the soul record the humans could learn tasks much more quickly. Otherwise, this process would take months to train even a mediocre blacksmith. As for the materials that would be wasted in the training process, although it was a pity, Bai Zeman had already hardened his heart and prepared to lose everything. As in most things in life, it was impossible for a new project to be lossless at the beginning, and only after the first investment would the profits slowly begin to show. In any case, these materials would be from unclassified beasts and he would hand over the low-level ones first, so it was not an unbearable loss either. The investment in the long run was definitely worth it. With his mood slightly better after thinking about all this and realizing that the future might not be as gloomy as it seemed if things were done right, Bai Zeman arrived at the military area, and even from a distance he could feel the heavy atmosphere in the place. Bai Zimin found himself up against a pretty strong defense the moment he arrived at the military area. However, after what happened the night before, he was basically known by every single soldier and soul evolver. Two powerful level 17 and level 18 soul evolvers guarding with swords and with firearms from the top of a makeshift wall that had been erected to separate the military complex from the rest of the base saw the young man who the night before had displayed godly power and immediately stood with their backs straight. Leader! Leader! The two men shouted with respect and enthusiasm at the same time. The fervor in their gaze was too clear to be missed by anyone who saw them, and Bai Zimin naturally did not miss it. Although being treated with such reverence was precisely something Bai Zimin sought so that no one would ever think of betraying or opposing him, the gaze of the two people in front of him somehow made him a little awkward. This was also understandable considering that it had not yet been a long time since he had become the top leader of a faction that was composed of several thousand people. Good job. He nodded toward them with a slight smile and then walked past them. The two men were immediately excited and began to pay more attention to their surroundings. Previously, for these two soul evolvers close to level 20, being stationed as a gate guard was not something they were excited about, since from their point of view it was a waste of time, believing that they should be leveling up instead of standing like statues for hours in the same place. From a certain point of view, these two men had a point. However, the real reason why two soul evolvers like them were placed in a position like this was because the area behind them contained the entire armed arsenal and 80% of the rations by which the base could still stand. If this was stolen, damaged, or any other mishap happened, then even if Bai Zimin were twice as powerful, he would not be able to avoid the chaos that would arise. Leaving the two somewhat overjoyed soul evolvers behind, Bai Zimin walked through the complex for several minutes and passed several checkpoints. It was only approximately 10 minutes later that he finally reached the deepest part and immediately heard several shouts and curses from the distance. Fanbo! I told you to let go of my son. Are you fucking deaf or what? N0v3L Realm was the platform where this chapter was initially revealed on N0v3L.B1N. Even if that's what you want. I'm afraid I can't carry out that order, Team Leader Xiao. Damn it. You think this father doesn't dare to blow your head off in this fucking instant? Immediately after those words, Bai Zimin heard several shouts of shock, and apparently a fight was about to break out. He frowned hard and his body swayed slightly, blinking and appearing several meters ahead as if he had teleported. In just 2 seconds he appeared inside a large clearing where there were several people kneeling with a few armed men around. However, the problem was that 4 armed men were aiming at a team of 2 men armed with pistols and machine guns. The 2 armed men were not just sitting around waiting to die at all, as they also raised their light machine guns and aimed at their own teammates while glaring cautiously at them. Team Leader Xiao, please reconsider. A young man dressed in a police uniform and neatly combed hair around 26 or 27 years old shouted loudly while aiming at a man of around 35 or 36 years old. Bai Zimin realized that this young man who had just spoken was the same Fanbo who apparently had captured the son of this person called Team Leader Xiao. Seeing that things might get out of hand soon, he walked forward and said in a cold voice. What the hell is going on here? Feeling the approaching footsteps and hearing the cold and indifferent voice, the 6 armed men immediately tensed up and shifted their gazes hurriedly to the side. Leader. The eyes of the person whose name was Fanbo lit up upon seeing and recognizing Bai Zimin immediately. On the other hand, Bai Zimin noticed that the expression of the officer surnamed Xiao sank as well as that of the 3 armed men accompanying him. Although they soon returned to normal, that change did not go unnoticed by him at all. Leader. That team leader immediately hailed, but without much enthusiasm, his gaze still wandering to the kneeling people tied with strings in the back. Bai Zimin needed no more than this to immediately understand what was going on. However, he acted as if he knew nothing and calmly said, I asked a question. Can someone tell me why the 6 of you raise your guns against your own comrades? The expression of the opposing 4 changed again, as even though the young man's voice before them was calm and low, the pressure and depth were comparable to that of a large waterfall. The one who was obviously the leader of these 4 took a deep breath and lowered his gun before saying loudly, Leader. My name is Xiao Yang, and I am the leader of the 17th team composed by 10 men. I beg you to let my son go and forgive his offenses at the expense of my contribution to this base. Oh. Bai Zimin raised an eyebrow and his eyes flashed with a hint of amusement as he calmly said, and who might be your son? Explain the situation to me. Yes. The person called Xiao Yang nodded and looked at a young man of about 15 years old as he narrated the events. My only son Xiao Meng, yesterday He committed offenses that harmed public order and the safety of the survivors to some degree. However, he did not kill anyone. That's why I beg you to forgive him this time, and I will personally take care of educating him accordingly. Your son committed offenses that harmed public order and compromised the safety of the survivors and consequently the base as a whole, but just based on the fact that he didn't kill anyone, you want him to be excused? Bai Zimin secretly scoffed and his expression grew colder and colder. Seeing his expression sinking, Xiao Yang's heart tightened and his grip on his firearm tightened. Bai Zimin ignored this and looked at the young man Xiao Yang had been looking all this time. The young man could hardly be considered a teenager on his way to adulthood, his face was tender like a child's. Or at least that's how it was supposed to be, since he currently had several contusions all over his face and his left eye was purple and swollen to the point where it wasn't possible to open it. Are you Xiao Meng? Bai Zimin asked as he walked towards the young man. Xiao Meng raised his head and tried to say something, but all that came out of his mouth was a whimper followed by tears and sobs. Bai Zimin looked at him and shook his head. You can't even bear this kind of pain, but you dare to cause suffering to others. Then he ignored everyone and looked at the armed officer whose name he had heard before. Your name is Fanbo, is that correct? Why yes. Fanbo replied hurriedly, finally snapping out of his daze and lowering his gun. Fanbo was just an officer of the lowest rank whose only privilege in contrast to normal survivors was carrying a firearm and the fact that he could eat quite comfortably every day. Other than that, he was no different from a normal person, so talking directly to someone of Bai Zimin's level was no different from standing before the former president of China. From his point of view, one could only try to imagine the nerves Fanbo was feeling. What were the crimes this young man committed last night? Bai Zimin asked and released a hint of his soul power as he said chillingly, you don't need to lie or worry about anything. Just obey my words and everything will be fine for you. Everyone's face turned slightly pale as they felt the invisible pressure on their shoulders. This was especially the case for Xiao Yang and the 3 men accompanying him, as they could barely stand on wobbly legs. Fanbo swallowed heavily and nodded before slowly beginning to narrate. Xiaomeng, son of team leader Xiao Yang. This year he turned 15. Last night, while you, leader, along with the other comrades were fighting on the front lines of the west gate of the base, this person Xiaomeng was captured alive by battalion commander Fu Suifeng. His accusations are setting fire to private property, banditry, and finally attempted rape. Other than Xiaomeng, the 3 young men next to him are his friends and their charges are the same. At this point, Bai Zemin's faction in the north camp had several hundred armed men. Since Fu Suifeng's position in the army was that of the commander, he was the person in charge of leading a team of over 200 soldiers and a dozen soul evolvers. His power was indisputable as was the trust Bai Zemin had placed in him. Since Fu Suifeng knew how careful Bai Zemin was in dealing with juniors, instead of executing Xiaomeng on the spot the night before, he imprisoned him and brought him to the military prison to be treated later. Bai Zemin nodded silently and looked at Xiao Yang as he said casually, since you are a team leader, you should have seen me at the meeting several days ago when I took control over this base, is that correct? Xiao Yang nodded with a pale face and Bai Zemin continued. Since that is the case, you should have heard that I am the top leader of a faction further south that we will be joining in soon. Without waiting for a reply, Bai Zemin continued, in the list of rules I made explicitly clear, the one I highlighted the most at the time was that rape or attempted rape would not be tolerated regardless of the rank or position of the person at fault. Correct. But. Leader, my son. Your son is a rapist, he is scum. Bai Zemin cut Xiao Yang off without letting him finish and activated blood manipulation as he said indifferently, just because he failed to accomplish the act since he was arrested in the process doesn't mean the punishment should be any better. Therefore, he will die. A cry of pain escaped out from Xiaomeng's mauled mouth. His eyes began to bleed, his eardrums seemed to explode as blood began to gush out, and an instant later a large gush of blood spurted out of his mouth before he collapsed lifelessly on the ground. Xiao Yang's eyes retracted to the size of a needle when he heard his son's cry. However, by the time he turned his face to look at him, all he saw was his precious boy lying on the ground in his own blood. Realizing what had happened, Xiao Yang felt as if something broke inside him and in a fit of rage and madness he raised his gun in the direction of Bai Zemin. You bastard! My son was all I had. However, before he could fire, both of his hands were cut by thin blood threads that were only revealed when the sun shone on them. Arg! Xiao Yang cried out in pain and recoiled as blood gushed from his wrists. You had your life before too. Now I'm afraid you really have nothing. It was the last thing he heard before his heart stopped completely and his body fell lifelessly to the ground, joining his son. The clearing was deathly silent for several seconds and everyone's gazes focused on the young man wearing black sweatpants and a casual white t-shirt without impurities. The look on the young man's face was as indifferent as if what he had just done was not taking the lives of 2 people but killing 2 flies. The 3 armed men who accompanied Xiao Yang looked at the corpse of their former team leader and cringed in fear as they realized that those blood threads were mysteriously floating in the air, only becoming partially visible when the sun's rays hit them at the right angle. Bai Zemin ignored the cries of fear and pleas of the kneeling survivors and looked at the 3 armed men before declaring in a firm, cold voice, you 3 broke orders and supported a traitor to free a captive but also raised your guns against your own comrades. Wait. Leader, please listen to what I have to say. The 3 immediately started shouting and pleading, but Bai Zemin shook his head and waved his hand. Swoosh. 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 3 blood threads flew through the air and pierced the body of the 3 armed men, crushing the heart with ease and taking their lives in the blink of an eye. As the 3 collapsed lifelessly, Bai Zemin looked at Fanbo and the young officer shuddered in fear. This chapter was first shared on the N0vel.B.J.N. platform. Where is Shang Guanbing Shuet? He asked with a frown. According to him, Shang Guanbing Shuet should be around. He was sure that if she were present those 4 pieces of scum would already be dead and wouldn't have caused so much trouble. Miss Shang Guan? Fanbo hesitated as he didn't know how to address Shang Guanbing Shuet. Officially, she was just like Bai Zemin and did not actually have a military rank within the army. However, everyone knew that her position was incredibly high and second only to the leader himself, so everyone treated her with the utmost respect possible. She was here before and ordered us to execute all the criminals, saying that those were direct orders from you, leader. Fanbo finally began to explain. After that, she left together with temporary Captain Liu Yan and a team to initiate the preparations for marching. Bai Zemin's eyes immediately flashed with understanding when he heard this. Actually, since he had been in Liu Yan's mansion meeting with Liu Xiaoyao and listening about last night's losses and gains for almost an hour, it was completely normal for Shang Guanbing Shuet to not be here. After all, this place didn't require her presence at all. I see. He finally nodded and then looked at the kneeling survivors. Are they part of the ones who caused disturbance last night? He asked calmly. Yes. Fanbo nodded and said cautiously, Commander Fu Suifeng and Captain Nangong Yi captured them and brought them to the facility since they didn't know how the leader would deal with them. Bai Zemin noticed that there were young men, women, there was even a man over 50 years old with a face covered with wrinkles. All of them were on their knees with their hands tightly bound and their feet together as they looked at him with pleading eyes and sobbed silently. He did not have to think too hard to understand the reason why Nangong Yi and Fu Suifeng did not execute these people immediately and instead took the trouble to capture them alive. Bai Zemin looked at Fanbo and ordered, from today, you 2 will join the battalion under Fu Suifeng's direct command. You report to him and tell him that you are going under my orders. Also, be sure to inform the rest of the team about it. Fu Suifeng will be in direct charge of you from now on. The 2 men's eyes lit up and they were immediately relieved. After all, the team they belonged to before had just basically disappeared completely. Yes. The 2 immediately responded. Bai Zemin nodded and walked towards the exit without another word. Leader. What do we do with these people? He did not stop at Fanbo's question, instead, he asked, didn't you get orders before? Fanbo and his colleague looked at each other, remembering Shang Guanbing Shue's previous visit. They both nodded to each other and lifted their guns before pointing forward. In the distance, Bai Zemin heard the sound of gunshots several times before everything went silent again. His expression did not change at all, and his eyes were as cold as ice and sharp as swords as he left the military compound and walked towards the square that stood in the center of the entire base. When he finally got there, he saw dozens and dozens of large vehicles parked. A large group of soldiers were guarding the area, keeping curious survivors who were pointing and muttering from afar out of the area. Several soul evolvers were working in groups, moving the corpses of a large number of mutated beasts whose sizes differed from one another and carefully placing them on cargo trucks or on huge trailers that had been improvised using the bones of other beasts. Each vehicle had been modified thanks to Sheng Guanbingshue's foresight so that even the smallest truck at this point was capable of carrying more than a dozen beasts of considerably large size. Although the speed would be greatly reduced, this was not a big problem as the road conditions did not allow them to travel very fast anyway. The only real problem would be that the engines would not last long and the pistons could burst at any time due to the large amount of weight. After all, even if these were truck engines there was a weight limit to what they could carry before problems started to show. Bai Ziman and the others had estimated that even if the trucks were of good quality, their engines would probably end up completely melting down within 1 or 2 years without any possibility of repair. By that time, they would have no choice but to find replacements or some other way to substitute the vehicles, but this was not an easy task at all. It was not something that could be done just because they knew it was necessary to do so. After searching for a while, Bai Ziman saw Kong Lan and Sheng Guanbingshui standing in a corner. Both were silent as they kept their eyes on the work. He walked toward them and was soon noticed, which ended in several people greeting him. Fortunately, the last week's military training had had a good effect and no one stopped working or else it would have been a headache. Done. Sheng Guanbingshui immediately smiled at the sight of him and asked gently. Done. Bai Ziman nodded with a faint smile and then began to explain everything Liu Xiaoao had informed him. Kong Lan, who was currently unable to use her right hand and was holding her magic staff with her left, looked at the two people in front of her with surprise written on her face. Since when did these two become what seemed to be best friends? Suddenly, a playful smile appeared on the mage and healer's face as she thought that things would probably become much more interesting and fun when the group returned to Beginning Village. After Bai Ziman finished telling Sheng Guanbingshui about the losses, she frowned tightly as the loss of ammunition and men far exceeded her initial expectation. Fortunately, we managed to obtain a good number of treasures last night and even got hold of a large supply of food and forging and building materials. Otherwise, I fear this loss alone might have been enough to bring the whole camp down. She analyzed quietly. Yet. Bai Ziman nodded. Then he said calmly, we'll have to leave for the south as early as tomorrow. The more we delay it, the worse it will be for us on the way back as the amount of firepower will decrease more and more. Sheng Guanbingshui nodded before falling silent. The two separated soon after and began to give orders. Kong Lan also joined them and a few hours later Fu Suifeng, Nanggong Yi and Nanggong Lingzhen arrived, who also began to help move things along to finish faster. By the time night fell, the survivors who would be going south had already left the warmth of their previous homes and moved into the houses around the area around the central square. That way, everyone would be able to board the vehicles first thing in the morning. As for those who were still stubborn and unwilling to leave their homes, Bai Ziman ordered everyone not to bother with those people and to continue working. Since even after what happened the night before there were still stubborn and foolish people who wanted to stay, then let them stay. Bai Ziman had too many things on his hands and too little time to handle them all to be worrying about the safety or opinions of each and every survivor. This was the most he could and was willing to do. Whether they appreciated it or not was no longer his problem. After dinner, Bai Ziman did not go into the forest to hunt and also ordered everyone not to go into the forest as the second-order existences that might be in the depths and the first-order existences in the inner area would probably be on high alert due to what happened before. In the end, even though they all wanted to strengthen themselves, they obeyed and went to sleep quietly. Even Sheng Guanbingshui, who wanted to rush as quickly as possible to level 50 to receive her mission to advance to the second order did not refute Bai Ziman's words because in her heart she was aware that he was right. Therefore, she also went to her room, and soon after she fell asleep. Bai Ziman looked around the white room, realizing that for the first time since the beginning of the apocalypse he would be sleeping truly alone. For a moment, a feeling of loneliness and loss grew in his heart. However, as soon as it appeared, he silently scoffed and forcibly shook that feeling away before lying down and closing his eyes. After all, he had been alone for a long time since even before the apocalypse broke out. Something like loneliness was something he had long since gotten used to and he even believed that he would probably be without company for most of his life. After all, in the past, he wasn't much different from his current self when it came to trusting people. A few minutes later, his heart calmed down completely and his breathing became quiet. His consciousness drifted away from his body and he fell into a sleep deep enough to rest comfortably but light enough to wake up immediately at the slightest trouble. It was 5:30 in the morning and the sun had not yet risen. The sky was still almost completely dark, the only exception being the sparse starlight coming from distant stars hundreds, thousands, even millions of light years away from Earth. However, even though normally everyone would be asleep at home for at least another hour, at this point the entire base was awake. Regardless of whether it was a normal survivor or a person of power within the military, everyone was on their feet, dressed as warmly as possible as they made their way alone or with their families to the central square. Some people carried bags, suitcases, plastic bags, and even used large blankets to wrap their most important belongings. However, there were also others who only wore some slightly worn clothes who had nothing in this world but their own lives. All of these people walked in an orderly fashion as they saw the large military lineup of several hundred heavily armed men and none of them dared to cause the slightest disorder. North of the base's central square, Yan Tu was wearing a suit of armor made from the skin of a first-order python that he himself had defeated in the past. The marks on the armor showed that the battle 2 nights ago had been hard enough that even the heavy defense of his armor was not enough to withstand the heavy attacks of his enemies. I want everyone to form in an orderly fashion in a single line. Children and women first, men next, and old men last. If anyone dares to cut the line, push, or cause trouble and is discovered, they will be whipped at the first instant and left behind without the possibility of boarding any vehicles. He shouted at the top of his lungs. His voice reached out to the end of the wave of people for all to hear and feeling the weight in that hoarse voice and seeing the bulging muscles that even that great armor could not hide, all the survivors obediently began to line up under the watchful observation of one of the most powerful evolvers in the entire base and 100 or so armed men who watched them with cold eyes. A woman dressed in cloth armor that, despite being rank 0 had enough defense to withstand several attacks from a beast below level 10, stepped away from the line and walked with cautious steps towards Yan Tu. The woman's appearance was not outstanding by any means and was more on the normal side with several wrinkles at the corner of her eyes that exposed her age. She was gently pulling a boy of about 13 years old who was wearing a small rank 0 leather armor whose expression was still somewhat sleepy. Everyone would probably be surprised to see that, despite the fact that this woman was wearing a valuable armor that very few could afford to wear, her hands were actually covered in calluses, showing that in the past she had been someone who had used both of her hands to work really hard. Yan Tu saw the woman approaching and indicated to the soldier next to him to do nothing. When the mother and son pair arrived in front of him and stopped, he asked in a hoarse, emotionless voice, "Full name of both of you?" "Why yes." The woman was obviously scared, which was odd considering that due to her attire she should be someone with some power within the base. She hurriedly responded, "My name is Dingya and this is my son, his name is Gu Yuhan." Yan Tu said nothing and instead silently received a list from the hands of a woman dressed as a cop next to him. After searching through several surnames, he finally found Dingya's name and ticked next to the box. Then Yan Tu did the same for the letter G and a moment later found Gu Yuhan on the list, doing the same as before. He handed the list back to the policewoman and looked at the mother-son duo, making both of them shrink a little. "Go ahead." Hearing this, the woman named Dingya let out a small sigh of relief and thanked before leaving with her son. The survivors who were lining up were naturally not happy about this, however, Yan Tu's earlier warning was still latent in their memories so they could only swallow those complaints in their stomach unless they wanted to risk being left behind, which was basically no different from signing the death sentence. Yan Tu coldly snorted when he saw the dissatisfied expressions, sending chills down the spines of the survivors. Liu Yan, who watched everything from the side, laughed inwardly and shook his head. The woman named Dingya and the 13-year-old little boy named Gu Yuhan were actually the family of Gu Tao, the big man who had quickly become a powerful level 20 soul evolver not long after joining the melee ranks. This man was extremely loyal to Bai Ziman and his bravery had won the hearts of many of his brothers on the battlefield, so he was held in high esteem by all. All soul evolvers naturally had privileges that normal survivors did not. For example, their families did not need to form lines, and at times like this, they had top priority just behind the families of the main leaders. This was a benefit that only they, who risked their lives every second on the battlefield and who were the future hope of mankind, had the right to enjoy. Armed men, on the other hand, had the privilege of passing a member of their families. This was naturally much less than the soul evolvers, which was perfectly normal considering that the importance of the gunman was incomparable to that of the soul evolvers to Bai Ziman and his faction. This type of situation was not only occurring in the northern part of the central square of the base, but was also occurring in the southern, western, and eastern areas. The rest of the square was heavily fenced off and protected by armed men to prevent any survivors from sneaking in. The initial instance of this chapter being available happened at N0, Val, B, J, N. In the south, Fu Suifeng stood next to his sister as he calmly checked on the survivors who passed through in an orderly fashion. Fu Shiren wore a comfortable cloth armor and looked quite beautiful with her clean, flowing brown hair. She observed her little brother's behavior and couldn't help but sigh in her heart, clearly noticing the obvious changes in him. Her little brother had become a great man, but what about her? She was still stuck, doing nothing and depending on him for everything. This was not the kind of life she wanted to herself. It was like this in the past and it was like this now. Suifeng, this is not the way I want to live after all. She finally made up her mind. Fu Suifeng averted his gaze and looked at her in confusion for a few seconds before asking in puzzlement, "Big sister? What do you mean?" Fu Shiren looked at her little brother and said earnestly, "I want to go back to work." Then she blushed as if she had thought of something or remembered something and said slowly, "If you don't mind, I could work as the leader's maid again." Big brothers. Fu Suifeng was at a loss for words. He said a little, not knowing whether to laugh or cry, "Big sister, could it be that you fell in love with Big Brother Bai? Just forget it. There are many ladies who court him in a roundabout way or openly show interest in him, but except for a girl who is at the main base he doesn't pay attention to any woman." Fu Shiren gritted his teeth and said with some embarrassment, "Little brat, do you think you are too brave now? Do you want me to beat you up?" Cough. Cough. Fu Suifeng coughed uncomfortably and looked away. The family was the family after all. Humph. Fu Shiren snorted and said earnestly, "Forget about love. I just want to work and that's all." Fu Suifeng rolled his eyes secretly. Still, after thinking about it for a while, he finally nodded and said calmly, "Okay. I'll see what I can do. But let me tell you, you'd better not think wild thoughts. Big Brother Bai doesn't spend much time at home, so even if you work for him you won't be able to see him 90% of the time." Did you say something? Fu Shiren frowned and raised her small white fist, causing Fu Suifeng to shrink back. The armed men and soul evolvers who belonged to the battalion controlled by Fu Suifeng wanted to laugh at the sight but did not dare. Still, nothing prevented them from looking at each other with amused smiles. In the west, Kong Lan together with Evangeline controlled the area. Both women commanded a team of over 100 armed men and several soul evolvers while they were in charge of keeping everything in order. Since they were both quite reserved with strangers or with everyone in general, neither of them spoke more than necessary. On the east side, Nanggong Yi and Nanggong Lingzhen. The two siblings were doing a good job, working very well as a team. Even as they chatted they managed to draw out some anxious survivors who tried to sneak in from the sides and caused some trouble as they formed the line. Standing atop the tallest building on the entire base, approximately 2 kilometers away from the central square, two people looked down with indifferent expressions. Their pupils clearly reflected how more than 4,900 people were lined up in 4 lines, forming what appeared to be 4 huge dragons that coiled along the length and breadth of several buildings that stretched down several streets as if they had no clear end. These two people were Bai Ziman and Shang Guanbing Shuet. Since what needed to be charged was charged the day before and this kind of movement did not need the intervention of the two of them, considering that it was not really something that could be solved with brute force, the two of them decided to observe the surroundings. After all, this was probably the time when the base's defense was at an all-time low. All the armed men had been moved from the walls and the soul evolvers were nowhere to be seen guarding the surroundings. If a great horde of mutant beasts like the one 2 nights ago attacked at this time, then a great disaster would descend upon the mankind of the base, and more than probably all the survivors would be completely decimated. The two did not talk much and mainly focused on extending their senses as much as possible. Fortunately, 2 hours later, all the survivors who decided to follow the armed troops obediently had finally finished boarding and no major events happened other than the appearance of some zombie or stray beast that roamed the surroundings but were killed before they even understood what was going on. We should go too. Shang Guanbing Shui looked at Bai Zimin beside her and proposed as she saw the drivers start the engines of the vehicles. Bai Zimin had his eyes closed. As he heard the pretty slightly indifferent voice of the woman beside him, he slowly raised his head and looked towards the central square as he calmly said, "You go first. I'll come after you." Seeing Shang Guanbing Shui looking at him, he calmly said, "Someone needs to stay behind in case any beasts rush towards the convoy. Don't you think it would be bad if even a single creature manages to sneak in?" Shang Guanbing Shui thought about it for a moment and realized that what Bai Zimin said made sense. If a beast sneaked in between the buses, even if it ended up dying in the end, it was highly likely that many survivors would die first since they were all densely packed together. Although for some reason she felt that something wasn't right, she failed to point out that it was in a short period of time, so in the end she simply nodded and calmly said, "Then, I'll go first." Swoosh. Bai Zimin felt a light cool breeze blow past him and soon saw Shang Guanbing Shui plummeting towards the ground, only slowing down slightly before touching the floor. Then, she dashed towards the central square at lightning speed, and just before stepping into a military jeep, she glanced in his direction. Seeing him nod, Shang Guanbing Shui gave the order to march. The waiting drivers immediately shifted into first gear and slowly the vehicles began to move towards the southern exit. Only a few moments later, the last vehicle was already about 200 meters away and Bai Zimin slowly turned around to look behind him. Several small creatures came running out of the forest. Their numbers were easily several thousand, too many to be counted accurately. Humph. Bai Zimin snorted and the small pearl containing over 100,000 liters of blood of different species slowly floated out of his armor and stopped on his palm. Small beasts of little more than a meter in height came running out of the thick bushes of the forest, jumped from the huge branches of the tall trees, leaving the camouflage that their dark green skins gave them. Their legs were short so each step they took was extremely small, but the short distance they could close with each step was compensated by how fast they moved. Around their waists they had waist-high sheets and even some sort of leather covering their crotch. Their stomachs were clearly bulging outward in a strange way and made them look extremely odd considering how small they were. Their noses were long, their faces ugly, their golden eyes seemed to glow even when the sun was high in the sky. Warts covered part of their long noses, the monsters' mouths were totally disproportionate compared to their heads, and large fangs that they weren't able to contain showed outwards with a small curve at the bottom. "Damn goblins!" Bai Zimin muttered in a low voice. His voice was devoid of any emotion and even anger was not distinguishable in the slightest. His cold eyes took a detailed look at the creatures several kilometers away, realizing that there were some male and some female goblins. This was all too obvious and even someone who knew nothing about goblins could easily identify them, as the females had distinct protrusions on their upper bodies while the males did not. Unlike what a man might feel if he saw a woman's naked upper body, the only thing Bai Zimin felt was disgust. This disgust reached its peak when he perceived the lust in the expression of the female goblins as they looked at him, causing a deep frown to appear on his handsome face. The breasts of these creatures were wrinkled, sagging, and there were several blemishes that did not help at all to improve their already hideous physical appearances. A detail that Bai Zimin and Shang Guanbing Shui had come to conclude when the goblins first appeared was that they were an extremely lustful race. In some fantasy tales of the past, goblins were portrayed as evil and unintelligent creatures that only knew how to slaughter, while in other legends they were both lustful and evil creatures at the same time. Unfortunately, the goblins that were born on Earth as a consequence of the mutation of the world in general and the support of Mana were beings whose lust seemed to have reached an unprecedented level. Worse yet, these beasts that seemed to know no fear and were extremely brave were also attracted to human women, and Bai Zimin had just confirmed that goblin females were also attracted to human men. This meant that goblins were lustful beings whose sense of beauty was considerably similar to that of humans. Bai Zimin clicked his tongue and felt it was a waste. If goblins were lustful and evil beings but their sense of beauty was different from humans, perhaps goblins would focus more on fighting mutant beasts, mutant plants, or even zombies. However, that lust made humans the main target. At least, humans were undoubtedly their favorite. In just a matter of seconds, Bai Zimin had analyzed and drawn several conclusions while trying to think of countermeasures so that humanity would not have to face so many enemies at the same time. Unfortunately, these kinds of countermeasures didn't usually magically appear in an instant, and given the circumstances, he didn't have time to sit comfortably and think calmly either. As Bai Zimin prepared to receive the uninvited guests who decided to attack just as the base was at its weakest point and just as the troops were starting their march, which left them at a great disadvantage, a cold but at the same time gentle voice reached his ears. "Do you need help?" For a moment, he thought Shang Guanbing Shui had returned. However, a moment later he realized that the voice came from inside the radio in his bag. Looking behind him, Bai Zimin realized that the large motorcade had barely advanced 600 meters, and Shang Guanbing Shui was standing over the corpse of a giant beast that a huge truck was struggling to move. Bai Zimin took the radio out of his leather bag and as his black eyes met her blue eyes, he calmly replied, "No need. It's only several thousand, I can take care of it in a couple of minutes. On the other hand, you secure the convoy and have the soldiers and soul evolvers advance alongside." "Oh." Shang Guanbing Shui frowned upon hearing Bai Zimin's words. Soon, however, a glint of understanding shone in her eyes as she nodded toward him without a word and cut off the communication. Bai Zimin immediately noticed how the convoy's speed visibly slowed down as all the soldiers dressed in cop uniform and the soul evolvers wearing leather armor or cloth armor hurriedly got off the different vehicles. Immediately after getting off the vehicles, all the men surrounded the trucks and buses in which were the survivors and important supplies. The movement speed of the vehicles slowed down to even less than 10 km per hour as the soul evolvers followed closely behind them and monitored the surroundings with maximum caution and their weapons held high. Bai Zimin nodded as he watched this, and in his heart, he praised Shang Guanbing Shui for her quick understanding, swift reaction, and wise decision. At times like this, when it was not known whether a second enemy might appear after the first one showed itself, increasing the speed of escape was only feasible in cases where your speed was faster than the enemy's and you had no obstacles. However, in this case, the speed of the vehicles was slow and there were almost 5,000 survivors who in this situation were nothing more than a big obstacle. Fleeing under such circumstances would only weaken the defense enormously, exposing areas that the enemy could exploit to wipe them out completely. Therefore, Shang Guanbingshue's decision was undoubtedly the best, not to stop completely and continue to advance while moving all possible defenses to create something similar to a turtle shell filled with thorns. Bai Zimin turned his attention to the enemy ahead and his eyes flashed coldly. The goblins had already crossed the 500-meter range. Many of them had already stopped and raised their bows to the sky while placing a white bone arrow on the string of the weapon. Swoosh! 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 For an instant, the sky seemed to darken under what appeared to be an endless stream of flying locusts. Although it was impossible to know the exact number, Bai Zimin estimated while looking at the sky that there should be at least 20,000 more arrows flying in his direction. The arrows made from the bones of some kind of mutant beast were launched with a force that even surprised Bai Zimin himself a little, as he did not expect those little creatures whose arms were as thin as sticks to have so much power as to make the arrows fly more than 1,000 meters high. When the arrows began to fall due to gravity, even an armored vehicle would be torn apart by such firepower. Probably only the kings of the earth, the war tanks, would be able to withstand this kind of large-scale attack, and even the IFVs would turn into a pile of scrap metal after receiving several hits. Dodging so many arrows at the same time was impossible unless one had the ability to move 2 kilometers in a very short time, something that Bai Zimin could actually do. However, how could he worry about the attacks of small creatures whose power was that of an insignificant unclassified existence? Wouldn't he end up becoming a laughingstock if he couldn't even counter that much? Unless your numbers cross 500,000, you all can forget about even crossing over here. A battle-excited smile appeared on Bai Zimin's face without him noticing, completely exposing his features as a berserker born for combat. Swoosh! 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 The small crimson pearl glowed at Bai Zimin's mental command, and the blood in it immediately shot outward at lightning speed, even surpassing the falling speed of the bone arrows launched by the goblin archers. A glowing red shield approximately 10 meters in diameter appeared just above Bai Zimin's head, completely covering his surroundings. In addition, a second giant shield appeared right in front of the building, protecting the structure from the attack in progress. The bone arrows fell and in a second began to hit the blood shield steadily. Many arrows hit different parts of the blood shield at the same time, but they did not even hit it at all, leaving only small white dots that disappeared in an instant as the blood moved strangely and as if it was alive covered those small marks. More than 5,000 arrows hit the blood shield raised by Bai Zimin casually, but not even a single arrow managed to pierce through its defense. The only remarkable thing was the loud explosive sound that the arrows caused as they struck one after another, causing his ears to go numb very faintly. However, although Bai Zimin was able to easily take the attack of the goblin archers, the same could not be said for the rest of the surrounding base. Bang! 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 Tens of thousands of arrows rained down on the houses, buildings, and different constructions made of concrete or wood. Many of these constructions managed to withstand several hits, but when the number of hits increased and reached a peak, the buildings began to collapse one after another. L1 T-Lagoon witnessed the first publication of this chapter on N0 Velbian. Help! Save me! God help us! Please! No! Of course, the buildings were not the only ones to suffer the consequences of the goblin attack. Approximately 300 survivors had stubbornly decided to stay on the base despite warnings from the armed troops. They all decided that somehow or other they would be fine as long as they avoided the periphery of the base, confident that they would be able to survive for a long time using the remnants of the mutated beasts left behind. When the goblin army appeared in the distance and became visible after breaking through the small walls of the base, these stubborn survivors finally realized how naive their previous thoughts were and hurriedly tried to flee towards the convoy that was getting farther and farther away, abandoning not only the homes they had previously decided to stay for but even losing the smallest of their personal property due to their stubbornness. Unfortunately for all of them, the speed of a normal human was incomparable to that of a goblin whose average level was between 10 and 15. Therefore, by the time the survivors had run 100 meters, the goblin archers had already stepped into firing range and unleashed their deadly arrows. A young man of about 24 was running hand in hand with his girlfriend. The desperation on the couple's faces was visible to the world, but the way they clung to each other's hands seemed to be worth mentioning. Swoosh! A bone arrow fell from the sky and easily pierced the back of a man running a meter away from the couple. The man's body was stabbed into the ground and the resulting explosion caused the ground to break apart. This tested how powerful the attack was thanks to the gravity of the earth and the height from which the bone arrows fell. The resulting explosion from the attack sent the pair flying a meter or two, causing them both to roll on the ground as the bone arrows fell one after another. Ugh! I think I broke my ankle. The man groaned as he tried his best to stand up. Unfortunately, the pain seemed to be much more than he estimated as he immediately fell back to the ground. The man looked at his girlfriend and hurriedly called for help in an urgent voice. Hao Li, help me. We have to escape quickly. However, his girlfriend didn't even look at him as she instantly after crawling and standing up started running away, leaving her partner behind as if she was abandoning a sack of junk. Bang! The man stood there stunned for a brief moment, and that brief moment was what led to his death when he was finally hit by an arrow that caused his head to explode in a bloody mess. The expression on the face of the woman named Hao Li got even worse when over her shoulder she saw the fate of her former partner. She screamed and cried out in fear as she commanded her legs to move at speeds that even she did not know she could reach. The arrows fell one after another, and although most of them only hit the ground or knocked down buildings, there were also many others that hit the survivors who were trying their best to flee for their lives. Hao Li came to see the huge blood shield in the distance that easily covered the giant building, and a faint glimmer of hope shone in her eyes as she hurriedly ran in that direction. Help! Help me please! She screamed at the top of her lungs. At the top of the building, Bai Zimin watched everything taking place with a deathly cold expression on his face. From the top of the base's tallest building, Bai Zimin had a view of almost everything going on in the surrounding area for miles around. From afar, while his blood shield prevented the enemy bone arrows from reaching him and the large blood barrier prevented the bone arrows from hitting the building and knocking it down, Bai Zimin watched very carefully everything taking place before his eyes. His dark eyes reflected the ugliness of mankind, once again. He witnessed how a grown man abandoned an old man who was probably his father or perhaps his grandfather. He saw how a young man abandoned the person who appeared to be his injured mother in an attempt to run faster. He witnessed how a man abandoned his wife and also how a wife abandoned her husband. In times of light, everyone is a friend. But in times of darkness, no one is likely to be with us. This was a very old phrase that Bai Zeman always liked and in the past thought he knew perfectly well. But it was only after the soul record came to earth and forced everyone's lives to change that he realized what true darkness was and what the word loneliness really meant. It was not about the darkness that could be cleared with a beacon of light, it was about those moments when one was lost and without guidance. It was not about loneliness that could be solved by going to a crowded place, it was more about sentimental and mental sadness, those moments when you realized that you were really alone and with no one to ease a little of your pain, when you can't even give yourself warmth. As Bai Zeman's heart grew colder and colder, the voice of a girl pleading for his help brought him out of his inner thoughts. There he saw her, one of the people who had also abandoned her loved one. The girl was considerably beautiful when compared to the women who at this moment had lost the brightness and whiteness of their skin. However, in Bai Zeman's eyes, she was as ugly as those goblins. No, even uglier than those goblins. He ignored her cries and pleas, ignored her constant yelling for help. The bone arrows continued to fall and soon covered the entire area around the building he was standing on. The girl, who was just a normal average human, naturally failed to avoid the full-scale attack. Her body was hit by several bone arrows. The first arrow hit her right leg and the power behind the attack caused her entire leg to be torn off from the thigh down. The girl fell to the ground and barely had time to feel pain as she was immediately torn into an unrecognizable pile of crushed flesh. In the end, abandoning her beloved did not do much good. All she succeeded in doing was dying with a guilty conscience, leaving behind a grief-stricken man, and running a couple of meters before finally being swallowed by the infinite darkness. How ironic. Bai Zeman spoke to himself as he used blood manipulation. You ask for help from the one you somehow or other know you will not get anything from while abandoning those who were probably willing to give their lives for you. Under his control and the consumption of a few tenths of his mana reserve, which could no longer be considered small, the blood shield that covered him and the second blood shield that was like an impenetrable barrier protecting the building began to twist strangely before forming a giant sword over a kilometer long that pointed towards the sky. The goblin archers who were preparing the second round of ranged attacks stopped their movements and strange sounds came out of their monstrous mouths. Like the goblins carrying bone swords and spears, the archers raised their heads to the sky and in their pupils reflected the crimson radiance that the giant sword released only with their presence. Now that you have killed what you had to kill. Bai Zeman's voice echoed throughout the now abandoned base as he stretched his hand upward and clung tightly to the hilt of the giant sword. You can all go to hell itself. His voice was ice cold and his eyes reflected no pain at the death of over 300 survivors. Bai Zeman did not consider himself a tyrant as many secretly called him, nor did he consider himself a hero as others believed. He also did not consider himself the savior or future savior of the human race and even did not consider himself the greatest talent in history as Lilith had repeatedly said. His thought process was simple and the reasoning behind his actions was just as simple. As long as his interests or those of his loved ones were involved, Bai Zeman would definitely step forward. However, if what was at stake was not his interests or did not affect him or his loved ones indirectly, then he would definitely not spend even half a stamina point. The more than 300 survivors who died here today could be said to have died because of their own decisions and actions. They decided to stay behind, which in retrospect meant abandoning the faction of Bai Zeman and the security that living under his banner provided. Consequently, their lives no longer concerned him at all. Like those survivors who wished to leave the beginning village, Bai Zeman never stopped any of them. But he would definitely not lend an allied hand if a zombie appeared before them after they decided to leave. You have only yourselves to blame for being in the place you shouldn't be. It was uncertain whether those words were directed at the souls of the deceased humans or towards the goblins who glared at the giant sword that seemed to want to reach for the clouds in the sky. Q. A fat and burly goblin carrying a large bone mace let out a loud and strange cry before rushing forward. Quay. Kiki. Human. Handsome man. Each goblin in the goblin army let out distinct screams, howls, and words in a human speech before rushing forward in unison as if they were a huge tsunami with the desire to swallow the earth whole. To form the great blood sword, Bai Zeman only had to consume a little over 200 mana points, which had not exhausted him at all. He held tightly to the grip of the blood sword, and under the control of his blood manipulation skill, it was extremely simple to lift this object that under normal circumstances would have crushed him. Instead of cutting immediately, he waited and watched the goblins. 400 meters. The goblins' faces were suffused with ferocity and bloodlust. However, these beasts proved that despite being ferocious and insane, they actually had a certain level of basic intelligence that set them apart from the rest of the creatures mankind had faced so far. 300 meters. The female goblins shrieked and howled towards the sky while the naked lust in their eyes made one wonder if death would not be a reward rather than a punishment compared to falling into the hands of these beasts. 200 meters. The goblin archers again fired a second round of arrows. All of them aimed at the large building and the only structure standing for 2 kilometers around. By the time the goblins entered the 100-meter range, Bai Zeman didn't bother with protecting the building this time and simply slashed with a huge blood sword straight ahead. Die. His bellow followed by the splitting of the wind and the constant explosions of the air bursting wherever the heavy sword passed resounded like thunder heralding the arrival of the storm in the middle of the summer day. Bang. 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 Wherever the blood sword passed, the bone arrows were burst and turned into small white fragments that rained powerlessly to the ground. Thousands of arrows were pulverized under the power of the blood sword, but its downward speed and destructive power were not reduced at all. From the distance, the survivors riding in the buses and trucks squeezed to look through the small holes that were left open around the thick armor covering the vehicles and looked out with eyes filled with fear. The gunmen and soul evolvers unconsciously stopped their steps for an instant as their eyes widened in shock. The blue pupils reflected a huge red line representing the huge blood sword descending from the sky as if it was the punishment sent by the gods. Her sweet pink lips were slightly parted, showing a small glimpse of her pearl white teeth for a brief moment as she muttered, "Truly a monster." The huge blood sword finally touched the ground and the earth split into thousands of pieces. Collapsed buildings were pulverized and cracks spread far and wide for approximately 5 kilometers of what not long ago was the foundation on which thousands of human lives depended for survival. The length of the sword was over 1,000 meters, so even though Bai Zimin did not use gravity manipulation at all, the damage caused by the destructive power that a weapon of such magnitude had certainly could not be underestimated. You have absorbed the soul power of Wild Archer Goblin level 13. You have absorbed the soul power of Fierce Spear Goblin level 15. You have absorbed the soul power of Barbarian Sword Goblin level 20. You have absorbed the soul power of First Order Bestial Hobgoblin level 31. All the goblins that were within the 1,000 meters long and 20 meters wide range of the blade of the huge blood sword were immediately torn apart. The only thing the beasts saw was a flash of red in their eyes before everything went black. Countless green messages flashed in Bai Zimin's retina, informing him that he had absorbed the soul power of thousands of goblins. Glowing orbs of different sizes flew in his direction and attached themselves to his soul, making it constantly stronger and firmer. Bang! 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 L1 T-Lagoon witnessed the first publication of this chapter on N0 Velbion. The shockwave spread out for hundreds of meters in the form of a giant fan and the bodies of all the goblins burst into a mist of hot blood that slowly vaporized and ascended into the clouds. Flesh, blood, and white bone fragments flew everywhere, turning the ground into a canvas and the world into a bloody painting capable of terrifying the bravest man on earth. The giant blood sword glowed, and under the control of the skill blood manipulation, its form collapsed to morph into thousands of blood whips ranging in size from 10 meters to 300 meters long. Bai Zimin descended from the top of the now almost completely crushed building, and the blood whips swayed around him as if welcoming the Lord and Master of Blood. In front of him, a huge army of green goblins stared at him with bloodshot eyes. This goblin army seemed to have been split in two as a kilometer-long bloody path marked a clear delineation between the two sides. The goblins howled towards him and seemed eager to charge. None of these creatures seemed to be aware of the apparent difference in power. However, before the beasts rushed forward, 5 powerful auras burst from the back of the army more than 3 kilometers away, and they all automatically froze in place. The goblins seemed to momentarily awaken from their state of madness as they immediately shuddered and lowered their heads with fear-filled eyes. Then, the beasts looked back and backed away as strange low sounds came from their saliva-filled mouths. It was obvious that unlike in most cases, the goblins actually had a clear hierarchy of power just like humans. Unlike the beasts that occasionally worked together to confront other enemy races before they started slaughtering each other, the goblins were united by a chain of command in which the weakest obeyed the strongest. How many enemies did Bai Zimin currently face? He did not know the exact number. He simply had no way of knowing, as the green army composed of thousands upon thousands of goblins spread out in the distance, covering Bai Zimin's field of vision. N0V3LTR0VE served as the original host for this chapter's release on N0V3LB1N. How many enemies were within the attack range of the giant blood sword that Bai Zimin created? He also had no way of knowing the exact number. But if there was one thing Bai Zimin was sure of, it was that at least tens of thousands of goblins had been slaughtered the instant the attack hit the ground. Among the slain goblins were mostly unclassified goblins, but Bai Zimin sensed the indistinguishable soul power belonging to first-order existences being assimilated by his own soul. This meant that even a first-order existence could no longer withstand attacks from Bai Zimin even if he was not focused on them. Of course, this was only possible because the blood weapon contained over 200 mana points and was wielded with over 750 points of pure strength. However, Bai Zimin knew in his heart that these unclassified goblins and the first-order goblins were the rightful soldiers and commanders. The true general had yet to show itself. Oh. I didn't expect that instead of one there would be 5 of you. Bai Zimin stood with his back straight as he narrowed his eyes and smiled slightly at the sight that greeted him. The sea of goblins opened practically in unison as if they had practiced it 1,000 of times, and 5 silhouettes came out from the back. These 5 walked with their heads held high, and even though their faces were 100% goblin, the arrogant look in their eyes and the confident smile at the corner of their jaws was too obvious not to notice that the intelligence of these goblins had reached quite a high level. Bai Zimin's heart constricted slightly as he somehow realized that the intelligence of these 5 goblins had reached at least the stage of a young human teenager. This was definitely not good news if it was really the case, since fighting enemies without intelligence and without a command center was infinitely easier than battling a smart enemy. As this thought flashed in his mind, Bai Zimin's eyes grew cold and the murderous intent in his heart grew to the point where a faint crimson aura began to surround his body as a result of the unconscious exposure of soul power. Ka. Human man, you are strong. I can feel it. A goblin whose skin was slightly bluish and whose size was comparable to that of an adult human laughed raucously as he glared at Bai Zimin with disdain. However, you are still a minor first-order force. You can't even compare to one of us, let alone 5 of us together. The goblin waved a sword made of bone whose shape was quite uncanny, and a freeing green aura appeared above the blade. Swoosh. Wind-like energy flew towards Bai Zimin, and even from afar he could feel the sharp edge behind the incoming attack. However, he did not move from his position and his expression remained impassive. Swoosh. The wind blade cut past his face, passing an inch away from his left cheek and cutting a hair or two in the process before finally striking the ruined building behind him. The wind blade seemed to disappear beyond the walls of the building. However, soon the unthinkable happened. Rumble. The building shook fiercely from the middle as a perfectly horizontal line suddenly appeared separating it into 2 parts. Then, like a house of cards, the building began to slowly collapse until it finally could not take it anymore and became a pile of rubble. As expected of a second-order existence. Bai Zimin thought to himself calmly. He still hadn't forgotten that he ended up half dead in his battle against the second-order archaic bear, even though he had recently ended the lives of 2 second-order beings and severely injured another. Those 2 second-order kills were caused by a heavy surprise attack, not by direct combat like the one he would have to face anytime soon. The situation in the mutant forest and the current situation were completely different. Kaka. The blue-skinned goblin laughed and then proudly yelled, I can tell by the frozen expression on your face that you didn't even see my attack coming, human. The pressure Bai Zimin relaxed greatly as he heard the pride and mockery in the blue-skinned goblin's tone. It was obvious that this beast had good intelligence, but that arrogance made him a predictable opponent. All right, enough with the laughter, Krier. A goblin whose skin was slightly purplish spoke. His voice was loud and powerful, as was his burly body packed with explosive muscles. This goblin wielded a weapon similar to a claymore made of bone and only from afar made it clear that the power of that weapon could compare to the attack power of a rank 1 weapon like Bai Zemin's. You're such a killjoy, Geminder. The blue-skinned goblin named Krier snorted and began to growl under his breath. Hey, Geminder. Can I have this human all to myself? A female goblin looked at Bai Zemin from head to toe and licked her purple lips with her long tongue. I like this human male. He looks strong and powerful. He will definitely be able to take it for a while before he dies, unlike those human males from before. Bai Zemin's expression became slightly colder as he heard these words and his indifferent eyes rested on the female goblin who had just spoken. I like those eyes. We can definitely have fun together on the bed, I'm sure of it. The female goblin was not intimidated by Bai Zemin's gaze and instead began to fool around with her bare breasts as if she wanted to tempt him. This female goblin was a beauty if compared to the unclassified goblin females Bai Zemin had seen before. However, she was still ugly if compared to even the ugliest woman in humanity, so her seduction approach could only cause disgust and the urge to vomit in anyone who looked at her. What caught Bai Zemin's attention was that he couldn't see any weapons on this female goblin, which indirectly caused him to raise his guard slightly against her. Kikiki. Kurano, how about we fuck after it? Another goblin spoke as he looked at the second-order goblin female with lust. This goblin had a bone staff in his bare hands and appeared to have a white beard similar to that of a human elder. The most striking thing was that this goblin was actually wearing human clothing and if not for his shaved green head could pass for a human being if viewed from distance and from the back. Fuck. The female goblin named Kurano looked at the crotch of the goblin who had just given her an invitation and sneered, Abil, did you forget how your little thing didn't even manage to make me come even once? You fucking disgusting monster. Kikiki. The bone staff goblin named Abil didn't mind and instead laughed again as if he had heard a good joke. That's enough. The burly goblin with the bone claymore named Geminder bellowed and released a huge pressure as he said with a slight tinge of anger in his voice, You three, why can't you be more like Anak and act a bit more serious? Hearing Geminder's words, the other three goblins immediately fell silent and cringed slightly as they felt the pressure exuding from the muscular goblin's body. Bai Zemin's pupils twitched slightly as he felt the huge pressure released by the goblin named Geminder. This beast was definitely the most powerful being Bai Zemin had ever faced. He took a sidelong glance at the goblin that had been silent until now, the one called Anak, and noticed that this goblin carried a normal bone bow and a quiver stuffed with bone and black wood arrows on his back. The expression on this goblin's face was serious and cold as he stared at him and fiddled with the string of his bow as if he couldn't wait to try something. When everyone was silent, Geminder looked at Bai Zemin and said with seriousness, Human, surrender. I know you are strong, probably as strong as me despite being one stage below. What? Geminder, is that true? Kikiki. Impossible. The four goblins had different reactions when they heard the words Geminder had just pronounced. They all looked at Bai Zemin and then looked back at Geminder and their white eyes showed how surprised they were. Humph. Geminder coldly snorted and did not respond. All of his attention was on Bai Zemin as he calmly said, If you and I were to fight in a 1vs1, your odds of victory and survival would probably be around 40%. However, with Krier, Kurano, Abil, and Anak here. I think you understand what I mean. I propose you surrender and in exchange, you can take your loved ones with you while leaving the rest behind. Not a bad offer, don't you think? Geminder was the senior leader of all the goblins that had been born in the northern area of China. At the moment he had under his command over 500,000 goblins but not all of them were present as around 350,000 were scattered all over the north hunting other races and attacking humans. As the main leader, Geminder was quite level-headed and his intelligence was comparable to that of a fully grown and mature adult human. From the moment he was born, he already possessed the strength of a peak first-order existence and was now in the high second order. Throughout the apocalypse, Geminder had come into contact with hundreds of humans and after a certain period of observation concluded that the vast majority of them were emotional beings. Since Geminder still did not want to have an all-out confrontation against a human potency, he decided to tempt the strongest person of the enemy and offer him what he believed to be a good deal. Seeing that Geminder seemed to be cautious enough to let a human go, the other four leaders of the Northern Goblin Army finally looked at Bai Zemin carefully as if they wanted to get some sense from him. However, I can't sense anything. Anak finally spoke, his voice was slightly hoarse probably from being silent for a long time. The goblin with the bow shook his head and said confused and with slight arrogance in his voice, even though the power within him is very pure, it doesn't seem to be enough to threaten us, proud second-order goblins. Geminder ignored Anak and overlooked the nod of the other goblins beside him. Instead, he pursued, how about it, human? Not a bad deal, is it? Bai Zemin did not speak from the beginning except when he was surprised by the arrival of 5 second-order beings. He observed and studied the characteristics of the enemies in front of him very carefully. Seeing the weapons of each one, it was not difficult to imagine the type of position on the battlefield of the goblins. In addition, this brief period of observation made it possible for Bai Zemin to draw several detailed conclusions about how it could probably be the preferred battle style of these creatures just based on the personality that each of them showed so far. In the end, Bai Zemin concluded that he just had to watch out for the goblin with the bone staff and the goblin with the huge claymore. Then, he just had to be a little cautious with the female goblin and always keep an eye on the silent goblin. As for the names of these goblins, he didn't even pay attention to them so he couldn't remember them at all. They were just a bunch of disgusting beasts that only knew how to slaughter or rape but dared to give themselves names. Bai Zemin felt like vomiting at such a thought. His expression was as cold as ice as he said indifferently, I don't understand beast language. How about you try again?